Hello everyone, welcome to What If Naruto Became the Winter Soldier movie. Before we start, please go support Dragneel Slayer for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made. There will be some mistaken character's gender, but of course Naruto is a male. Naruto Uzumaki is someone capable of executing without any emotion, without fear of repercussions, always with his mind focused on protecting a single person in the world, the one who has given him everything. Therefore, with his account in the red due to deaths, he won't mind filling the book with blood if it protects her. Mercenary. The first rays of the sun danced between the clouds, revealing the tall and majestic buildings of Berlin, while a fine rain soaked them, sliding down the large windows that covered each wall of the buildings, where people seemed to be working, sitting at their desks with their jackets out, showing concentration, nervousness, fear of failure, all of that while outside, cars moved through the streets, pedestrians walked along the sidewalks with headphones in their ears. Oblivious to the bustle that seemed to greet them when they stepped onto the street, either outside their homes, on their way to work, school, or some place where they themselves rested. It wasn't a bad day. Clouds lightly covered the sun, with a light wind blowing from the east, generating a wind chill of -2 degrees Celsius, -2 degrees Fahrenheit, while in reality it was slightly warmer. Therefore, when people opened their mouths and blew, the mist rose into the sky, completely disappearing, shaping their breaths. Given the temperature, many had opted to wear oversized coats and thick gloves to cover their hands, while scarves or undergarments covered their faces, slightly obscuring half of their noses and the lower part of their faces, leaving only their eyes visible to other passers-by, who were focused on their own thoughts or on the cell phones they were holding, typing something on their screens. This was made difficult by some people's loose gloves, which forced many people to take them off, leaving their hands exposed to the elements, only to put them back inside the same gloves when they finished answering the call. Only to take them off again when the same person answered, going through the process again, making the person sigh as they felt the icy air brushing against their bare skin, making it look much wider than it was, and within seconds turning reddish or slightly purple, giving the sensation of having reached a temperature low enough to harm the person who had stopped, focused on the virtual conversation they were having with a person on the other side of the world, perhaps. So when a convoy of black vehicles pulled up in front of a tall glass-enclosed building displaying the Lexus logo, many people took no notice of them until the sound of doors opening and men shouting echoed through the area, scaring away passers-by as men and women in black uniforms left the safety of their vehicles, revealing assault rifles in hand, pointed straight ahead. In front of the platoon of soldiers, a sign that read Stark Industries stopped being displayed entirely, being blown to pieces by a grenade launcher that fired the shot. "Get your asses moving, you useless bastards," a deep young voice shouted, being heeded by the others who began to walk in formation, executing the people in front of them without fear, with the rattle of bullets hitting the ground with each step they took. The person who had given the order walked calmly in the rear, stepping over corpses, dying people, and glass, making them crunch as he stepped on them with his military boots. He was slightly tall, perhaps 5 feet 7 inches, with a good build beneath the black uniform he wore, with a helmet on his head, black goggles over his eyes, and a mask covering what remained of his face, making him unrecognizable and appearing to be just another of the handful of attackers who had broken into that factory. But this guy had something different about him. He carried an assault rifle like the others, with a Glock holstered on his right leg, a belt with pockets for carrying magazines, and a Kevlar bulletproof vest that protected him from any bullet impact to his torso. The only difference was the handle of a katana on his back, protruding from his right shoulder, completely black and without any detail to distinguish it from any other. I walked slowly, shooting sparsely, seeing more and more of the staff there crawling on their own guts, agonizing over their imminent deaths, knowing they were about to leave the world, their loved ones, and no one could do anything to save them. If there were a doctor, many would be saved. But I wouldn't let that happen. He scanned the empty stands, surveying them. They weren't empty of people, but they were empty of life. A dozen bodies lay on tables, riddled with holes and leaving a trail of blood on the glass tables. Through his eyes behind his goggles, he saw smashed monitors fall into the floor, their parts scattered across the floor beneath his feet, and he heard small crunches beneath his feet. He sighed, moving the rifle toward a dying woman. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger, taking her life completely. He froze all movement in his legs in front of an immense armored door. He studied it with his eyes, moving them over every inch of the surface. It wasn't common steel. He sniffed lightly, noticing a scent unlike any other, more common metal. He handed the rifle to one of his men, who took it without complaint, his own rifle hanging at his side and his hands clutching the other. He walked up to the same door and placed his right hand on it, feeling the cold of the metal against his skin. He closed his eyes for a few brief moments, letting out an almost imperceptible sigh. This was unlike any other metal. This was vibranium. How did he know? For him, these missions, these jobs, were his daily bread. He knew what each armored door was made of by the simple touch of his fingers, by just brushing his skin over the metal. This wasn't steel, titanium, or iron. Its composition was 100% vibranium, the metal used to create the legendary Captain America's shield. He lowered his arm, taking a few steps back. "Trouble?" One of the attackers asked him in a German accent, taking a step forward. He didn't answer. He remained silent as he breathed, and seconds later, he caught the man's neck. What? He squeezed, feeling the mercenary's neck buckle under his pressure. He heard him kicking, the soles of his boots, hard, scraping against the cold pavement. He turned his head. Dark goggles hid his piercing, cold eyes that would have made the man wet his pants. No one told him what to do or how to do it, or ask if there were any problems. He was the problem. No one else. He let go of her collar, letting it fall. He lightly stroked her neck, the skin reddening. He moved his eyes again, staring at that armored door, and sighed somewhat heavily. He stretched his right arm back and brushed his fingers along the handle of his katana. He unsheathed it, revealing a completely dark gray blade, reflecting the faint glow of the dawn sun that was entering the room. He took a couple of steps forward, gripping the handle of his weapon with both hands, noticing how light it was, well calibrated. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he let out the air between his lips, hitting the mask. "Take care of the police or any mosquito," he ordered sharply. He lunged, piercing that door with a hole about 4 fingers wide. He closed his eyes, moving his hands around the handle, gripping it differently, and began to pull down, tearing the vibranium fearlessly, as if he knew what he was doing. And he did. He'd been hired for what was on the other side of that thick door. And he would get it. "Give me 10 minutes and a bag." One of the soldiers dropped a long, black bag and returned to his companions. In seconds, he was completely alone, with no one to physically see him. Out of the corner of his eye, somewhat annoyed by the goggles covering his face, he spotted surveillance cameras focused solely on him, as if he were the most important thing Stark Industries had to record. He smiled at how important he felt. He was even tempted to laugh. He would have if he didn't need concentration to cut through that door with his katana. Muscles tensed. Neck wide from his clenched teeth beneath his mask. A frown hidden by his goggles. He drew his left leg back and used his arms, driving the katana deeper, lowering it to the lowest point possible without touching the ground. He pulled the katana toward his body, withdrawing the blade completely. He had left a significant mark, so for a few seconds he flashed a smile, which no one saw. He shifted his feet, guiding his body toward the other end of the door, hearing gunshots at the entrance to Stark's headquarters. He swung his sword at it, ramming the blade into the same armored door. By doing the same, he created another massive tear in the vibranium door, taking just as long and with just as much effort. He took a deep breath. The beer wouldn't hurt after this, eh, Stark? Burlesco greeted one of the cameras watching him by taking out an elongated object and sticking it into each tear, giving them a small twist. 10 meters away, he saw both explode, causing the door to collapse completely inward, making him smile. He was too happy about it to consider what was inside. I have to admit it, he dropped the katana so that its tip touched the ground, while he saw red eyes observing him analytically. With heavy, resonant steps, a completely silver suit of armor appeared, all too similar to the first Iron Man model that the CEO of Stark Industries had shown to the world. It slightly reflected the sun's rays against it. If he had gone without glasses, he would probably have been blinded by the very brightness of that walking armor. Was there someone inside? Was there only one person there to protect what they wanted? He closed his fingers tightly on the handle of his weapon, moving it slightly. "You surprise me, Stark." He jumped to the side in time, dodging a rocket that shattered a pillar behind him. He rolled on the ground, crouching behind another pillar. He took a deep breath, holding the blade of that katana in front of him, reflecting back the reflection of his covered face. Even in that situation, with years of experience under his belt, he was still thinking about the past. He ran his tongue over his lips, ducking his head as chunks of concrete fell on him, covering him. He rolled on the ground again, stopping on his left heel. He raised his head, staring at that cheap Iron Man. He cracked his neck as he stood up, using his left hand to brush off the dust that had stained his uniform. "I expected more, Stark," he hissed, bringing the katana down on the armor's chest, hoping to slice through. The blade stuck, but cheap Iron Man raised his arm, concentrating energy into his palm, causing his eyes to open. Shit. Another would have jumped to the side or even back. But not him. He dashed forward, against the armor, and launched himself to the ground where he began to slide, passing under the legs of that silver Iron Man, using his feet to stop and stand up, grabbing his pistol as he spun. He swung it, firing 4 times, and the armor fell to his knees. He found the mobility cables and ripped them apart without hesitation. He walked to stand in front of Iron Man, bending his face slightly to look into his blue eyes. "I'm sorry about this, Stark. Put it on my tab, though it's in the red, I'm afraid." "But there's still room," he declared, laughing at the end. He pulled out the katana in one fell swoop, noticing a sizable hole in the armor's frame, seeing its circuitry. He whistled in awe, looking at them with interest. "You're doing good work, friend. I hope you keep it up." Without further ado, he cut off the head of that cheap Iron Man, hearing him roll on the ground as the gunfire continued, centered on the entrance. He holstered his weapon and, with slow steps, headed toward the vault to collect what they wanted. Stark Tower, New York, 4:30 p.m. Frustrated, pissed off, incredulous, that was how Anthony Edward Stark found himself, sitting at his desk, his eyes wide open at what he saw on his monitor, his lips pressing together into a thin line. One of Stark Industries' branches in Europe, more specifically in Berlin, Germany, had been raided by a group of mercenaries, leaving more than a dozen corpses in their wake among employees and police, managing to enter the vault and taking out, after passing through one of its guards, a copy of the plans for the raft, a penitentiary that he and his father helped build under the sea, and where truly dangerous people, as well as people like Hulk or Thor, were held. He couldn't understand how they managed to know exactly where the plans were, or how they even knew of their existence. After creating the raft, he destroyed all copies of those plans except the original, hiding it too far from any potential stakeholders interested in the prison security and the release of his fellow inmates. Because of this, he swore on his father's grave that no one would get hold of the plans, not even Fury. But how did they get the information on his whereabouts? Every 2 months, the plans changed location, and it wasn't exactly a branch of their industries where he was kept. No one knew about his movements, except for the person in charge, and she doubted Happy would betray him. Even Pepper would be on his side and reluctant to give away information that could cause further damage to the world. If someone broke into the raft and freed the prisoners, war would spill onto the streets. He massaged a space between his eyebrows, feeling a throbbing pain in his temples. This was bothering him even more than Loki's case, who was now being held in Asgard by his brother. That woman, goddess of lies and illusions, had nearly destroyed them before they even stepped onto the stage and completely disabled S.H.I.E.L.D., with Fury at the helm. He growled through his teeth, throwing his head back, resting it on the back of the same chair, and letting out a completely angry shout. He hadn't planned for anyone to get hold of those plans, and now dangerous people had them, and he didn't know what they would do. "I'm sorry about this, Stark. Put it on my tab, though it's in the red, I'm afraid. But there's still room." He squeezed his eyes shut, creasing slightly at the words repeating in his mind, over and over again, every second he closed his eyes. The video his watcher had sent him was too much for him. A mere mercenary had smashed through the armored door and killed the armor using a simple katana capable of cutting through vibranium, a metal that almost nothing on Earth could cut. "It's not normal," he said through gritted teeth, standing back in front of the monitor on his desk, watching the video recorded at the raided branch for the 100th time, along with the one in the armor. "That guy isn't a normal human, after all. No. Tony? Are you okay?" He blinked a few times, turning off the monitor with a wave of his hand, moving his eyes to a woman with fiery red hair tied in a ponytail, with pale skin and green eyes that returned a look of genuine concern. He was seconds away from lying, from making up a cheap excuse she wouldn't fully buy, making her investigate herself and discovering what had happened in Berlin, only to have it blow up completely in her face like so many other times when some woman spent the night under his sheets and he had to take it upon himself to kick her out. He'd seen the disappointment on that woman's face hundreds of times and he didn't want to see it again, not when their life together could be affected. He sighed, keeping his eyes lowered, massaging his forehead with his hand as if he had a headache, which wasn't exactly a lie. This whole situation was slowly killing him, giving him a headache worse than when that Asgardian woman practically wiped out the world with those aliens who created the Avengers themselves. "Pepper," he began, running his tongue along his lower lip. He needed a drink to continue. He got up and walked over to the liquor cabinet, took a bottle of bourbon, and poured himself a triple, almost quadrupling it. He had no doubt that night, at least that bottle would disappear. Some men robbed a Berlin branch this morning, taking something from it that no one should have. At least, no one interested in the war. Pepper remained silent for a few seconds, digesting her boss's words. They had been harsh, with an icy tone, and they surprised her. All joking on her part had completely disappeared, and any joking had been banished from that conversation, at least. That's why she understood that Tony was upset, probably pissed off, and was considering hundreds of things that were passing through his mind, moving swiftly and remaining briefly engraved in his brilliant mind. What have they taken? Stark set the bottle down on the side of the table, shifting back into the massive leather chair behind his desk. He raised the glass, imagining the liquid that would soon fall down his throat and intoxicate him. No one could stop him once he started. It wasn't his day. He didn't want any lectures. He slowly looked at the woman who had once been his personal secretary, placing the glass of bourbon on the table, exactly 2 centimeters from the bottle, which was a third of its contents missing. He moved the index finger of his right hand along the rim of the glass, wondering whether he should drink before or after that conversation, which would surely earn him a good lecture from Pepper. He saw the glint of concern in her eyes, fixed on him, who hadn't moved a muscle, aside from the finger sliding along the rim of the glass. He didn't want to notice the disappointment in her eyes, the reproach displacing the concern. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, massaging his neck with his hand, feeling the cold skin of it sliding down his neck, passing over the nape of his neck. I'd have to tell them. It was too serious to even think about hiding them. He raised his head, staring at Pepper. Sit down, Pepper. This is going to take a long time. Moscow, Russia, 0:30. She dropped the glass flat on the table, her lips sliding to one side as a smile slowly spread across her face, amused. She kept her attention on the glass she'd set down on a small, slightly cracked old wooden table. They had arrived completely safe at their destination, with nearly 100 dead police officers. They had underestimated them, and now there were bodies all over Berlin that needed to be returned to their families to be buried with full honors and decorations, something completely empty, to anyone who thought about it, a way to cheer up the families of the deceased. The dead would never enjoy those medals for dying. He massaged his shoulder with his hand, focusing his blue eyes on the blank screen of that motel, with no interest in turning on the television, knowing that news of his assault would have traveled around the globe, reaching the hands of Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, in seconds. That man was an idiot. Reveal himself as Iron Man. All his loved ones who were still alive would be in constant danger 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They could use them against him. They could bring down one of the most powerful billionaires in the world. Stark wouldn't hesitate to confront them if they harmed his friends and family. He was an Avenger. An idiot one. He lowered his head, staring at the pistol on the table, fully loaded. He was tempted to pick it up, to try it out. A few shots would quiet the voices in his head. Voices that had grown louder over the years, like the people who appeared every time he closed his eyes at night. He stopped the train of thought he had begun to follow when cold fingers brushed his back between his shoulder blades, making him sigh in satisfaction and close his eyes. Naruto, sweet, syrupy, a female voice with a Russian accent hit his eardrums, while wide arms surrounded his neck, caressing his bare pectorals. Only black pajama pants kept him from being completely naked. You're too focused on unnecessary things when you should be thinking about me, the woman declared. He closed his eyes, feeling lips brushing against his neck, marking it. That makes me sad. He withdrew his arm, moving it back, grasping the woman's waist and placing her on his lap, straddling her, one leg on either side. She was completely naked, with B-cup breasts pressed against his torso. The woman moved, tossing her dark blonde hair aside, revealing her neck. He didn't think twice, kissing her jugular vein, feeling her move over him, caressing his private parts with emotion. You're not focused. Naruto closed his eyes, grabbing the woman's waist, pulling her away from him slightly, and staring at her breasts. He sighed, knowing his lover was right. After taking Stark's plans, his mind had cut off for a moment and old fragments of his past had returned, making him think. I'm sorry, Yelena, he sighed, lowering his face slightly. The Russian woman pouted slightly, moving her hands and forcing him to raise his face, looking at her with genuine concern. With the thumb of her right hand, she brushed back some of the young man's blonde strands, revealing his blue eyes, and flashed a smile that few would ever see on her face. Yelena Belova never smiled, except when executing her enemies with her bare hands. Trained in the Red Room by the KGB and immersed in the Black Widow program, which further enhanced her assassination skills. That she would show emotion to someone who wasn't going to kill was something her masters would never expect. Not even her sister would expect it. She breathed calmly, pressing her chest against the mercenary's torso, sniffing at his shoulder-length hair. She brushed aside strands of hair with her hand as she kissed the blonde man's eyelids. He closed his eyes, enjoying the woman's caresses. He rested his hands on Yelena's bare hips. Yelena had focused her attention on her lips, running them over the boy's face, kissing the sparse beard that had begun to grow, covering his chin with a shock of golden blonde hair. There was a contrast between her dark blonde and his golden one. Dark against light. His blue eyes, hers almond-shaped. The mercenary's tanned skin, the assassin's pale skin. The two made a strange combination. She threw her head back, finally allowing her body to be pushed down onto the woman's, the blonde hovering over her male lover, caressing her intimate part with his. She pressed her lips together, forming a brief smile, keeping the moan in her throat. What are you thinking about, Uzumaki? Uzumaki Naruto wasn't Russian like Yelena Belova or German like the others who had accompanied him. His roots, closer than they seemed, were Japanese. But he never met his parents. He didn't know who they were or why they had left him behind in an orphanage, thrown away like a bag of garbage. He ended up in Moscow, Russia, and had been there for as long as he could remember, being trained to kill, using his innate abilities to execute his prey. He moved his lower jaw, caressing both of Yelena's buttocks. In life, we all create a book where all our accounts are recorded, he spoke in a calm tone, being watched by the blonde Russian, moving her index finger over the mercenary's chest, forming circles, as if urging him to continue. And my book has too much red with white spaces for more. Are you worried about what other people think? He closed his mouth, pondering for several seconds. Did he care what others thought? He'd killed innocent people with his own hands, entire families with children. And he never showed anything that bothered him, that gave his superiors any indication that he'd abandon a mission for something as trivial as morality. He didn't believe in human laws, in charity, in kindness. Nothing good existed in that world. Everything was grey to him, with a slight red tinge. What the rest of us think, he straightened his body, capturing her in his arms, untying his own trousers with one hand, looking at the woman with a strange gleam, it doesn't matter at all to me. I only want one thing now. And that would be. He forcefully forced Yelena to spin around, placing her beneath him. Strands of hair fell over his face, and he was forced to brush them away with one hand, while others were moved by the woman herself. Do you? High spheres. He took a deep breath, pushing aside the sleeping female figure pressed against him, her arms wrapped around his neck, hugging him tightly, pressing him against both of her breast mounds. Years ago, when he was a beardless 14-year-old boy, he would have shown a flushed face, perhaps even a slight nosebleed. He had been excessively shy, severely lacking in confidence and low self-esteem. Seeing Yelena Belova's body would have killed him unexpectedly, quickening his pulse so much that his heart would have burst in his chest. He brushed back a few strands of hair, brushing his thumb over his lover's cheekbone, allowing himself to see the woman's entire naked body. Curvy, slender, and athletic. She was a beautiful feminine figure with smooth skin, created to kill. It was no coincidence that this Russian woman was a spy with the experience and skills to kill him in his sleep. If this was Yelena, why did she sleep next to him? Many were unaware that Belova wasn't a sadist like hundreds of men who had gone through the same training as her. She was trained to keep her emotions in check and use only what was necessary on each mission without going overboard. If she let her emotions flood her mind, blood would flood her body every time she set foot outside. Thinking about Yelena Belova herself made him think about himself. How close was he to sanity? His mind had been affected by untimely deaths, and he doubted himself too much. He was a normal human, nothing special like Captain America. And despite being able to die like a normal person, he sometimes let impatience creep in and force him to rush things, which is why he saw comrades die on the battlefield several times. He never cried about it. Unlike Yelena, who liked to hide in the shadows and play like a puppeteer, he himself preferred to be bathed in the rays of the sun while at his feet, his victims returned him a completely dead, completely blank stare. He swallowed, feeling his Adam's apple drop a little in his throat. He lifted his body from the bed, feeling the sheet slip down his body, partially covering his lover's, leaving patches of skin before his eyes. He would have held his breath if he didn't love Yelena's scent as much, if not more, than killing. He massaged his right shoulder, feeling it slightly numb, as if he'd shifted his body into an awkward position for sleeping. He even thought he heard it creak when he moved it forward. It seemed as if the bones and muscles were squeezing back together to make movement easier. He didn't spend too long at his morning chores, having a light breakfast of juice and coffee with a couple of slices of toast, and then brushing his teeth. He would shower after the gym, where he was supposed to tone his body as he did every day after breakfast. Only that day, he felt like something wasn't going his way. He was in Moscow, Russia, and everything there was foreign to the United States. There could be spies everywhere, waiting to kill him. Yelena would survive. She was too important an asset to allow her to die. Once dressed, he sat down on a cold iron chair and opened a black laptop, booting it up with his own fingerprint. Within seconds, a black screensaver with a skull and snakes appeared, along with a file named Shield. He clicked on the folder, seeing hundreds of images appear. His eyes could see hundreds, perhaps thousands, of agents spread across the world, all wearing the same logo on their uniforms or carrying folders with those symbols. The white eagle in a circle made him raise an eyebrow. Each of these people is a Shield agent, he deduced after seeing those images. He leaned back, feeling the back of his seat making contact with his back. He kept his right hand under his chin, stroking his beard, slightly longer than the day before, while with his left hand, he moved the touchpad implanted in the same laptop, flipping through other images. Hundreds of faces passed through his mind, trying to store them. He opened his mouth slightly, staring at one agent in particular. Nicholas Fury, current director of the anti-terrorist organization, who seemed to have to pay a visit, just as he had done with Stark Industries. The problem was the number of men. Even he would have trouble dealing with a squad commanded by Fury himself, who would not hesitate to execute him. Or perhaps he would arrest him and hand him over to Stark himself, who would now be biting his lip, holding back the anger he felt. Naruto massaged the bridge of his nose, keeping the aching headache down. Less than 24 hours away from completing one mission, and now his contractor was sending him on another, much more difficult than the last. What could they possibly want from Shield or Fury? There were hundreds of the organization's bases, some more hidden than others, and he wouldn't be able to access them without being high up in their hierarchy. It was almost like entering a square box, with no windows or doors. He couldn't get in or out. He closed the folder by clicking on another one next to it. 2 files were attached. He opened the first, seeing a level 8 shield clearance. He raised an eyebrow and put away the questions that had arisen in his mind, closing the file with his clearance and moving on to the second, a passport with the name James Lewis and a photo of him wearing glasses. It seemed that whoever had assigned him to the job was now holding him back for the next phase, something that was really bothering him. He would never leave a job half finished, but this place seemed too dangerous to leave alive. And he still wanted to stay alive for a few more years, to fulfill the goal of building a family with that woman who stole his heart with her fiery hair. He stroked her neck, closing and shutting down the laptop using his fingerprint again. His contractors had made sure that no one could access the information stored on the laptop's hard drive. He had always been loyal to one path, and it seemed that path was becoming tarnished with blood. He looked over his shoulder as Yelena stood up, revealing the blonde woman's naked body before his eyes. Yelena didn't notice her lack of underwear or the sheet that had fallen over her body, revealing her breasts. He swallowed, watching as the Russian woman narrowed her eyes, appearing somewhat shy, as if she were unable to cut his throat with a fork and play with his vocal cords, without appearing disgusted by the blood running down his arm. That simple, yet terrifying thought shattered the angel-like image he had created around Yelena Belova, who had left the bed and was walking toward him, naked. Admiring an angelic sculpture, exotic friend. Yelena's voice reached his ears, melodious and calm, with that Russian accent that so attracted him, making him tremble. He tried to back away, but he was sitting. He felt the blonde's extra weight on his body, which reacted to the scent of her skin and the touch of her intimacy against his own, covered by slightly ripped blue jeans. "Why don't you ever speak Japanese? Why don't you speak Russian?" He countered, laughing at the spy's pout. He shook his head slightly, noticing how her shoulder-length hair swayed. He watched as Yelena's hands moved, catching strands of her hair and forming a high ponytail, a small bun, tying it with a hairband. Only a few remained loose, brushing her right cheek. With a sigh, she removed them, but Belova tucked them behind her ear with a brief smile she showed to few. Exactly, she showed it to only him. She wouldn't let anyone else see any crack in her Russian assassin mask. "I hope you slept well." With those words, he let out a small laugh that he tried to suppress, but he received a blow from his lover, who was laughing just as much, slightly suppressing it, creating a small sound like bells clinking together, creating a beautiful melody. If he didn't know it was impossible, he swore he'd fallen in love. He'd only ever loved one woman. One who was now whirled away and who decided to start somewhere else, far from family and old friends. But he couldn't blame her. He'd taken a different path from hers when he could follow her, leaving him on the other side of the coin. "Sleeping with you is always gratifying," he assured, stealing a kiss from Yelena's lips, who pouted again, too adorable for him. He didn't understand how someone capable of bathing in blood was capable of showing such an angelic side, beautiful in the eyes of any man who saw her. Before Yelena could reply, the cell phone next to the laptop began to ring, blasting Iron Maiden's wasting love. At the sound, another laugh escaped the assassin, and the mercenary lowered his face, brushing his nose against Yelena's breasts, while his left hand groped on the table, reaching for the device. He picked up the phone with a flick of his finger and placed it to his ear. "This is Agent 9, he greeted calmly, weighing the woman's left breast a couple of times as she bit her lower lip. "How may I help you?" Naruto Uzumaki, a voice he didn't recognize, greeted, causing him to frown and put aside his games, much to Belova's annoyance. "Our organization has taken an interest in your work with Stark." A German accent, maybe Austrian. He couldn't quite make it out, but it was probably one of those two accents. But beyond where the man was calling him from, what worried him was the fact that he knew about his job. No one should have that number, unless they were. "So will we come out into the light? I see you've discovered where I belong and what my organization is." Young man, he moved his hand, covering Yelena's mouth who had tried to speak, generating with the movement a small rubbing of the parts and a murmur from the woman's side. "I would like to make you an offer too gratifying for your job, Mr. Uzumaki." When someone gave something, it was because they needed something in return that went hand in hand with what they were offering. Naruto knew this perfectly well. Being who he was, with the past he carried, he knew them too well to trust. "I thought they kept their heads hidden for a reason, sir." "Ahaha, you're a man with a sense of humor, Uzumaki. I don't usually give a chance to the dregs of the world itself." Now thick, that voice seemed calm, surprising him too much. He had expected some anger at his words, but the man remained calm, trying to bring him to his ground. The world changed when those aliens arrived in New York and the Avengers showed themselves with Nick Fury, who gathered them. He swallowed as he remembered what had happened half a year ago. The Chitauri invasion, which had failed thanks to the Avengers, led by Captain America and supported by the forces of S.H.I.E.L.D. That had left human deaths that couldn't be replaced. What do you want? He went from calm to sour, revealing blue eyes that kept a storm completely calm. Yelena herself had noticed his change, hugging him tightly and whispering reassuring words. If they're back, I really have work to do. He heard the laughter of the German or Austrian man on the other end of the line, and his own inner anger seemed to grow slightly with each passing second. He struggled to keep it down. In his arms was the only person capable of calming him down. And he didn't want to hurt her for anything in the world. He didn't want her to see him so far below the point of rational control. Before we continue on the phone, please clear the bag. A ticket is waiting for you, Mr. Uzumaki, at the airport. But the beep, it was clear he'd cut the call. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a heavy sigh, realizing the part about being rid of the burden. He heard a snap. He wrapped his arms around Yelena's waist and rolled across the floor, passing under the bed. The door flew into 1,000 pieces that fell onto the dirty motel floor. Really? Letting a growl escape her throat, Yelena Belova showed that she was truly angry with the intruders, making her feel truly terrified down there. Grab something, damn it. He didn't think twice, grabbing 2 pistols from under the bed and handing one to the woman. He pulled back the pistol and heard the click of a bullet in the chamber. He aimed, firing once, causing the man to fall in pain, and Belova finished him off with a bullet to the head. Working as a team again was refreshing and brought back memories of another woman. He pushed those thoughts aside, wrapped his arms around his partner's waist and rolled out from under the cot, now on top of the spy. He raised his head and pulled the trigger of his weapon for the second time, this time killing his target. There was no time to hurt. You should put something on. He stood up, moving the gun around the room. The door had ceased to exist. Only small fragments remained scattered across a dirty carpet, stained with the blood of the agents who had attacked them. He recognized the S.H.I.E.L.D. logo on the back of their t-shirts in seconds when he searched for something to find out who they were. I don't want to share you. That woman didn't say anything, and you didn't complain yourself, Yelena emphasized, earning a snort from her, but more amused than annoyed. Turning her back on the woman, she heard her beginning to dress somewhat hastily. It was no wonder. With hundreds of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents around the world, they could have a battalion there. And she didn't want to stain her katana just yet. He tucked the gun into the back of his waistband, walking over to where the laptop lay, smeared with dust and splinters from the door itself, just as the phone had been smashed. That had upset him. His money had gone toward a device now destroyed by S.H.I.E.L.D. He picked up the laptop, stuffing it into his bag, next to his katana and a wad of bills, along with passports with countless IDs. If they hadn't broken into the building, his own S.H.I.E.L.D. agent ID would be among the others now. He slung the bag over his shoulder, gripping the semi-automatic pistol in both hands, pointing it at the door. The snap of a zipper made him bristle against his will, bringing a sinister, amused smile to his companion's face. Go ahead, doll. He shook his head, walking out the door with slow steps, hearing the floor creak with his footsteps. He strained his senses, trying to hear any movement that didn't fit. He had to be completely alert to the movements of those who could kill them. He sighed, scanning the hallway, first to the right and then to the left, before starting to walk again with slow steps. He heard only his breathing as Yelena followed him, her steps much quieter than his own. So much so that he thought he'd lost her and was left alone. She was too good at her job. He took a deep breath, relaxing the muscles in his shoulders, feeling them lower with each inhalation. He moved his head to the right and then to the left, slowly resuming his steps, moving his eyes from side to side, guiding the gun where his gaze was focused. How many S.H.I.E.L.D. agents were in that motel? He showed no surprise when a soldier charged him from the right side, knocking his gun out of his hands. He kept his body steady, standing, and grabbing the officer by the neck. Now he opened his eyes to see a second officer pointing a rifle at him. He pulled his body down, forcing the officer he was holding to fall, while with his free hand, he grabbed the officer's pistol and fired at the right knee of the one aiming at him, then fired at his left. He saw him fall to his knees, bleeding, staining the ground. He let go of the one he'd been holding. He'd unintentionally broken the man's neck. His skin was beginning to turn purple, probably from breaking the vertebrae in his neck. He stood up, grabbed the lost pistol, raised both, and walked toward the stairs. Apparently, Yelena had taken another exit. He fired fearlessly, killing 3 soldiers. He used the stair railing as leverage to jump, shooting a 4th officer in the neck. Without flinching. It wouldn't be his first kill. He squeezed, dropping both clips. He tossed aside the pistol taken from the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and loaded his own, then pulled the slide of the 9mm back, pulling the trigger once to return it to its position and chamber round. He raised his gun and fired, killing a 5th soldier. Disappointing, he declared as he lowered his gun, stepping over the officers' bodies, all of them inert, their eyes wide open, blood oozing from beneath them. He gripped his gun tightly and paused behind a door, the one that would lead him to the hallway. He reached for the doorknob, sweating a little. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. He took a deep breath and turned the handle without worry, opening the door fully and leaning out with his pistol in hand, pulling the trigger on the officers stationed there. He threw it aside when the clip ran out, not having time to reload, and kicked one of the enemy in the chest, sending him tumbling into a vase in the hall, which shattered upon impact with the man's body. He parried a blow with his forearm and went underneath it, forcing his attacker to spin and gripping the limb until it crunched and bullets tore through his torso, courtesy of his partner. He threw his body aside and ran, leaping over the reception desk and kicking the shooter with both legs, getting caught while loading his weapon. He rolled on the floor, standing up on his hands and feet, taking a defensive stance. He scanned the hall. The dozen officers were scattered around the hall, completely dead, in pools of blood. He wiped the sweat from his face with the back of his hand and unzipped his jacket, letting it fall to the floor, revealing a completely black undershirt, unadorned but clinging to his body. Forced by the situation, he picked up one of the officer's rifles from the ground and pushed the safety, hearing a soft click indicating the weapon was ready. He set it aside, reaching under the body of an officer of his build, and began unbuttoning his bulletproof vest. He slipped his arms through the openings and closed the fasteners, pulling it over his torso. He also picked up a helmet and placed it on his head, looping the strap under his chin, feeling it tug lightly at a few strands of his beard, causing a grimace to form on his face. He picked up a rifle again and slung its strap across his body, aiming toward the door, his eye peering through the scope mounted on it. The weapon felt heavy, cold to the touch. It had been at least a full day since he'd picked up an assault rifle. He walked toward the door, noticing the rays of sunlight filtering through, indicating that it was already daylight outside. How did S.H.I.E.L.D. find out where I was? He parted the curtain on the right window of the door with his hand, peering outside with his blue eyes, slightly shaded with a few golden strands of hair. He blinked a few times, frowning at what he saw. Outside, there were at least 20 men, all pointing toward the door he would have to leave through. And something told him that those weren't all the men the agency had sent. Could it be Stark's doing? Was he pissed off at stealing the plans? Imagining the angry face of Anthony Edward Stark himself made him laugh softly and heartily, like he hadn't in years. The Avenger, the inventor, had been outwitted by a mere man. Although, was he a mere man? His record said otherwise, and the deaths of 15 men at his hands only served to justify it. Naruto, he spun around, grabbing a grenade launcher Yelena threw at him. He looked at it for a few seconds before looking back at his partner. In his left hand, he held a pair of grenades they could use. I found it in a bag you were carrying. He shook his head, placing the grenade launcher under the barrel of the rifle, readjusting it perfectly. Is this why you took so long? He asked, staring directly at the rifle. He opened the grenade launcher with a jerk and inserted one he'd taken from one of the dead men, feeling blood trickle down his fingers. He brushed his own slightly, spreading the blood and making it disappear. I thought I'd lost you. A soft chuckle hit his ears from behind him, making him slump his shoulders slightly, thinking he'd sounded like an idiot. Yelena Belova killed by S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Unless they sent Black Widow or Hawkeye, it was unlikely any of those tactical agents could take on the Russian assassin or him. He wasn't self-centered. He knew he could die, but having been sent to places of constant war had made him thrive against entire squads of enemies. It sounds ridiculous. You heard me, he growled, pouting at the Russian's new laugh. Using his left fist wrapped in a piece of cloth, he smashed one of the glass panes in the door, feeling one of them dig into his forearm. He didn't mind too much as the glass tore at his skin and blood dripped onto the floor. I'm an idiot. I'm not arguing with that, Naruto, Yelena replied, standing behind him, looking out the window opposite the agents. They had taken a few steps forward and were pointing in their direction. What are you going to do, Uzumaki? Naruto moved his lips, his teeth slightly showing in a small but arrogant smile. Without answering the Russian's question, he pulled the trigger of the grenade launcher, hearing the grenade fly with a pop and explode against the ground, engulfing the agents in flames. It was an incendiary bomb. That's it, he replied, placing a second grenade and firing again. The vehicles, some 4x4s, exploded when the fired grenade hit the side, shattering the barricade S.H.I.E.L.D. had created and sending his men sprawling. A couple more deaths in my book are nothing to my mind. Yelena lowered her gaze for a few seconds, letting out a sigh and then squeezing her partner's shoulder, causing Naruto to stop his thoughts for a few seconds, looking towards the woman, noticing her worried eyes. Where will you go? S.H.I.E.L.D. will hunt you down. He took a deep breath, hearing the sirens of the police cars. S.H.I.E.L.D. wasn't the only ones coming after him now. I have a ticket to a cold place. S.H.I.E.L.D. Central Base. 1700 hours. Over the years, few people had managed to genuinely surprise him. He didn't even show true surprise at the appearance of Carol Danvers and the Skrulls years before. He was surprised, yes, but he handled it too well, so much so that he ended up as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Over the years, few things gave him a headache. Loki. The Tesseract. The Avengers. The Chitauri. It all came close to killing him, but he managed to handle it well. Despite the deaths, the Chitauri left hundreds dead in their wake and the world launched a nuclear missile. He was still alive after that and took command of S.H.I.E.L.D. again, hoping to be able to handle whatever came next. But he never expected this. A simple man took the raft plans from one of Stark Industries' facilities, and when they tracked him down in Moscow, he managed to escape from the motel where he'd been holed up for 24 hours straight, leaving nearly 50 of his agents dead, members of the local police force injured by the arson attack, and civilians frightened by the Inhuman who had revealed himself. He didn't want to undo the thoughts of the civilians or the agents. Clearly, that man was something of an Inhuman if he managed all of this without the captain's strength, Stark's armor, Thor's powers, Banner's ferocious strength, Romanoff's composure, or Barton's stealth and keen eye. He was a far-fetched mercenary who forced him to retreat his men when he vanished like smoke. There was no record of his face. He slammed his fist on the table, letting out an irritated sigh through his teeth. This had infuriated him, and nothing would really make him better. He felt like he knew this guy from somewhere, but from what? Fury, the S.H.I.E.L.D. director turned off the monitor in front of him, watching with his one good eye the shape of his knuckles on the desk. It seemed he'd used more force than he'd intended and marked his desk, although he hardly spent any time in that office. His place on the helicarrier was far more important than that simple building. The board is met in the briefing room. Nick Fury let out a heavy sigh, massaging his forehead with his hand. He turned his body, shaking the hem of his long coat, focusing his dark-eyed eye on the woman who had interrupted his thoughts about the mercenary who was causing them so much trouble. He ran his tongue over his lips, feeling them dry. He sighed and picked up a level 10 classified folder. Only here Alexander Pierce could open it and look at it, or another member of the World Council, who were above him. No one else would be able to find the same file, no matter how hard they looked. And they shouldn't. Not when there were rats after the cheese. At least that's what he thought. Hundreds of secrets and few people to trust. Has Stark arrived with his extravagant ideas? Not that I'm against his thoughts, but I refuse to let his armor fly around the raft. Have you thought it might be a perfect move? We wouldn't spend too much manpower on prison protection, and Stark would cover all the costs. Fury moved his eye over Agent Maria Hill, noticing how the brunette swallowed hard. He moved his eye over the woman's body, noticing how she seemed to tremble under his gaze, although it was a sign of nerves. Who wouldn't be? There was a mercenary capable of executing S.H.I.E.L.D. agents without fear and robbing high-security facilities like Stark Industries, being able to destroy a vibranium armored door and eliminate an Iron Man armor with a simple katana. And he didn't even seem to be hurt in the confrontation. He was a skilled individual, aware of his own strength, and seemed to execute it in a truly lethal manner. That would be abrupt, Hill. Leaving the sky in Stark's hands. The raft has hundreds of prisoners, some of them with powers. Suits of armor won't stop the guy who's put our agents in jeopardy. An army of Iron Men won't stop him, he assured in a thick voice, walking over to where Hill was. He saw her briefly throw her head back, probably to look him in the eyes. He didn't see a hint of fear. He acknowledged that Hill and Coulson were his best agents. But they could never be used like Barton and Romanoff. No, they weren't assassins. That guy would manage to get into the raft, whether or not Stark's army was flying overhead. In fact, that would get him there faster. What do you propose? He bared his teeth in a grimace, racking his brains to find a way to protect the raft. He had enough with the mice in his home without having to deal with hundreds of fugitives who would endanger thousands of lives. That's what the Avengers were for. But sending them after a mere mercenary would be a waste of resources. Would Stark want revenge for what happened in Berlin? He'd be the most suitable person to stop the guy who would cause the most trouble in the future. How did he know? No one went to the trouble of stealing some plans and then leaving everything half-finished. He managed to vanish like smoke and disappeared from Moscow after leaving around 50 dead. He'd surely show up again. And it would be in New York, where his objective was. I want you to contact Barton and Romanoff. I need them in my office after the meeting. Tell Coulson his team might be needed if they fail, he said as he started walking again, turning his back on his right-hand man, his most trusted agent, next to the man who had helped bring the Avengers together. Don't take too long. New York, unknown location, 9 p.m. He blinked once and stepped inside as the elevator doors opened, revealing a long, wide hallway with what looked like a dozen soldiers aiming at him. He dropped the bag to the floor, making a soft clinking noise, and placed both hands behind his head, scanning the men aiming at him. Another time, he would have tried to shake them off. But that would have been counterproductive at this point. He focused his eyes on the front of the squadron, seeing a man dressed in a gray suit, complete with tie, dark blonde hair swept to the right, and blue eyes. Wrinkles adorned his slightly tanned face, making him look somewhat older than he was. Uzumaki stroked his left wrist with his right hand, circling his fingers, waiting for someone to speak. From the watch adorning his wrist, he pulled out a needle long and thin enough to bleed one of those men, and he had chosen the blonde man in a suit to execute. So, he touched that needle, noticing how the steel it was made of created a cold sensation in his palm. This was a shield trap. Each of the men, except for the well-dressed blonde, wore a shield insignia on one of their shoulders. He saw the word strike on the same symbol the man was wearing. Coincidentally, he was the only one not pointing a gun at him, and his face was uncovered, with a beard on his chin and black hair. "I see your attention has turned to Rumlow, Mr. Uzumaki." The right corner of his lips twitched slightly, shifting his eyes toward the well-dressed man. He wore a calm smile, too calm, as if he were in charge, and didn't seem to care about being here with someone who could kill him. The reassurance offered by armed men was a fallacy. "Brock Rumlow, captain of our strike unit." "The pleasure?" he asked mockingly, earning a grimace from Agent Rumlow, who kept his hands on his 9mm, surely wanting to fire it now. "You'll be partners soon, I hope," the well-dressed man declared, forcing her to close her mouth and look at him, frowning slightly. Had he been hired to be with S.H.I.E.L.D.? "Let me introduce myself. I'm Alexander Pierce, the Secretary of Defense and one of the members of the World Council, ranking above the agency's director. I'm one of those who keep an eye on S.H.I.E.L.D. He raised an eyebrow. This was getting too strange for him. "And that means?" "Appearances can be deceiving," Pierce declared calmly, stepping away from his men before their shocked eyes. He was exposing himself to being easily killed by him. Was he an idiot? "Mr. Agent 9, Uzumaki Naruto, mercenary. All your information is now in my records. But there's something I don't understand." He raised an eyebrow, not understanding how that man had taken so much information from his life that no one should know. "Would that be it?" he asked, running his tongue along his lower lip, waiting for one more step from Pierce. He wanted, right then, to stick that needle in the secretary's neck. It would be the highlight of the day. To see that man's blood trickling down his bare fingers. "Are you interested in being one of the heads?" He opened his eyes fully, breathing heavily. Every thought that had crossed his mind since the call from Pierce in Moscow had led him down a line of thought tied to that organization, the one that had taken him in when the others had cast him aside and formed him. He smiled slightly. "Hail, Hydra. Extremis." He propelled his body back up using his arms, contracting his back muscles, interlacing his legs, blowing with strands of hair across his forehead, forcing him to blink every few seconds, trying to get them to move away each time he raised his body, feeling the sweat running down his torso, dripping to the floor beneath his feet. He was hanging from a bar doing pull-ups using only his arms for support, like levers to pull himself up. His hands, covered by a pair of gloves that prevented him from slipping, cried out for a bit of a break, sending stinging jabs into him with each rise of his body. He let go of the same bar, falling to the ground and staggering, forced to lean on his right knee as he let his head fall, breathing heavily, feeling the sweat dripping down. He clenched his fists as he regained his breathing, letting his body fall onto his ass, sitting down, knees drawn up, and staring at the gray ceiling that covered him, belonging to the Hydra base located underground, near Canada, as an agent had informed him, belonging to Strike. He hadn't expected such a hasty transfer from Pierce's side, but apparently they had started having problems with a company called Advanced Mechanical Ideas, or rather called AIM. Apparently, the president of that company had created a small agreement with Hydra to provide them with Extremis, a gene therapy capable of regenerating tissue, something extremely innovative and valuable for the plans of the Nazi faction's leadership. Although Nazi, there was absolutely nothing left, perhaps some branches of Hydra itself, but nothing more. It only showed order to the world. As Rumlow had told him, Pierce wanted to obtain the Extremis in order to generate a platoon of enhanced Hydra soldiers, capable of regenerating themselves and avoiding death from a simple shot or a blow too strong, thus giving Hydra a very valuable advantage on the battlefield when they faced S.H.I.E.L.D., who had begun to investigate AIM. He smiled as the memory of Stark came to him. Apparently, Iron Man himself was jealous of the discoveries made by Aldrich Killian and his assistant, a scorned woman whom Stark abandoned as he did with all of them. He had done his homework when Rumlow handed him the reports, reading them in full. Although it was boring. Since AIM had come into the light of day, Stark Industries had been hit by a drop in its stock market value, something extremely unusual, so he took it upon himself to investigate. For a few hours, he stayed in the computer room, alongside a Hydra woman named Cassandra, who helped him with his research, and the two discovered a second promising company, allied with Hydra. Cybertech. That company seemed to be dedicated to robotics and biomechanics, something that caught his attention completely. He knew Pierce wasn't an idiot, so that company, like AIM, undoubtedly had specific functions that would later be absorbed by Hydra itself. No one was safe from Hydra. If someone ceased to be useful, they were simply swallowed up and never heard from again. It was a shame Pierce himself wasn't like Red Skull, Captain America's mortal enemy. Now the entire organization seemed to follow Pierce without discernment. He huffed and stood back up, grabbing a towel from beside him and wiping it over his face. He was tired of hiding. He wasn't a field agent just for sitting around. He'd be far more useful to Hydra itself out there, destroying their enemies. But he recognized that the work they'd done so far was commendable. They were within S.H.I.E.L.D., ready to start a war against the world, to take it under their thumb. They just needed time. They could never run out of it. He wiped the white towel over his face again, feeling the beads of sweat completely wiped from his face. His skin felt sticky. With every movement he made, it seemed as if his arms were stuck together, then peeled away with the same movement. He needed to take a shower to get rid of that feeling, which reminded him of a mission in the Amazon swamps. On that mission, he had experienced disgust with his own body, a feeling that returned every time he finished his exercise routine. A routine that Rumlow himself seemed interested in and that Pierce watched a couple of times, praising him for his dedication. I didn't need his crumbs. She tossed aside the used towel and jumped back up, taking the iron bar in her hands and huffing and puffing. She lifted herself up, crossing her legs over each other, using the strength in her arms to move. Strands of blonde strands whipped around, freeing themselves from her headband and briefly hitting her face, then moving away thanks to the air that began to rush into the room, thanks to the air conditioning. You're the new one. He raised his body for the 10th time, climbing onto the bar and swung one leg over it, then the other, sitting down. He caught a bottle the blonde woman threw at him. Did people have a thing about blondes? That's right, he declared as a simple answer, uncorking the bottle with a circular motion of his hand. He let the contents wash over him and blew, sending drops of water against the woman, who took a few steps back. Sorry about that. You can call me Bobby, the woman declared, giving her a small smile that wasn't returned. She dropped the bottle as she looked at the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and let her body fall back, curling her legs around the bar so that she was face down. She crossed her arms over her chest, starting to do sit-ups as she felt the woman's eyes on her. Hill sent me to give you a tour. Rumlow, my boss, has already done it, he declared, bending his body for the 3rd time, sighing. He struggled the 4th time, but was able to continue better from there on when he felt the muscles in his right arm seemed to reposition themselves. I'm sorry if I dashed your hopes of guiding the new guy around the facility. He heard the woman snort, probably in exasperation, and click her heels, trying to distract him with the sound. If he were truly new to this sort of thing, he would have lost his concentration and fallen. First, there was a woman, not at all badly endowed, trying to get his attention. Any man in his right mind would have let impulses guide his mind, losing the priority of the situation in order to copulate with that woman. After all, the woman who raised him had shown him more education than many men had received regarding the opposite sex, the so-called weaker sex. Oh yes, he was a proponent of women being tougher than men. Yelena had shown him that. A pregnant woman had shown him that. And of course, Ella had shown him that. For a few seconds, he saw a head of red hair in his mind, completely unbalancing him. He moved his arm quickly and used it to propel himself. He spun around and landed on his feet, staggering back a few steps and was forced back to one knee again, panting. He tried to push aside the memories of his past, but he couldn't quite manage it. They seemed fresh, like yesterday, when in reality all his memories were of a dark past shared with a single person. A person who had supported him and whom he had left behind to follow that completely dark path, alone. He had left Yelena behind, but she already knew him. They had nothing lasting and it was unlikely to resurface. She remained in his mind, despite the years. With a small effort, with a grunt behind the movement, he managed to stand up completely drenched in sweat. Did I finally manage to distract you? Of course, Barbie, he muttered, smiling at the scrunched up Bobby's face at the nickname used, emphasizing that she was blonde. Although if she had blue eyes and lighter hair, she could clearly pass for a Barbie. But he doubted the woman was an idiot. He ran his forearm over his face, removing all traces of sweat, sighing with satisfaction as he noticed that drops were being eliminated but remaining on his arm. I definitely needed a shower urgently. Agent 9. Agent Morse. They both looked at the new individual walking toward them, holding a tablet and looking at some data. At a glance, she recognized him as one of Rumlow's men from Strike. You've been assigned a mission, both of you. She let out a small laugh as Bobby herself let out her frustration in a muffled moan, almost drowned out by her own laughter that had grown in magnitude as the woman's face reddened. He didn't understand why, but that woman could be truly dangerous to Hydra. Should he tell Pierce? Should he execute her himself? None of them would be as lethal as his spider, but Barbie certainly wasn't a normal agent. Being a Hydra head would be too complicated. Triskelion. 1919. Brock Rumlow put his rifle aside in the hands of one of his strike men and entered the room, looking out at the Potomka River through the large windows that lined one wall. He was a tough man, a soldier trained to kill, so he would never let his emotions fill his mind. Like every Hydra agent infiltrated in that place, he knew perfectly well what his priorities were, and admiring the view wasn't one of them. Rumlow, Pierce greeted, taking a step to the right and showing a half-emptied bottle of bourbon. Rumlow then doubted whether the man would be sober enough for a conversation. They'd had so many, but he'd never seen his boss let alcohol cloud his mind. "You're here earlier than expected. Is everything okay?" He grimaced when he remembered the arrival of his newest asset a few hours, or a day, ago. That's why they'd moved the special task force to a base near Canada, in case Fury decided to stick his nose where he wasn't wanted. Above all, he wanted to test the abilities of the man some had called Shinobi. He hadn't seen anything ninja-like about the man. He almost seemed like a less mystical, much more earthly version of Thor. He didn't understand where that nickname came from, and he wanted to find out so he could come to understand Naruto's importance within Hydra. Because no one would go to the trouble of creating a mission log just to mobilize a squad and hide the arrival of an asset that Fury himself hadn't hired. If Pierce himself had gone to the trouble of finding such a guy and, on top of that, putting on all that show, he must certainly be valuable to them. He wanted to find out for himself. "Yes, sir," Rumlow declared, swallowing slightly. The secretary's eyes rested on him for a few seconds, then returned to his bottle of bourbon, his back completely turned to him. "It's about Naruto Uzumaki, Agent 9. Alexander Pierce left the glass halfway empty, replaced the cap on the bottle, and stared at the ice cubes for a few seconds. With his bare hand, not caring much how cold it was, he picked up one of the cubes and placed it inside the glass. He took the handkerchief from his pocket and began to dry his cold hand with it. "I can understand your doubts, Rumlow. But Uzumaki is a valuable asset within Hydra, more than you think," he assured, still without facing the soldier, who had shown a slight narrowness in his eyes, as if he had closed them slightly to look at him. "He has managed to bring me the plans for the raft, as well as other commissioned works, and having belonged to the Hydra Academy appears in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. during his training. He is a combat-ready specialist, much more qualified than you. Do you remember, Rumlow, what happened in Berlin a couple of days ago? The almost 100 dead and the destruction of a Stark Industries branch." "Yes, Mr. Pierce." Pierce took the glass with the drink and turned it, placing his left hand inside his pants pocket, taking the first sip while looking directly into the eyes of the strike member. "The one who accomplished all that was Naruto, our newest asset," the Secretary of Defense declared, placing his empty glass on the table. "Surprised, aren't you? You can't hide it, Rumlow. Even Fury has expressed amazement at the Uzumaki's abilities. But is he really Shinobi?" The secretary let out a short laugh, making Rumlow impatient, who stopped the idea of leaving when the laughter of his direct boss, both in S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra, diminished until it was nothing more than a brief murmur. "I see you've been searching Hydra's files very thoroughly to stay informed, Rumlow." He took the bottle of bourbon and uncorked it again, using his hand with a swift, precise twist, pouring a second round a few seconds later. He passed the bottle to his opposite hand, and while pouring a second glass, he looked at the member and leader of Strike. "Shinobi. I thought I'd never hear that name again. Do you know what the kid had in his bag, besides some belongings?" "A katana." "Yeah, like a samurai," the man replied, cutting off any words Rumlow himself was going to say. He pushed the glass towards the soldier and he caught it in his hand, raising it. "That sword is made of a steel capable of cutting vibranium, Rumlow, something too incredible, but true. When he stole the raft plans, he was forced to cut through a vibranium vault door to get them. Amazing, right?" "Yes, sir." He'd never admit it outright, but the story Pierce was telling him was getting too fantastical even for him. He'd seen Cap kick aliens and Iron Man blow them up. He'd even crossed paths with the Hulk. But a normal person smashing vibranium? It was way more amazing. But it wasn't just because of the katana that he got that nickname. Pierce continued with the story, while Rumlow took a couple of sips from his glass given to him by the man. If Fury didn't see him, he wouldn't be able to tell him anything or suspend him. Something that would be annoying for him. Like Clint Barton and Natasha Romanoff, Naruto Uzumaki is a special spy, trained only for assassination and infiltration, like a true ninja, hence the term shinobi. He is capable of assassinating someone without being seen, like a shadow. He frowned, placing his glass on the table and looking seriously at his boss. This newcomer turned out to be an asset they could use against Romanoff and Barton if things got complicated. Although the latter seemed to want to put S.H.I.E.L.D. aside for a while, or forever. Family seemed to be more important to the Avengers' Purple Archer. Why did Hydra send him here? He's more valuable than he seems, and we could use him for. Calm down, Rumlow. If they sent Naruto to New York, it's for a reason. This is the Raft, a prison that Hydra will raid to take villains and anti-heroes to join our ranks and swell the army. The secretary put down his glass, pushing it. It hit the strike soldier's glass with a slight clink. From what Hydra has told me, they want some of Banner's DNA to try to reconstruct a serum to create an army of Hulks. It would also be good to obtain Roger's blood and data on Stark. Unfortunately, Thor has left this world and his sister hasn't reappeared. They would be good specimens for us. Luckily, some gifted ones are in our ranks. Brock Rumlow lowered his head, giving a small nod at Pierce's words. Thank you for clarifying my doubt, sir. You're welcome, Rumlow. Now, if our conversation is completely over, I need to finish some paperwork. In a few hours, Naruto will be back from his first mission. I hope he manages to steal data from the extremists. It'll be good for our men. AIM headquarters. 030. He kicked the inert guard with his leg, sending him slamming into several monitors showing images of them, most likely from security cameras. He shook his head, seeing the other guard completely unconscious, thanks to his partner, who was swinging a pair of steel or iron batons. Wearing a shield tactical suit, he jumped the turnstiles at the entrance of the building, walking inside with hasty steps and without looking back. He slid across the floor when he saw another guard, this one reaching for his weapon. He connected with the man's knee, forcing him to fall, and unleashed a punch against his left cheekbone when he was level with him. There was no time for Killian and his special guards to arrive and try to stop them. That would lead to a battle they couldn't afford, not so much for the outcome as for the time they'd waste in a confrontation with enhanced humans, and apparently Fury wanted the AIM CEO's progress data by yesterday. He spun right without waiting for his companion, grabbing another guard by the shoulder and spinning him around, twisting his neck with the movement of his opposite hand, hearing a small, but not at all beautiful, crunch. It didn't matter whether those men lived or died. At least not to him, trained to kill. I hoped it wouldn't be an inconvenience. He took a deep breath and swiped his ID through the door reader, hearing a small click as it clicked. He walked into the room, seeing the servers wrapped in tiny colored lights. He noticed that it was colder in that room than the rest of the building. There are no alarms inside. He walked through the corridors formed by said devices, moving his head from side to side, looking for which one would be the main one. He didn't want to waste too much time, but he also didn't want to fail his mission. He took one of the servers, looking at the cables connected to it, and plugged in a USB drive with a virus that would copy all the information onto it. It would only take a few minutes, which he hoped Bobby could give him. Naruto, I need backup. Now. If I think about the devil first, he appears first. He removed the USB from the port he'd inserted it into and left the server room, noticing that the heat in that area had increased dramatically. He ran a hand over his forehead, noticing small drops of water beginning to form. He walked slowly, his hand on the pistol in his holster, staring straight ahead. When he turned the corner, he saw Barbara Moore shot backward, sliding across the floor, showing minor burns, her face drenched in sweat, her blonde hair slicked back and plastered across her forehead. He threw himself at her and pulled her away from a torrent of flames. They both rolled, landing on top of the agent, who was clearly showing signs of fatigue, panting heavily and sweating. Blood trickled down her burned skin, and she seemed to be grimacing, likely due to the stinging caused by the burns and the proximity of the sweat. Salt and burned skin were not a good combination. I see Barbie got a sunburn, she laughed softly, looking at a bald, slightly corpulent man with orange fire-like marks. He raised an eyebrow as he stood up, helping Bobby catch up with him, though she seemed barely able to stand. A very ugly sunburn. Aspie seems to be using extremis. Bobby showed both iron bars in her hands, turning them over, slightly melted. That surprised him. Did people manage to melt iron? Killian left a guard dog. He brought his right hand to his neck and cracked it with a single movement. How long had it been since he fought a gifted person? He hadn't encountered one for at least a year and a half, which is truly astonishing. Being a mercenary, it must have taken him much longer to encounter people with powers. I'll take care of it, he assured, taking hold of the handle of his katana. When he unsheathed it, he revealed that gray blade to his companion and his enemy, who looked like he was smoking or the reincarnation of a dragon, with the smoke rising from between his teeth. I hope you'll observe my work. I'll see you roasted. He smirked, shooting toward the man, who swung his arm back, creating small flames in his hand. He swung his katana and used it as a shield, as the enhanced man sent the torrent of flames toward him. Behind him, as his clothes seemed to scorch, Bobby brought both hands to her mouth and stifled a scream of horror. Naruto leaped to the left, sweeping his blade across the air and slicing through the smoke. Naruto moved his head away in time, blocking his advance with his left heel and spinning, launching a roundhouse kick at the man, who stopped his leg. He didn't show surprise, instead drawing back his right arm and throwing his katana into the air, catching it with his left arm and slashing down at the man's head. The enhanced hand stopped the blade inches from cutting him. A faint smoke rose into the sky, disappearing into the clouds as the man's hand turned orange. He still wanted to melt his blade. He swung his right arm and slammed it across the stranger's face, sending him stumbling back several steps. The enhanced man took a step back, swinging his katana back and slashing, piercing the stranger's right shoulder. Naruto hissed in pain and sent out a burst of flames. Naruto covered his face with his right arm, noticing how the flames slowly burned through his clothes and then his skin. He pressed his lips together, holding back the urge to scream. He backed away a few feet. "I'll kill you, bastard." The enhanced warrior yanked the katana from his body, tossing it aside, the wound healing as if nothing had happened, surprising him. Caught off guard, he felt a hand grab his right arm, and within seconds, it literally began to burn, forming small clouds of smoke. He pulled, trying to break away, but failing. He hissed, feeling his skin burst into flames. He gritted his teeth and drove his knee into the man's chest, causing him to let go. He backed away several feet, staring in horror at his right arm, completely useless, burned up to the shoulder. I had lost it. He focused his gaze on the enhanced, revealing icy eyes that would have extinguished his flames. He felt no pain from the adrenaline rush of the moment. And he knew that in minutes, maybe half an hour, the pain would hit him. He took a step forward, trying to grab the katana, but was met by the enhanced's hand, which grabbed him by the neck tightly, lifting him slightly. "Where are you going? You look like you found a rock you couldn't kick," the man declared, flashing a cruel smile, tightening his fingers around her neck, cutting off any air she might have taken into her lungs. "I'll burn your entire body." He groaned, feeling the skin on his neck begin to burn from the man. He hadn't expected such improvement in subjects enhanced by aims extremis. All of that data hadn't been reported to Hydra. "I'm going to cough." He didn't even blink when the man's blood stained his face, watching the life drain from his eyes, which remained open as he fell to the ground, dropping him in the process. His katana had pierced the enhanced man's heart, killing him without giving him a chance to regenerate, thus preventing him from causing them any more trouble. He fell onto his butt, feeling sweat trickle down his face, dripping onto his tactical vest. Now, the pain was making its presence felt, causing him to grit his teeth to hold on. Slowly, darkness closed in on him. Naruto. 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 Winter Soldier. It was raining. He felt his hair stick to his forehead even though he was running, completely soaked. He felt drops of water trickle down his face and fall to the ground, a ground soaked in blood. He looked around, seeing corpses scattered all over the place. There was nothing to identify them. Their faces were mangled, as if they had been devoured by a wild beast. Yet for some reason, he knew it had been him. He took steps back, feeling fear, a true fear that seemed to linger in his body. It was rooted in his soul, squeezing his chest until it forced him to gasp and fall to the ground. But he wouldn't be gasping for oxygen, he would be vomiting. He knew it when he could focus his eyes on the floor where his entire breakfast, lunch, and dinner had fallen. It was disgusting. His nose flared slightly at the stench that the gruel emanated into his nostrils. He turned his face away to avoid vomiting again, covering his nose with his left arm, trying to keep the smell from reaching his nose, to make it disappear completely from his memory. But it was impossible. It had, like fear, been etched in his mind, making him close his eyes and briefly clench his teeth. He gasped, again holding back the urge to vomit when the stench of death itself hit his nostrils again. He swallowed hard and avoided throwing up a second time, crawling among the corpses and blood, feeling the liquid wet his knees, his hands. He felt drops falling on his head. He raised his face and widened his eyes, seeing a body hanging, completely flayed, showing the muscle beneath the skin. That image remained in his mind, and he couldn't look away no matter how hard he tried to erase from his mind that he was seeing that and couldn't. It was still there, appearing if he closed his eyes to blink. The hand grabbed him and pulled him, dragging him through the pile of corpses until he was pushed to the side, leaning him against a wall. In a split second, he had before him a slightly rounded face, framed with locks as red as fire itself and green eyes like two emeralds, reflecting a gleam of extreme concern towards him, completely genuine, and that surprised him, but not too much. She had always cared for him. They were like family, something more than friends. Naruto. Naruto. He blinked, shaking his head, noticing that it was a bit jumbled, like it was spinning, and he could barely focus, feeling everything spinning around him. He couldn't focus, no matter how hard he tried. "Natalia," he murmured, noticing how his mouth felt pasty, how difficult it was to speak, and how he could taste blood in his mouth. It was the blood of that flayed man he had run into. What happened? Natalia bared her teeth in a small smile, cupping the teenager's face in her hands and staring at him. Green and blue eyes connected, and a faint blush appeared on the blonde's cheeks. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and opened them when something pressed against his lips, surprising him. He saw how Natalia was on top of him, pressing her body on his, forcing him to be completely pressed against the wall, although he wouldn't complain. It tastes like peach. Are you okay? Natalia asked when she pulled away, brushing her right hand against his face, making him savor the touch. She closed her eyes for several seconds and squeezed the Reteed's hand, feeling the girl's soft skin beneath her grip. You look gone. He shook his head a couple of times, lowering his head and worrying the girl even more, who forced him to raise his face and placed a kiss on his lips again, which made him sigh. Thanks, he muttered under his breath as Natalia pulled away from him. He smiled and took the hand the girl offered him to help him get up. He kept a cool head and didn't look back to where the corpses would be waiting for him, along with that man hanging from a cross, his body completely skinned. He was training for this. He wanted to be a killer to save her, so they wouldn't treat her like a mere weapon, a mere instrument they would use for their own benefit, regardless of what she thought. He forced his hands to clench into fists, clenching them tightly. He dug his nails into the palms of his anuses, tearing at the skin. He felt his own blood running down his forearms, dripping onto the blood-stained floor. He wanted to change everything. For her not to be in that place. To not have to kill. To survive. He wanted so much for a normal life, with a school, a girlfriend. And he wanted her, Natalia Leonovna Romanova, to be by his side forever, to not be put in that position, forced to execute people in cold blood, to use her body to finish things that didn't matter to them. He wanted his Nat to be a ballet dancer so much, his beautiful dream that was shattered. But she was stronger than him. She overcame all the training forced upon her, forming a shell in both her mind and her heart that nearly cast him aside. It took too much effort to become like her, and yet he was weaker, unable to help her, to protect her. For him, Natalia was the strongest woman he'd ever seen in the world. Not because she had powers or was capable of murder with a simple paperclip. But because of what she was going through and how she continued to overcome it despite the walls that were being built against her. Come on, Naru, he came back to his senses when the hand of the woman he loved lightly brushed his cheek again. He had achieved his goal, and they had to get out of that place as quickly as possible without them knowing. If they were discovered, it would all be over for them. I'll protect you, he swore to himself as he looked into the girl's eyes, forming a firm conviction in his mind. Even if they sent the Red Guardian himself, the counterpart to Captain America used by the Soviets, not a fake, to arrest them and send them back home, with those bunks that would be destroyed at any moment and the cold, hard food they were served. With every thought, he admired his Nat even more, as tough and sweet as she was, overcoming it all. He couldn't simply allow them to take her, not when they had agreed to flee that place together, and not look back at the bodies they would leave behind. He nodded slightly at his companion's haste and didn't resist when she pulled him along, making him run away from the courtyard filled with corpses and dismembered and skinned bodies. He didn't want to look back and see them chasing them, their weapons pointed at their exposed backs. Even if it was impossible for him, he would at least get Natalia to a safe place where she would be protected. I swear. End of memory. He groaned as he opened his eyes very slowly, blinking a few times to adjust to the light the lamp cast on him, forcing him to frown and squint. He felt his whole body feel as if it were on fire, scorching slightly. But that discomfort was minimal compared to the pain of the memory he'd had, surely caused by some kind of drug, probably morphine. He realized his drugged state when he felt his body slightly numb, useless to him. He couldn't even lift one of his fingers, and his mouth seemed to feel pasty, useless, when he tried to speak to ask for some water to soothe his dry throat. Then small traces of what happened at AIM came to mind, causing him to shift his eyes to his right arm, realizing it had been completely replaced with a silver one, made of some kind of steel. It was a very advanced prosthetic, far removed from what many people wore and looking even better than Stark's own main armor. At least it was a cybernetic prosthetic that completely replaced his right arm, completely dark gray and devoid of any logos. He had half expected to find a shield or Hydra one on his shoulder, but it was completely clean. Satisfied that there was nothing strange about the same arm, which he couldn't seem to move, he turned his attention to the rest of his body, finding it covered by a thin hospital sheet, which made him sigh. He sniffed a bit, coming to recognize the scent of the morphine and other drugs that seemed to have been injected into his body, coming across several he didn't fully recognize, making him frown slightly, starting a very dark train of thought. He didn't want to end up being a mere experiment for Fury or someone worse. With a few memories from his past, he was completely on guard about what had happened after the fiasco of the AIM mission. He tried to get up, to at least throw off the sheets, only to find that within seconds small sirens began to sound around the room, and within a minute he had a doctor in front of him, with several members of Strike, all expressing amazement at his recovery. He's awake. He grimaced, sitting on the edge of that soft, comfortable hospital bed, covering his face with his left hand, as he tried to find a way to move his new arm, but couldn't. Oh, really? He replied cynically, peering through his fingers at the man in the white coat. He was an older man, with thinning white hair and age lines on his face, a face that showed astonishment and mild terror, as if he were a demon. Then he softened his gaze, changing it to a warmer one, and revealed his face to those present. A slightly sleepy face, with a slightly bushy beard and long blonde hair falling over his eyes, making him appear much more intimidating. If only they knew he was a real demon, he said to himself, remembering Natalia's face for a few seconds, with the corpses behind him and the man completely skinned and impaled. He berated himself for letting the past return and tried with all his might to close the door the morphine had opened, bringing back unpleasant memories that he had kept completely locked away. He wanted to lock that door in his mind with enormous chains and padlocks, throwing away the key to the deepest recesses of his mind. "I'm sorry if I scared you, Doc," he declared, looking with some apprehension at the doctor himself, who, between stammering, began to run some tests on him. He shifted his eyes and observed several of his companions, all of them standing in place, with their weapons at hand, as if waiting for something or someone. "You've woken up, Mr. Uzumaki." He looked up to see Alexander Pierce walking toward him, entering the room. Just like the first time he saw him, the secretary was wearing a gray suit and sporting a slightly confident smile. "I'm glad. What do you think of the enhancements? Your arm was rendered useless after the fight against that extremis enhanced one, and we had to give you a new one. We got it from a compatriot. It's an exact replica, with the same qualities." "I'll have to thank you," he snorted, pushing the doctor away when he finished the pertinent checkup, turning his attention back to Pierce. "How do I get him moving?" "Just think. It's like a human arm, Uzumaki." He closed his eyes for a second, and before he knew it, he was moving his cybernetic arm, grabbing the doctor's neck. Without thinking twice, he closed those fingers and heard the man's neck crack with ease. He dropped him, dead. "I see," he ran his eyes down that arm for the second time, closing his fingers into a fist. "How strong is it?" "Based on the specifications we've obtained, the arm has strength capable of matching Captain America's own or even surpassing it. We don't know for sure, but that's the basis for it," Pierce stated, showing pride in an achievement that was attributed to him. For his part, Naruto closed his eyes again and tried to move that arm a little, finding it slightly comfortable, normal. The limb itself felt somewhat odd, but with training he would get used to it. But the question that came to mind was that same arm. How had they managed to replicate it? It looked exactly like the one used by the Winter Soldier on some of his missions for Hydra. Had they found the place where he slept? He immediately realized that was a stupid question. Being Hydra, they never left aside an asset as important as the Winter Soldier, the one who could be used to eliminate Steve Rogers. He pushed aside the thoughts he'd been having, looking again at the secretary, who seemed to be waiting for him to speak. It seemed he'd been lingering longer than he should have and had focused all the attention on himself. He cleared his throat and looked back at the cybernetic prosthesis. "I should thank you somehow, I suppose," he said, looking directly into the secretary's eyes, expecting to see some strange twinkle. But he seemed completely calm, still wearing the smile he'd walked in with. "Rumlow gave me the USB flash drive with the extremis files. I must thank you for managing to obtain what Killian refused to give us. It's a real pleasure to have assets like you," the secretary assured, fiddling with his tie. Uzumaki frowned, knowing that was only the tip of the iceberg. Hydra would never be satisfied with that data, and at the same time, someone like Aldrich Killian could have it, showing off his idiocy. Especially when the Mandarin seemed to have entered the scene, being an old idiot. Anyone with half a brain would know that the Mandarin was just an actor, surely put in by Killian. "He wants Killian and his assets eliminated," she declared, not as a question, but as a statement. When she looked up, she saw Pierce's eyes, slightly wide with surprise, a surprise he kept hidden as much as possible. But she didn't manage to do it in time. She had him caught. "He's underestimating me," he told himself, feeling somewhat disappointed at the idea of being underestimated. There were many things they didn't know about him, but others in Hydra could tell them. Having his arm destroyed by a nobody with surgically acquired powers had only been a minor misstep that resulted in him being better than before. He'd been given a cybernetic prosthesis, and he doubted Pierce would send him against Killian just because of that. The man's eyes held a new proposition, something he wanted to tell him. Was he hesitating because an enhanced had defeated him? Although it was a shame to him, he couldn't find anyone within strike who could carry out that mission. And he doubted Pierce would use the Winter Soldier for it. He'd save that for facing S.H.I.E.L.D. when Hydra itself came out. If Alexander Pierce had been studying him, considering all his accomplishments and his nickname, he'd know he was the right man for the job. He was a covert member of Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D., part of the strike group, which seemed to be made up of Hydra loyalists. That was why Pierce had given him that arm, and why it would give him something else to use against Killian and his extremis enhanced counterparts. But he doubted he was the only one going after the AIM CEO, when Stark himself was already exposing the Mandarin fraud. "You're holding something back, Mr. Secretary," he muttered, shifting his eyes to the man, who remained completely emotionless, sporting that small smile. But the Uzumaki saw through his mask of satisfaction, finding surprise as the dominant emotion. That man was stupid. How could he be in Hydra? You're very perceptive, Uzumaki. I'm just holding back two things. An apology for using your real name at S.H.I.E.L.D. Naruto shrugged. That wasn't too important. If Fury himself wanted data on him, he'd need to get inside Hydra itself to get it. And it turned out that blind man didn't know anything. And the other thing would be a profitable proposition for you and Hydra. There it was. Whatever that man digested after accepting would be what had brought him to that hospital room. He knew that someone like Pierce never genuinely cared about the men he himself saw as pieces on the chessboard. For Alexander Pierce, he was just another player, but much more important than Rumlow and Strike. That's why he'd given him a cybernetic prosthesis, and now he was offering him something else. Something he could use to gain an advantage against AIM and, surely, against S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers in the near future. I'm listening, Mr. Pierce. He had taken the plunge. From what he learned from that conversation, he had no doubt that his life would change completely and he wouldn't be able to turn back. What Pierce would offer him would be something of equal importance to Extremis itself, granting him somewhat superior abilities that would allow him to confront those enhanced with the surgery created by AIM. I wanted to hear what Pierce had to say. Do you know Captain Rogers? Of course, sir. Pierce nodded and the STRKE members left, carrying the doctor's body out of the room. Then he realized this wasn't a hospital, but rather some kind of secret facility for acts like what had happened there. Steve Rogers, or Captain America, was a super soldier thanks to a serum created during World War II, which Rogers himself took, changing his physique and giving him greater power than a normal person. He has superior strength, speed, endurance, metabolism, and reflexes, Pierce himself listed, earning a question from the blonde, who raised an eyebrow. He couldn't understand why Pierce was telling him those things. Good. Hydra managed to partially recreate the serum and used it in the creation of the Winter Soldier, obtaining inferior results to Rogers himself. But it was something valuable, so they created more Winter Soldiers, hiding them around the world. What do you mean, sir? My proposal is this. Do you want to be a Winter Soldier? Aldrich Killian. He lifted his body using his cybernetic arm, noticing how it seemed to carry his entire body weight, lifting him a few meters off the ground without a problem. His hair was as it had been a few days ago, tied back in a high ponytail, a bun, with some strands framing a face slightly pale from lack of sun exposure. He showed calm, cold blue eyes directed toward one point. A poster of Aldrich Killian, CEO of AIM and the one who had orchestrated an entire movement to get rid of Tony Stark and his company, using the Mandarin figure for all of it. And it had been too profitable, apparently, managing to disassociate himself from Hydra when Stark himself seemed to have died when the Mandarin himself attacked his house with helicopters, launching rockets at it, destroying it. He had gained an advantage by ousting his rival and seemed to want to comfort the widow, or so Rumlow told him when he saw him on the 10th day after his recovery, beginning rehabilitation with physical exercises. He had gained the opportunity to become someone like Captain America and he hadn't wasted anything Hydra wanted to give him, simply to use him as a weapon. But that didn't matter too much to him. Pierce was pulling strings under the table to get Hydra out into the world and dethrone Fury in a direct confrontation, which would be possible with Nick's death and his disappearance from the game. And to do that, to ensure that Hydra achieved a victory over S.H.I.E.L.D. that would completely destroy it, they needed him, or an army like him. After the tests and obtaining the serum used on James Buchanan Barnes, several volunteers had become test subjects, obtaining abilities similar to his own, thus creating the Winter Soldier unit that the Secretary of Defense so desired. With this, they managed to obtain a squad of soldiers with the same power as Captain America, not counting Barnes himself, who was still being kept in cryogenics. It seemed that they were going to reserve him for other types of more secret missions. However, he had been assigned the task of finishing off Killian, along with his Extremis enhancements. He sank down, noticing he was barely sweating. His breathing was a little more labored than at the start of his routine, but nothing more. Any sign of fatigue had been erased by the serum, a copy of the one used on Rogers half a century ago. He moved his arm a little, hearing it create a rustling sound, but it wasn't bothersome. It seemed like the typical sound androids make in a science fiction movie. But it wasn't unpleasant. As long as the prosthesis didn't emit smoke or make any typical engine noises, he'd be fine. He took the towel placed on the bench and rubbed it over his face, displaying a small frown. Ever since he woke up in that office with the prosthesis already implanted, he had repeatedly dreamed of that scene from his past. A scene in which his life took a complete turn and changed him completely, with that oath fresh in his mind and heart. The face of Natalia Leonovna Romanova appeared every day when she closed her eyes and fell into the world of dreams until she woke up, completely bathed in sweat and with glassy eyes, darkened by the elongated shadow of her past. He admitted to himself that it terrified him. He felt the same fear he'd felt when he was a simple boy, a teenager protected by a girl who was a murder expert and had been stripped of everything good in his being, except for his very soul. Although Natalia had been trained, there was still much more beneath that simple mask that hid her feelings. Linked to the same memories of that day, he observed again the sad face of Natalia herself when she discovered that she was not, in fact, a dancer, how she began to cry silently, knowing that she would never be able to procreate, and how she had simply been used, despite the devotion she felt for her country. He threw a straight shot and saw the iron beam holding the barbell he'd been training with give way under the blow from his cybernetic arm. He saw the knuckle marks, how the beam itself had bent under the force. He clicked his tongue loudly, angrily throwing the towel aside, not looking as it fell at someone's feet. That someone took the towel in his hand and threw it back to its owner, who caught it with a hand that still belonged to him and wasn't supposed to be gloved. He blinked a few times, staring at a dark-skinned man with an eye patch over his left eye, completely obscuring it. If anyone looked closely, they could see scars reaching down to the eye socket of the man dressed in an oversized trench coat, almost reaching his feet, slightly above them. "Finally, I get to meet you, Agent 9, the man declared, not showing the slightest bit of joy at being introduced to a new asset to his force. He seemed to be the man who always kept a straight face, who knew what he was doing and what could happen if things went wrong. Pierce seems to want to poke his nose into my men, something I don't usually tolerate. How's your arm? Agent Morse told me about what happened." He grimaced and placed the towel back on the bench, now wet with the sweat his body had produced. "It's going well. Sir. Fury, Nick Fury. But you can call me Fury," he assured, now showing his white teeth with a small thin smile as he watched him. He felt Fury's own scrutiny of him, as if he expected something from him and was questioning him about it. If he had known what Fury wanted, he would have given it to him. But instead, he took a sleeveless t-shirt with his cybernetic hand and placed it over his body, hiding his formed torso from the female agents who had been watching him while he trained, thus beginning a round of murmurs orchestrated by the same agents. Sometimes he wondered why he continued training there, in full view of everyone. He confronted Fury himself, noticing that the most important man in S.H.I.E.L.D. was somewhat shorter than him after using the serum, showing a good build for his age, but not reaching his or Roger's own. "What do you want, Director?" he asked bluntly, while slight gasps occurred around him. It seemed that no one spoke directly to the director himself. He seemed to create an image of him that forced others to fall silent when they saw him, lowering their faces slightly in submission. If anyone should lead Hydra, it should undoubtedly be Fury. Unlike Pierce, that man was tall, powerful, and serious, instilling fear in his enemies. Pierce, on the other hand, was simply a well-trained buffoon, pulling the necessary strings. When the battle began, Alexander Pierce would no longer be useful and would die by S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own hand or Hydra's own. Neither organization would need him after the onset of everything that was coming. And neither did he. Now he'd managed to acquire physical enhancements that would help him when this all began, and he certainly wouldn't be of any use to Pierce. He was only doing what was assigned because it benefited Hydra itself. Finally, someone with guts. To her astonishment, Fury smiled even wider and patted her back a couple of times as they began walking out of the gym, under the gaze of the mostly female agents gathered there. The men's section seemed to have a different training schedule. But he already had his own regime to follow and couldn't upset it by being the center of attention of the females present. Although he wouldn't deny that he disliked it. "I'd like to get to know you a little better, kid. Tennessee, California, 2200 hours." He set the armor aside in some frustration, with no battery and little chance of survival due to the cold. Luckily, after an immense walk, he had found a barn and took shelter in it, letting his Mark 42 rest while observing the serious damage to the armor, which generated a growing frustration in him, causing him to kick a garbage can. Regretting the kick, when he went to place it, he found a potato cannon pointed at him, which at first made him laugh briefly, watching seconds later as Harley Keener fired said weapon, displacing what appeared to be an abandoned can, but at that moment, she made it clear to the boy that there were no more potatoes in the barrel and that he was defenseless. At which point Harley had seen his armor abandoned on the couch and opened her eyes. Bombarding him with questions and discovering that it was Tony Stark and that he was not dead, something that Aldrich Killian would soon discover. Knowing that Killian and his men would be after him, he began using everything he could find in Harley's workshop, under Harley's watchful eye, to repair the Mark 42 and use it. He had managed to contact Happy thanks to the case involving the same armor, and now he would send a car after him, but without Pepper finding out. He couldn't give Killian any information about his whereabouts in case they didn't know about his condition. Every day that passed, he discovered more and more that this wasn't his year, what with the Chitauri invasion, the nightmares, the theft of the raft plans, and now a spiteful guy from his past trying to kill him, something he wasn't too happy about. Still, he was determined to take care of him as soon as his armor was ready and get him away from Pepper, not out of jealousy, but because he was evil and after the Mandarin. Now he wished Rogers or one of the Avengers were with him there so he could help him deal with Killian himself and his enhanced soldiers. He couldn't handle them all alone, and S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't seem to want to send much help. They were probably busy with some urgent mission or something important somewhere in the world they traveled so often. Knowing he was alone, he chose to find evidence against Killian, finding it right there, thanks to Harley who first told him about his death and then about the strange events with people exposed to extremis, which Aldrich so longed to perfect. With their investigation together, they found the mother of one of those who used that surgery, discovering that the man had died from an explosion from the inside out, thanks to the same work done by Aldrich, Killian and AIM, thus discovering that extremis was truly dangerous and that they needed to get rid of it as soon as possible. Now, there they were, on a cold night, being harassed by two men who displayed extremis in their systems and pointed their hands at them, demonstrating they could generate fire. An image of a dragon flashed through his mind and he allowed himself a small smile, probably the last one he'd ever give. He was so sorry he'd left Pepper alone with that problem. He'd always burdened her with problems, too many, and she'd never seemed to complain openly, always being by his side, through thick and thin. I couldn't tell her that I loved her with all my soul and wanted to start a family with her. Oh, the children they would have would be so beautiful. Although I hoped they would be more like her. I absolutely didn't want another one like him. It would be too much for society. Sorry, Harley, Stark muttered through gritted teeth, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders and covering him with his body, pushing him back, glancing at both of Killian's employees. If he had his Mark 42, he could take them on, but it still needed some tweaking and a little battery life. He hated it so much when they ran out. They were like cell phones. He cursed himself for not carrying a spare. Don't worry, Mr. Stark. Tony frowned as he looked at both of Killian's enhanced subjects, shielding the boy as much as possible with his body as he tried to hide his gaze from both subjects. He missed Jarvis in his head, his advice. But he'd been left with the Mark 42 and now he felt completely alone, something he didn't think he'd ever experience. But he didn't want that boy to die for his own investigations. Still, he knew they wouldn't let him go and they didn't have any potato throwers to protect them. He sounded desperate. And he was desperate. Run when I lunge at them, Harley. We only get one chance, he declared, looking closely at both men. He took a step back as they took a step forward, blowing faintly like heaters. Loss. He opened his eyes fully when a figure leaped at them, crouching behind both enhanced figures, hiding his face from them. He was wearing what appeared to be a tactical uniform, leaving both arms exposed. He stopped himself from whistling when he saw the man's completely cybernetic right arm. The stranger swung his arm, slamming his metal forearm into the woman just as she spun around. He grabbed Harley and sent him sprawling to the ground, yanking him hard and allowing the woman to walk over them, completely destroying the fence. Both of them watched in amazement as the stranger now covered his face with the same cybernetic arm of flames, unconcerned that the flames might melt the metal or damage the circuitry. He strode forward with quick steps and slammed his cybernetic hand into the man's face, slamming him into the ground with all the force he seemed to possess, creating small cracks in the floor below the man's neck. The blond man raised his left arm and, before Killian's employee could even get up, delivered a powerful blow that completely knocked him out, as well as his partner. He turned his head, looking through golden locks at Stark and the child, standing up as he grabbed the unconscious man by the collar and began walking towards them both. He threw the man at Stark's feet while he unseated the mask on his face, revealing him to Tony Stark's dark, shocked eyes, who choked back a little. A bushy beard, blue eyes, and a stern face were what the great billionaire found. Sorry for the delay, Mr. Stark, Naruto stated calmly, glancing briefly at Harley, who was too focused on her cybernetic arm to notice his gaze. He shifted his eyes back to the Iron Man. I am, what you would consider, your bodyguard. Some bodyguard, Harley whistled, earning a small laugh from the Uzumaki, causing the teenager to blush deeply, causing him to look away in embarrassment. He massaged his neck with his cybernetic hand, feeling a cold sensation run through him. Despite his gloved hand, he still felt the chill of the vibranium the prosthesis was made of. It still felt strange. He wasn't quite used to it, even though it had been a week and a half since the implant. Yes, everything's fine, his body creaking, revealing a tired look. His face was paler than usual, with that scruffy goatee. But I need to find Killian as soon as possible. I can't allow him to stain the floor with more blood. Extremis seems to be a self-destructive thing. That's what I'm here for, Mr. Stark, the Uzumaki stated as calmly as possible, searching for something in the back pocket of his uniform pants, showing the creator of the most famous armor in the world his identification as a high-ranking member of S.H.I.E.L.D., earning another whistle from the boy next to Stark. Allow me to help you in any way I can. Crater, Port of New York. He dropped onto the crane from the Quinjet, rolling across the ground and slamming his fist into one of Killion's augmentees, sending it tumbling into a metal railing before falling to the ground at least 20 meters below. He whipped his head around, hearing the explosions as the extremis augmentees ripped through every Stark armor that attacked them, sending waves of fire from their limbs. He scanned the sky, watching as James Rhodes blasted the augmentees with his rockets, trying to get close to a suit of armor that seemed to be hanging like Jesus Christ. Inside it was most likely the President of the United States, whom they should rescue. He raised his hand, giving a small command, watching as his vehicle disappeared into the sky behind the cloaking system. He refocused his vision, leaping over a railing, landing on a dumpster. He dodged a flare and fell, catching himself on the edge of the same dumpster with his prosthetic limb, letting out a clicking sound, not sure if he was upset. He was nearly roasted by the movement. He used his legs to propel himself backward, performing an inverted somersault, landing on the lower walkway of the enormous crane. He ducked, evading a blow and deflecting a second, stumbling backward, observing a man with orange markings. He stopped the man's fist with his cybernetic hand and jabbed at the man's jaw, thinking he heard a crunch. Uzumaki drew his arm back and jabbed again, now seeing the stranger's jaw loose, blood dripping from his mouth. He grimaced slightly as drops stained his feet. He grabbed the man's hand and used his new arm to forcefully throw the mercenary against a dumpster. The dumpster bounced off the massive container and fell to the ground, turning into a steaming paste of blood, bones, and flesh belonging to his attacker. He reared back, dodging a blow. He repeated the movement with a second and a third, forced a duck to avoid a mass of flames that would have burned his face. He let out a small grunt, launching a roundhouse kick at the guy's legs, sending him to the ground with a metallic echo. He raised his fist and slammed it into the enhanced man's face, sending him crashing back to the ground, shattering the back of his head. "Aldrich Killian is a lunatic," he muttered, shaking his head on his shoulder. Iron Man flew over the dark sky, now a different armor, which made him smirk behind his mask. But there's Iron Man. Is this what being an Avenger is? Killing someone is so good. Performing Parker, he leaped onto a lower container, rolled across it, and leaped off the edge, grabbing another container with his arms. He used both arms, especially his right arm, to pull himself up onto the container without much effort, landing just below the armor that completely covered the president. He raised his head, searching with his left hand for something in his back belt pockets, pulling out something slightly elongated. "Now I regret not bringing my katana," he declared, defeated. He shook his head and released the device after pressing a small button. It stuck in place, beeping softly. "I hope it works." The fiery blast knocked the container he was standing on to the side, sending him reeling, causing him to crouch. He raised his cybernetic arm and slammed it into the container, shattering it and creating a hole in it, where he braced himself as a second blast shook him. "Oh, holy shit." With a crunch, the chains holding the enormous container broke and it began to fall toward the ground at great speed. He felt himself briefly separate from the container and then fall onto it, feeling his jaw connect with the top of it, causing him to bite his tongue. The salty, slightly metallic taste of blood flooded his mouth. He slid the mask to one side and spat. He felt every muscle in his body shaken by the impact. He looked down and let out a grunt. Pierced by his right abdomen was a piece of the same container, completely stained with blood. His blood. He gasped softly between grunts, yanking the metal out and hurling it at one of Killion's soldiers. He allowed himself a smile as the piece pierced his head from side to side. He rolled down the dumpster and let himself fall, covering the wound with a piece of cloth, enduring the pain. It seemed the extremis users could injure him too easily every time he crossed paths with them. He advanced a few meters toward what appeared to be the shipyard's main building, slowly moving his legs, letting the blood trickle down his abdomen. From a few meters behind, he watched as Tony was knocked to the ground by Aldrich Killian, whose body was a shen, with orange marks. Had he been an idiot and used extremis on himself? No one in their right mind would do that unless they were 100% stable. He frowned as he watched Stark's secretary walk by, showing signs of having been operated on by Killian himself. Judging by the woman's expression, she was going to execute Killian himself. He closed his eyes for a few brief moments and without thinking much about it, he ran away, taking the piece of iron with his blood and that of the subject he killed by throwing it. He pulled his cybernetic arm back and fired with all his might, letting out a snort as if the simple piece of metal were a spear. He saw with his own eyes how Aldrich Killian was impaled. The surprise in the woman's eyes and the grimace in Stark's. Naruto Uzumaki wasn't afraid to kill someone. He'd done it hundreds of times by now, and Aldrich Killian wouldn't be the last, he knew. He'd started down a path that would likely end in his own death, completely alone, with no one to help him. He'd been alone ever since their separation. And it looked like it was going to stay that way. He lowered his arm, straightening his body completely, watching as Aldrich Killian's body began to burn, turning completely into ash. A black ash that stained the ground. It was as black as his own soul. The evil always comes early. Steve Rogers massaged his neck with some force, letting out a loud yawn due to the tiredness of the night mission that Fury himself had given him the night before. Mercenaries took control of a ship owned by S.H.I.E.L.D. and were forced to work alongside members of Strike to rescue the crew without any casualties on their side. As for the mercenaries, according to what he had learned from Romanov, they were sent to Rikers or the Raft, depending on its importance and danger. Regarding the latter prison, they had been busy monitoring it because of the mercenary who stole the plans from Stark Industries. They expected some movement towards the prison, but in those weeks nothing seemed to have happened. He chewed a little, clicking his molars as he started up the stairs to his apartment. He was exhausted, too tired for S.H.I.E.L.D. to call him on a mission or for Tony to try to take him out to parties. How many times was that? Maybe 15, and he never managed to get him drunk on even the strongest alcohol, which made Stark treat it as a personal mission. Something that had amused Rogers. He turned right, seeing his neighbor with a basket of dirty, or probably already washed, clothes. She was a woman with blonde hair that fell straight to her shoulders, and Rogers himself thought the woman looked vaguely familiar, as if her features matched those of someone he had known in his past. He stopped in front of his front door, searching his jacket pockets for the keys to the same door. Inside was a cell phone Fury had given him and a pack of peppermint candy that brought back memories of his time in Brooklyn with his best friend, almost a brother, Bucky, who had saved him so many times he couldn't count them in his head. With fingers trembling from the memory of his youth, he took out the keys to his apartment, jingling the keyring that hung on it, a small shield like the one he used as Captain America. He stepped into the room, frowning at the sound of music. He leaned his back against the wall and slowly walked over to where the record player was, his senses on high alert. He regretted not carrying a gun, but since becoming an Avenger, he'd never used a weapon other than his shield, which was resting on the other side of the room, too far from his hand to use, so he was completely defenseless against a shot from the intruder. Captain Rogers, he opened his eyes, seeing Fury sitting in his chair with his hand on his abdomen, squeezing it lightly, showing signs of being hurt. "I'm sorry for the intrusion." He tried to move, but the director raised his hand, stopping Rogers from moving. He was hidden by the shadows on the floor, his head spinning with bitter thoughts. How could Fury have ended up like this? There were almost no enemies that S.H.I.E.L.D. itself couldn't stop. What happened, Fury? He let the question slip through his teeth, moving his eyes to where his shield was, hoping to grab it in case someone broke into his apartment. "You look bad." "You're pointing out the obvious, Rogers," laughed the S.H.I.E.L.D. director, flashing a bleeding smile. Nick Fury's usually white teeth were now pink with blood. "But I look horrible." "No, don't take another step. I think they might eliminate me soon, or try to." He tossed aside his trench coat and threw an object from his pants pocket, which Steve caught with one hand, looking at Fury in confusion about the USB. "There's too much valuable information here, Captain. Trust no one absolutely." He turned his body away as the window pane shattered from the impact, a bullet that struck Fury in the chest, completely silencing any sentence he was about to finish, spitting blood slightly and staining his shirt. He began to convulse from the shot, lying on the couch, when a second bullet hit the lamp next to the director. Rogers slid his body around, grabbing Fury's ankles, pulling him down and dragging him behind a bookcase, right where his shield was. He took it in his right hand, adjusting it tightly as he crouched, waiting. "Rogers?" A female voice hit his ears. He shifted his head and looked over his shoulder. He saw he'd left the door open and the same neighbor had come in, frowning at him, holding a gun and cautiously entering. "Is everything okay?" Rogers shook his head a couple of times, moving his eyes towards Nick Fury's prone body. "He's been hit. I must go after his attacker," the captain declared, launching himself into the street and jumping through the shattered window, reaching the other building and entering through the window where the bullet had entered. He rolled on the ground and covered himself with his shield, taking a series of shots that ricocheted off the shield itself. He moved it, throwing it at the attacker, seeing how he moved an iron arm trapping his shield, so he ran and jumped, kicking the enemy's chest, seeing how he rolled on the ground dropping the shield, which ended back with Rogers, who turned and hit the left side of that assailant. He shifted his eyes, taking a few steps back, examining his attacker. He was a man slightly shorter than him, by a few inches, with a good build and blonde hair tied in a bun with a mask covering the lower part of his face. Cold blue eyes sent him a warning. "If I were you, I wouldn't do it, Captain." "But I'm not you," the captain countered, moving the shield to the side, positioning it so it covered his torso. "Why did you attack Fury?" The blonde didn't take his eyes off him, moving his iron hand, attracting Rogers' attention for a few seconds. Time the blonde used to launch himself and throw a punch, which was blocked by the shield. He slid backward under the blonde man's blow, gritting his teeth. He angled his body and threw him back as he dropped his shield and grabbed a chair, slamming it into the man, forcing him to back away, shield in hand. Steve Rogers jumped onto the table in that room and kicked the soldier's chest with both legs, slamming him into the wooden door, which gave way under the impact, and the blonde ended up in the hallway, on his back, still holding the shield. He rose up among the splinters of wood and rolled across the ground, dropping the shield, dodging the captain's kick. He jumped into a somersault and blocked the edge of the shield with his cybernetic arm. Sparks flew as the two collided, sending Rogers tumbling back a few steps, while Rogers himself didn't seem to budge, running at him again. Naruto ducked and slipped under the shield, delivering a hook to his opponent's right abdomen, hearing him groan in pain. He even thought he heard a crunch. Luckily, he didn't use his right arm. He raised his cybernetic arm and blocked Rogers' fist, only to be knocked to the left by the trooper's force. He pressed forward with his left leg and attempted a blow with his left fist, but the vibranium shield's impact blocked it, echoing through the hallway. They were at a draw. Rogers used force, sending Naruto backwards and passing his body underneath the blonde, lifting him above his body and throwing the soldier against a window, shattering it. He heard the body of the cybernetic arm soldier fall onto the hood of a car, smashing it and setting off its alarms. He ran a hand over his face and set the shield aside, noticing a small dent in it. He looked out the shattered window and didn't find the attacker, frowning at the fact that he couldn't find him. Had he left? The worry he'd had about Fury returned to his mind, causing him to turn and run down the stairs with a worried expression, not even caring about the blood running down the right side of his face, dripping onto his shoulders and staining the jacket he was wearing. The pain from his ribs shattered by the stranger's blow seemed to be easing as the seconds passed, likely thanks to his own improved metabolism, thanks to the ground. But despite that, he felt slight stinging pains hitting his side, making it difficult to breathe. He could feel at least a piece of rib stuck somewhere inside his body, tearing slightly. He lowered his head, watching as blood seemed to trickle down his side, running down his right leg. Shit. This is perfect. Herculean. He tossed aside the mask that had hidden his face, revealing a blood-stained lip with a wound covered by a scab, just beginning to heal. It had been about 2 hours since his fight with Rogers, and he had to admit his metabolism was working well, too well. The bones shattered after falling on a car were slowly beginning to heal, knitting together beneath his skin. He'd probably be as good as new in one night. But he didn't have that time. Fury had been eliminated, and Captain America himself could turn on them when he discovered them. He knew that perfectly well without having met Rogers himself. He dropped the top of his tactical uniform, revealing several crystals embedded in his skin, tearing at it and digging into his body with every movement he made. He grimaced in displeasure, moving to a mirror and using his cybernetic arm to pull each crystal shard from his body, revealing small drops of blood at the very tip. That blood would undoubtedly be valuable to Hydra. According to Pierce himself, he had gotten a better upgrade than the first Winter Soldier, who had now been sent to hunt down the loyal remnants of S.H.I.E.L.D. and execute them by his hand, without having to get his hands dirty thanks to Barnes. He snorted a little, looking at his face in the mirror, with a scar on his lip now healed, skin too pale for his own liking, and a cybernetic arm on his body. Had this come to this? His steps had led him down that path full of shadows, of blood, always surrounded by death and the loneliness that came with that life. And he had never doubted it for a second, and he wouldn't doubt it now. Hydra was coming out into the open, destroying the organization that should protect the world, changing what people knew. Red Skull was a visionary who had hoped for just that his beloved Hydra would come to dominate the world itself, and he seemed to be achieving it by leaps and bounds. With Nick Fury off the board, the chances of S.H.I.E.L.D. stragglers acting on the matter were greatly diminished. Strike himself seemed to be in charge of all special operations, and there was no doubt they were members of Hydra. All he needed was one look, just one, and he could see the dark desires hidden within them all. He tilted his head, tossing his hair to the side and revealing his neck. He moved his bionic arm, brushing his vibranium fingers over his skin, feeling the cold run down his spine, making him blink a few times, biting his lower lip. He had to change all of this. The past was knocking loudly at his door, and the only way he could get rid of it was to use all his strength to eradicate it. But if he were honest with himself, the confrontation with Rogers had encouraged him to continue. He wanted another hand-to-hand fight with the symbol of America, the one who had destroyed Hydra in the past, thanks to his comrades. Now, Steve Rogers was completely alone, without the support of the Avengers and with Fury injured. Only a shield accompanied him, and it couldn't be of much help from what he knew about Hydra itself, which had conned the government itself. Now he regretted that the current president hadn't been assassinated by Killian. "Naru, I hope you never change." He gasped, leaning back on his knees as he gasped, sweating slightly. He brought his left hand to his head, closing his eyes against the migraine that hit him, staggering to the side. He felt the cold of the locker as his body hit it, slightly denting the door. "What the buck?" he cursed, gritting his teeth. For a few brief seconds, Natalia's face appeared in his head, so real that he thought it was right in front of him, inches from his own. With a few stumbles, he reached a bench and sat down, head in his hands, trying to make the migraine go away completely. His eyes seemed to be burning, and he couldn't keep them open for long, forcing himself to close them tightly, squeezing them shut for several seconds. He gasped, breathing heavily, and slammed his vibranium hand down on the bench, causing it to give way. He fell on his butt onto the wreckage, groaning at having fallen on the bench. Frustrated by the fight with Rogers, Uzumaki didn't open his eyes, keeping them closed, trying somehow to make Rumlow's voice fade away and not let it sound again for hours if necessary. He even thought about eliminating that voice himself, squeezing the strike leader's weak human neck and breaking it with the hand they'd given him. It would be too good to be true. You don't know how much. Naruto lowered his cybernetic hand, revealing eyes obscured by his hair. He blinked a few times and shifted his blue orbs toward the man who was his boss, not directly, but a boss nonetheless. He was supposed to be a member of Strike, a subordinate of Rumlow himself, who stared at him without blinking once, his teeth bared in a crooked, slightly mocking smile. I plan to tear him apart next time. I must wish you luck with that, Uzumaki. Right now, Pierce is subtly trying to convince Rogers to join Hydra, following Fury's death. If he doesn't budge, I have the intention and direct orders to assassinate him. If possible, in front of his admirers. You know they're mostly boys. He frowned, interlacing his fingers, breathing more calmly. The headache seemed to have vanished. Oh, that's why I say it. He was a monster with a soul too dark to look anyone in the eye. But Rumlow, he didn't even seem to know what he was saying. Did he want to destroy the minds of young people? Not even he would wish the worst on children. They were life, the future that could bring light to the world. You're sick. Probably, Rumlow smirked. That smile faded when a voice in his ear seemed to be telling him something. It seems our friend Rogers isn't trustworthy. Time to move. He didn't say goodbye. He moved his eyes and watched as Brock Rumlow walked away with light steps, taking a bulletproof vest from one of the lockers, probably his own, and disappearing around the side of it, turning around. Having lost Rumlow himself, Naruto stood up, completely focused, hearing the strike leader himself begin to give orders. None of them could stop Captain America on their own, he knew all too well, which indicated that Pierce would use the Winter Protocol and send Bucky Barnes after his comrade to capture him and have him publicly executed, all after apparently making people think Rogers was a traitor. He had heard the voices over the PA. He yanked open his locker, grabbing a long thermal shirt that clung to his torso, marking him for anyone who might see. He bent down, reaching for his bulletproof vest, grasping it with the cold fingers of his cybernetic hand, and began to pull it on over the shirt, staring at his reflection with eyes slightly colder than he would have expected. He pulled on the straps when he heard a loud noise. It looks like Rumlow will have a lot more work than before. Naruto Uzumaki turned around and slammed his locker shut, starting to walk towards the locker room exit, watching the image of Steve Rogers on one of the many televisions in the room. He would never say out loud that he even slightly respected Rogers. He'd turned the world against him by being framed as a miserable traitor, and he'd surely come back for more, without backup, with only his shield and his motorcycle to destroy everything Pierce had built, everything Hydra wanted for itself. No one had to tell him the obvious. Hydra was rising again, and Captain America would give his life to stop it. But could Rogers handle the Winter Protocol and Project Insight alone? He had guts, too much of them, and he seemed willing to go to his certain death against the Hydra forces, who had taken everything. Naruto sighed heavily, looking away from the enormous screen and at the other agents watching. He frowned for a few seconds before shaking his head slightly, turning and starting to walk towards the opposite side, where Rumlow had started marching alongside Strike, who seemed to have their hands full hunting Rogers. A bang made him stop in his tracks. He shifted his torso, placing his eyes out the window, seeing how a Quinjet had been destroyed on the bridge, preventing the Hydra vehicles from pursuing Captain America. Had he really destroyed something of that size? He didn't hide the laughter that escaped his lips when he saw how the vehicles commanded by Pierce were blocked by the remains of the Quinjet. Now, I guess I'll have some work. Grimacing, Naruto turned his body again, heading towards one of the elevators, showing what some might see as a sad face. Next day, streets of New York. Rogers raised his shield, being sent flying back by the force of the Winter Soldier's blow, as Natasha Romanoff had called him a few hours earlier, but being completely different. That soldier wasn't the blonde-haired, blue-eyed one he'd seen when Nick Fury himself was wounded by that man, dying hours later in the hospital from the injuries caused by that shooter. But this one was different. The cybernetic arm was his left one and featured dark hair, probably brown bordering on black, and paler than the previous one. He pushed with his legs and moved his shield aside, forcing the Winter Soldier to take several steps back. He opened his eyes and covered his body with his shield, catching a grenade that hit him and sending him flying into the side of a van, knocking the shield loose. He grunted, trying to get up, when the man's metallic arm tightened around his neck, using cold fingers to squeeze his throat. He coughed in the Hydra member's face, feeling his fingers tighten even further, cutting off all air from his lungs. He strained with both hands and with effort pulled the Winter Soldier's hand away, leaving him on the ground with his feet once again, his eyes narrowed by his own effort. He took a step forward and rammed the man with his body, sending him several steps back. Steve. He ran onto the hood of the car, grabbing the shield Sam threw at him and throwing it back at the Winter Soldier, hoping to hit him in the face and find out who he was or at least shatter his lower jaw with the blow. Both former soldiers were astonished when the Winter Soldier caught the shield with his arm, causing Sam Wilson to whistle in amazement, unable to evade the blow the Hydra member sent using the captain's own shield, causing the dark-haired man to fall onto the hood of a car. Alone. Enraged by what had happened, Steve Rogers leaped from his perch and kicked the Winter Soldier in the chest, sending him tumbling back several steps. He rolled across the ground and grabbed a car rearview mirror, slamming it into the soldier's face, knocking his mask off and crashing to the ground. He retrieved the shield while he waited, opening his eyes slightly at first, then widening them when he saw the man's face, his face chilling at his identity. After almost 100 years, he thought he would never see that face again. Bucky? James Buchanan Barnes, alias Bucky, moved his face, wiggling the bottom of his chin as he spat to one side. For a few seconds, when the man said that name, his head seemed to throb slightly and he was forced to back away. I'm not Bucky, he hissed, raising cold eyes at the man who had been like a brother to him, taking a pistol and emptying the clip into Rogers, watching as the captain covered himself with a vibranium shield and taking advantage of that to run and kick the shield, forcing Cap to roll backwards from its force. I'm not Bucky. He raised his cybernetic arm and prepared to unleash its power by throwing a punch at Rogers himself, who was left without his shield, lying on his back and leaning lightly against a car door. Then, a swift Natasha Romanoff wrapped her legs around that arm, moving her hands and trying to pull it down, forcing Barnes himself to give up his position. But the Winter Soldier didn't budge an inch from Romanoff's hold. The asset spun around and slammed the Russian's body against the hood of a car twice, seeing her face grimace in pain at what he had done and loosening his grip, which Barnes took advantage of to grab the spy and throw her to the ground, while dark vehicles began to arrive around the area, revealing the strike soldiers, all of them with gas masks and ready. Bucky grabbed his mask from the floor and turned his back on Rogers without looking back, covering the lower part of his face and starting to walk away, still with that throbbing pain in his head, making the Winter Soldier look upset. Who's Bucky? He wondered as he disappeared into the crowd, receiving cautious glances from passers-by and briefly observed by some strike soldiers, who turned their attention to Captain America and his companions, now asleep from the gas, to the muffled screams of some fans who still didn't believe that their idol had betrayed the country and wanted its destruction. Captain America himself was supposed to have fought during the war to save them. What sense would it make to destroy them years later? But James Buchanan Bucky Barnes wasn't thinking about that, his mind focused on his next mission, even with the persistent headache that had appeared after being called Bucky by the captain, something he didn't quite understand and that bothered him now, after the confrontation. He had felt homesick, as if he had lost something and needed it back as soon as possible. Could he really be the Bucky Steve Rogers wanted? He covered his face with his right hand, wiping away the sweat that trickled down his face and soaked his neck. His forehead throbbed more and more, causing him to pause as he leaned against the wall, biting his lower lip hard and holding back a moan of pain that tried to escape his throat, tearing slightly at the growing pain itself. Soldier. He closed his eyes and opened them a second later, looking at a man in front of him. What do you want now, sir? Bucky Barnes' pained voice came out of his throat, causing the man in front of him, who was none other than Alexander Pierce, to raise one of his eyebrows at the poor appearance of his asset. I see a confrontation with Rogers has pushed you to the limit, the secretary boasted, earning a flat stare from the Winter Soldier, who waited for his boss to speak again. He had been trained, drilled, to follow orders. The time has come for Winter Protocol to be activated. At that simple phrase, of no importance to others, James Buchanan Barnes let out a grunt, being forced to close his eyes by a sharp pain, only to open them seconds later, revealing dark eyes as cold as ice itself. Yes, sir. Fury's asset. He looked with sad eyes at the handcuffs that covered his wrists, preventing him from making any movement of his arms, such as massaging his neck or shoulder, that had been damaged by his former friend and almost brother, Bucky Barnes, who seemed to have been completely controlled by Hydra, undoing his memories, implanting others and creating a control over the sergeant, who barely seemed to have recognized him when they were both raised together, like brothers. On the streets of Brooklyn in a New York too different from today's, when men seemed to be led down the path of hand-to-hand combat and leaving their minds to others. He twiddled his thumbs while his hands were clasped together, supporting his chin. His skin seemed to have turned slightly wider, likely from the shock of seeing his best friend resurrected, probably the same age as him, but being the cause of Howard Stark's death and who knows what other atrocities, something that was really bothering him. He had never thought of completely destroying Hydra or killing the Skull. But Alexander Pierce was driving him to want to do it and use his own hands to do it. He clicked his tongue behind his lower teeth, leaning against the wall of the truck that was taking him and his companions back to Triskelion, something he couldn't stop no matter how hard he tried. He had forced Sam to confront Hydra using his equipment that made him take on the role of Falcon. And for that, he had been beaten by Bucky and thrown into a vehicle without consideration by the Winter Soldier. He knew he was more hurt than he was. Even Romanoff was. No one counted on his metabolism. Maybe Hulk or Thor, but no one else. And that was what angered him the most. He allowed Sam to be wounded and Natasha to be brought down, and he couldn't stop his enemy because he had revealed himself to be his childhood friend, displaying the ruthless aspect of a true soldier and devoid of any emotion. If it hadn't been for them, he had no doubt Bucky would have killed the civilians on the street, regardless of their age or status. "I'm sorry," Rogers said, looking first at Natasha and then shifting his eyes to Sam, who shrugged and then hid as much as possible a grimace of pain that didn't go unnoticed by the captain and the spy, who frowned slightly, knowing that their friend had been injured, surely counting some broken ribs and bruises, probably, from the hit area. "It's my fault we fell into the hands of Hydra." He truly felt what had happened. Knowing Pierce's own plans, he had fallen before arriving at the Triskelion to stop them, destroying his plans by destroying the Helicarriers Fury had once shown him. Thanks to Zola, they had discovered several steps of the Secretary's plans and the creation, within S.H.I.E.L.D., of Hydra itself again, all by his hand and in the shadow of everyone, now leading to global destruction, with the deaths of millions of innocent people who had not yet done anything to suffer that fate. But it had all been for nothing. The Winter Soldier had caught them off guard, completely defeating them without further ado, all by himself. He had put them in check, and there was nothing they could have done. He slammed his heel into the floor of the compartment they were confined in, moving toward his personal prison. It was clear Pierce was going to get rid of them when they stepped foot in the Triskelion, or he'd control them like he had Bucky. "It's more my fault," Sam replied, snapping him out of his thoughts. He shifted his eyes to his partner, watching him grit his teeth in pain. He probably had more than one broken rib from falling on a car after Bucky hit him. "If I'd been more attentive, I wouldn't have ended up beaten to a pulp by that soldier." Seriously, who was he? The Winter Soldier, Natasha Romanoff hissed, entering the conversation, earning a hollow laugh from the flying hero, who closed his mouth at the lacerating pain caused by one of the guards, who slammed into his damaged side. "It's nothing to laugh about." "Absolutely," Rogers agreed, casting a sharp glance toward the guard who'd hit Sam. He saw him shrink back, clutching his weapon tightly to his chest, distressed. He tore his eyes away from the strike member and back onto his partner, moving them down his body, checking that he was okay. Once he saw he wasn't too bad, he tore the ex-soldier's attention back to the front of the truck, staring at the wall in front of him. "With Bucky, we can't afford to let our guard down." "Oh, shit. An old enemy. He's my brother," he murmured. His words came out broken, sharp, sad. He hadn't been able to meet his best friend the way he himself would have liked, despite at least 70 years or more having passed since they'd been separated by Hydra and a train car that exploded on one side, sending the sergeant tumbling to the ground 50 meters away or more, into a frozen lake. That memory was as fresh in his mind as the moment he discovered the Winter Soldier's identity. "Brother. You two don't look alike at all," Sam muttered, letting out a small, muffled chuckle through Romanoff's eyes. Romanoff turned her attention to the rear door of the vehicle. Had she heard a Quinjet? She must be out of her mind. The blow to her head from the fight with the asset probably seemed to have fully healed. But there was probably still internal damage that should be looked at. One has dark hair and the other has blonde hair. Dark eyes and light eyes. "Is he really your brother?" "Sam," Rogers growled, glancing at him, causing the winged hero himself to let out a small laugh, earning a dark glare from the strike members. The former member of the armed forces moved his eyes towards both guards and returned them with a small smile, despite knowing that they were looking at him with the intention of killing him with their eyes covered by goggles and masks. "Hi," he greeted them both, raising one of his hands, forcing the other to move through the cuffs, though it didn't seem to bother him. He only lowered the arm he'd raised and settled into place, lowering his head, touching his chin to his chest. "Steve." Rogers raised an eyebrow and glanced at the former spy out of the corner of his eye, receiving a confused look from her. Her green eyes shone with uncertainty, as if she were having an internal debate about something and didn't know whether to tell him or not, which gained Captain America's full attention. He shifted his body to try and get closer to his partner, receiving the butt of his rifle as a reward, letting out a grunt and bringing his hand to his temple. "Bastards. Shut up." Rogers gave a silent command, forcing Wilson to step back and take his place. He focused his eyes on his feet, brushing the bruised area with his fingertips as he sighed, trying to force the pain away from his mind. "What did you want, Romanoff?" He didn't mean to, but some of the irritation he felt flooded the tone with which he sent that question, rubbing his forehead with the back of his hand as he sighed, knowing he had been overcome by circumstances. He was about to apologize when Romanoff's own voice silenced his words. "Get down." "What? Natasha, what's the?" He opened his eyes, being sent to the far side of the only exit they had when the doors burst into flames, leaving a huge hole where the doors had once been. He gasped, moving to the side, letting the pieces of metal fall to the side as he rolled on the ground, moving his eyes to the gap that had formed from the explosion, widening them as he saw one of the strike agents knocking down his comrades and then executing them. The soldier yanked the goggles off his face as he removed his mask, revealing Officer Hill, who was looking at them with eyes filled with urgency. Rogers got to his knees, with some effort, beginning to stand up as a Quinjet turned around, turning its back on them, beginning to lower the ramp and position it like a bridge. "Come on. There's no time for a long explanation, Captain," the woman replied, sending her a hard look, silencing the man. Captain America shook his head a couple of times, watching as Sam was the first to jump into the Quinjet, rolling across the floor of the aircraft. Romanoff was next, landing on the branch with a single leap, turning toward him, staring at him with glowing green eyes. But the Quinjet separated with a negative shout from Black Widow's side, who was forced to back away while she watched from the sky as Hill and Rogers remained in that vehicle, which began to slow down until it stopped in the middle of the road, being avoided by other vehicles. Steve Rogers took a couple of strides, crouching beside one of the fallen soldiers, grabbing a pair of keys and snapping them onto his handcuffs. He smiled as they fell to the ground with a metallic clang, and he was able to jump out of the now free vehicle, followed by Hill, who had changed the clip on his weapon and was aiming ahead, where a convoy of black cars was approaching. "Allies?" "Enemies, Captain," Hill replied, sending an order to the Quinjet, which began to rise even higher. Nick Fury's second-in-command shifted her eyes toward Pierce's envoys, pointing the barrel of her pistol straight ahead. "I hope you're ready." "Quinjet." Both Natasha Romanoff and Samuel Wilson watched with their eyes as their partner, Steve Rogers, and Nick Fury's right-hand woman, Agent Maria Hill, began a pitched battle against the strike agents who had arrived at the scene, led by a Winter Soldier very different from the one they saw hours ago, this one without a metallic arm to show, but demonstrating a strength too surprising that rivaled that of the captain, who had recovered his shield thanks to the shield agent and was using it against the lesser soldiers, approaching slowly against the Winter Soldier who led them. At that moment, images of her previous confrontation with another Winter Soldier flashed through Natasha Romanoff's head, gritting her teeth and scolding herself for leaving her partner against another individual of such magnitude. He shook his head at the driver of this Quinjet, gritting his teeth. "Turn around." "Not my orders, Nat." Clint Barton slowly gave a grim smile, returning his attention to the front, moving his hands and flipping various switches. Within seconds, the Quinjet became completely invisible to ordinary people. "I'm sorry to leave Hill and Rogers alone. But those are my orders." "Barton?" Natasha Romanoff scathingly placed herself behind the Archer in 2 steps, showing an angry face, making Hawkeye himself sigh at the headache that Black Widow herself would be. He knew her too well. "Steve is down there. And he needs us." Putting the Quinjet on autopilot, Clint Barton vacated the driver's seat, forcing the handcuffed Romanoff to take several steps back, surprised by the hard look her former partner was giving her. Now that she thought about it, hadn't Barton already backed off? "Everyone needs us, Nat," he hissed, pulling out a laser blade and using it to destroy the woman's handcuffs, sending her to a sitting position with a shove, walking over to where Falcon was lying on the ground. "It's not just Cap who's in the crosshairs. Thousands of people could die." "I know, Clint. But you haven't seen what a Winter Soldier can do," the woman snarled, shooting a venomous look at her partner as he turned his back on her, taking Sam's handcuffs. "He's capable of murdering anyone without the slightest shred of remorse." Barton stopped his hands and moved his head to her shoulder, focusing his darkened eyes on Romanoff, who recoiled in surprise, shrinking in her seat. Clint had never looked at her like that. It had been as cold as the look she'd received from her mentor when she failed a training session. "He's not our problem, Romanoff," she said calmly, turning her attention back to the handcuffs the hero Falcon was carrying. A slightly cold word reached the red-haired woman's ears, causing her to flinch again. "There's more than one. A whole squad of them, Natasha. It's not just one." They'd known there were at least 2 of them. 3, including Hill and Rogers. But a platoon? That was something they hadn't counted on. If they couldn't stop one of those soldiers, how would they stop an entire platoon? Natasha ran her tongue over her lower lip, her eyes moving around the Quinjet, tangled in her own thoughts, unable to find a possible way out of this situation that would help destroy Pierce's plans, who was now laughing out loud. Everything is lost. Defeated, Romanoff hid her face in her steps, biting her lip, trying not to let out the sob she was holding back. She was Black Widow. She couldn't cry. She didn't want to cry. Barton turned around completely, taking out what looked like an old-fashioned analog phone, handing it to the woman who had been his partner on so many missions and on his team with the Avengers. "Here," the archer muttered, offering the phone to the woman. Natasha pulled her face away from his hands, staring with glaring eyes at the phone in her friend's hand. Hesitant, she moved her own arm to take it. It felt heavy in her hand, as if it were made of iron. "What is it for?" "There's only one number on it. If you think you're ready to face what's coming, dial it." Barton returned to his position at the helm of the Quinjet, leaving Romanoff to her thoughts, who was hesitating with that cell phone in her hand, watched by Sam Wilson. He had put aside the remains of the handcuffs and taken one of the seats in the back of the jet, adjusting the straps so he wouldn't be thrown out. Natasha bit her lower lip with slight force, slightly tearing the skin and showing blood, wiping it away with her tongue as she ran it over it. He pushed aside his precarious thoughts and selected the only number on that ancient telephone, bringing it to his right ear and waiting, listening to the tones of the mobile itself, waiting for the owner of that number to pick up the phone. He sighed heavily, letting his head fall back as he waited, feeling a few hairs brush against his right cheek. "Yeah?" He opened his eyes in surprise, hearing a voice he'd never expected to hear again. He'd waited years to hear it again, and he did so in this desperate situation. The woman closed her eyes tightly, holding back the tears. "I need you. Tersekelian." He frowned, his phone against his ear, leaning against the glass wall of his elevator, noticing a few strands of his hair, now cropped and unruly, on his forehead. He looked outside, watching the vehicles of Rumlow's agents exit the bridge without the Quinjet destroyed by Captain Rogers. He acknowledged that the man had shown much more courage than he had initially expected and had fought Bucky hand to hand without breaking a sweat, only to be sent down by the Hydra asset. It was his secret weapon, and Pierce had wasted it. "What do you need?" He replied to the voice on the phone, noticing how she let out a small chuckle, which made his frown deepen. "I don't have time to waste, Mr. Strucker. You know full well that Mr. Pierce has lost his way, Uzumaki. With the creation of his special Winter Soldier unit, Pierce believes himself invincible. What do you think?" Baron Strucker asked, causing the blonde on the other end of the line to rub his forehead at the question posed by the man who could lead Hydra in the near future. What was his opinion of Pierce? He bit his lower lip and brushed a few strands of hair out of his eyes, leaning back against the glass wall. That elevator was about to reach the ground floor, and if Pierce or one of his dogs saw him talking to Strucker, they'd surely try to kill him. "You've left too many gaps," he finally gave in, already on the ground floor, watching as the elevator door began to open, revealing before him a scene he didn't think he'd seen. Steve Rogers. Beaten, blood dripping from his face and a dented shield, he lay on the floor of the Tersekelian, surrounded by Rumlow's men and a pair of Pierce's Winter Soldiers, each carrying a grenade launcher, pointed downward, revealing dead eyes. He could see the indoctrination on both soldiers' faces. Dead eyes, pale skin, stubble. Both were wearing strike tactical fatigues. "I'm leaving, sir." Without waiting for Strucker's reply, he hung up the phone and slipped it into his back pocket, exiting the elevator. Murmurs began to surround him when the agents saw Rogers on the floor, struggling to get up. A foot from one of the Winter Soldiers stomped on Captain America's head, sending him sprawling on the floor. Naruto Uzumaki showed a small smile, moving his blue eyes toward Rumlow, who displayed a wider, haughty smile, as if he had been the one responsible for the capture of the man lying there. But it was clear that he had achieved it thanks to the Winter Soldiers who had accompanied him, something the strike leader would never admit to anyone. Proud and arrogant. That's what Brock Rumlow was like. Two qualities that would lead to his death. He nodded toward Alexander Pierce, who was beginning to approach, flanked by another pair of those soldiers indoctrinated and enhanced with the imperfect super soldier serum. "I see, Captain Rogers, that you were taken without much effort in the end, even though there should be more prisoners." The secretary glanced sideways at Rumlow, who shrugged but said nothing. "But despite all the trouble you've gone to, you've accomplished nothing, Mr. Rogers. Only that we get our hands on you. Do you know what your blood could do for us? You have the secret of the serum." With his blue orbs fixed on Rogers, he watched as the man sank to his knees, spitting blood through his teeth, raising his face to meet eyes darkened by the rage the man was holding back. He had to admit he was amazed at how Steve Rogers kept his anger under control so as not to launch himself at Pierce. Would he do it anyway? Probably. Steve Rogers was a fighter. He wouldn't let Pierce get away with anything. "Now, with my final plan, I fear that if the Avengers don't act, the world will finally fall into our hands. But I highly doubt they will. Stark." Tired after what happened with Killian. Banner won't do anything on his own. Thor is missing. Barton with his family. And Natasha Romanoff will be no problem. If you couldn't take out one of my assets, Miss Romanoff can't, the secretary declared, earning a snarl from Rogers, who lowered his face. Pierce turned, focusing on Naruto. Take him to one of the darkest, coldest cells until this is all over. I don't want any trouble. He snorted in disappointment, taking Captain America by the arm and began to drag him without consideration, being watched by agents who were supposed to be loyal to S.H.I.E.L.D., but who did not seem to understand what was happening, remaining static. Looks like this is the end of you, Captain America, he emphasized mockingly, throwing the man into the elevator with a jerk and pressing -7 on the keypad, which began to descend with the two of them inside. I'll take care of it. Unknown location. The Quinjet landed in a clearing surrounded by dark leaf trees, concealing it near what appeared to be a dam. The plane's camouflage faded completely, revealing its dark metal with the now destroyed symbol of S.H.I.E.L.D., an organization that no longer existed and that no one would try to save. Hydra had emerged with a vengeance, as if it had fed on S.H.I.E.L.D. itself and destroyed it from within, like a plant escaping the earth. Slowly, the ramp began to lower, touching the ground within seconds, revealing 3 people who began to exit the vehicle, revealing serious, exhausted, and stressed faces to those who saw them. But that didn't seem to worry them too much. They had left 2 companions behind, one of them now in Hydra's hands and the other missing, giving no sign of life. And to their misfortune, according to Natasha's own thoughts, they had captured the only one who could have led them in those moments when Nick Fury himself was in his grave and S.H.I.E.L.D. had been destroyed. They had no support left, no clear leader. Even Stark could help them at that moment. What did she say? Barton's question, without much interest, left his lips. He was placing his bow on his back, folded back, walking to Romanoff's right. To the Russian spy's left, Samuel Wilson readjusted his winged backpack while listening, unsure of who they were talking about. But it seemed they were both linked to the stranger Natasha had mentioned. He'll come, the woman replied listlessly, tossing her red hair aside as she walked, focused ahead, staring at a rusty door. She grabbed the handle and pulled it toward her, entering the room with cautious steps. Barton and Wilson followed right behind her, ready for a confrontation if necessary. That place, dimly lit and leaking, stank of medicine, as if it were being used for some clandestine clinic, something that couldn't be dismissed considering the state of the place. Romanoff. Barton, Nick Fury's voice, his voice low and slow, surprised them, and their eyes widened when they saw the former director of S.H.I.E.L.D. bedridden, bandages over his torso and an eye patch over his left eye. You did your job, Barton. Clint Barton shrugged, stepping away from Romanoff and Wilson, the former looking accusingly at him. After all, he'd completely fooled them. He knew Fury was still alive, and he didn't say anything. Fury. Oh, calm down, Agent Romanoff, the bedridden man muttered, sending a calm look to the woman, who closed her mouth before that dark eye. Fury blinked a few times. I'm sorry for the secrecy. But if Pierce had known I was still alive, I would have eliminated him, Sam completed, smiling nervously when the man looked directly at him. Who are you? Samuel T. Wilson. Oh, good, he moved his eye to Romanoff, noticing that accusatory, betrayed look she was sending him. What hurts you more, Agent Romanoff? That he lied to you about my death, or that he used him? He didn't even blink when the woman tried to throw herself at him, but was held back by the arms of the 2 men in the room, while the doctor took steps back, frightened by the woman's fury. I had no right. He meant to do it, Romanoff, the older man emphasized, fearlessly looking into the fiery eyes of the woman who was waiting until she was free, before she squeezed his neck tightly. He's my asset. The world's last hope, I'm afraid. Who do you think got all of Hydra's information? If it weren't for him, the counterattack would have been impossible. Natasha gritted her teeth, grinding them slightly. Counterattack? There's no counterattack. Hill has vanished. Rogers has been captured. We don't even have enough men to stop Project Insight or confront Pierce's Winter Soldiers. We're in check, Director. Fury noticed how Romanoff had emphasized the last word, saying it with slight resentment. He had completely shattered the woman's trust in him. But I couldn't go back. Not now. Trust me, Romanoff. There's a counterattack. The Silver Army. He stepped out of the shower completely drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead and his eyes slightly blurred by the drops falling from the tips of his freshly trimmed golden hair, as well as the bushy beard that dotted his chin. He'd made a small change of look that seemed to be needed. Since when had he not cut his hair? At least since he left Hydra Academy, if he remembered correctly. And his beard had been with him for 2 years. He had grown comfortable with it and it didn't take him long to let it grow, although now he had trimmed it to give a better appearance to the people who saw him. He knew that some, like Rumlow, thought he was a good-for-nothing bum. He had let the extremist men destroy his arm and injure him. Contrary to who he was, he gave the impression of not living up to expectations. Too bad he didn't care. 2 wounds. disappointing Rumlow and the strike men. It wasn't his mission to please them. His goal had always been physical enhancement, and he had achieved it. A cybernetic arm and the erroneous super soldier serum now coursing through his system. His own plans had been successfully accomplished, no matter how badly it looked to Strike and its deluded leader. He picked up a pistol lying on his bed, examining it, inserting the magazine, and pulling the slide. Around his waist, a white towel covered his nakedness, revealing his well-formed torso. At least the rigorous training at Hydra had physically prepared him for his missions, and he didn't disappoint anyone. His body had been strengthened by the serum, giving him even more strength, making him a cheap copy of Steve Rogers, who now rested in a cold, dark cell, far from anyone who could save him. He shook his head, dropping the towel and grabbing a pair of boxers, slipping them on as he watched with his blue eyes two bodies leaning against the terrace wall, each with a gunshot wound to the chest. If he looked closely, he could see the trail of dried blood on the vests of both men, who weren't moving. After all, they were dead. He finished his dressing routine, slipping the strike tactical uniform over his body, holstering his pistol on his right leg, and tucking his pass into the left side of his waistband, revealing that he was a level 8 agent. Pierce had apparently thought it was a good idea to give him that level of access in the Triskelion. Something the secretary would no doubt regret all too soon. The knock on his door brought him out of his thoughts, heading to the entrance and opening it without looking, turning his back on whoever was there, returning to the side of his bed. "Come in," he said, finally placing a pair of fingerless gloves on her hands, passing the strap of these over them. "I see you've gotten rid of the guards," a female voice said, causing Naruto to move his head for a few seconds, his blue eyes resting on the woman who had entered, returning to focus on his gloves. "Are you ready, Agent 9? Uzumaki grimaced briefly, moving his hands over his vest and closing each of the pockets on it and his belt, where he kept magazines for his weapons or some tools they could use from there to get out of the place. "I was born to do this, Agent Carter," he declared with a certain amount of sarcasm, letting out a heavy sigh as he noticed the woman boring into him with her almond-shaped eyes. "I hope your men are, because from now on, Project Winter won't wait." "They are, Uzumaki," Sharon growled, turning to walk out of the room, not looking back at the man inside. "I don't understand how anyone could trust you." "And they shouldn't," he clarified, turning completely around, following Agent Carter out of the room and locking it with her pass. It wasn't his room, after all, and he didn't want any unwanted guests snooping around, though they would when both men didn't show up for their afternoon shifts. At least it gave them about 12 hours to move around freely if someone wasn't looking for them in an emergency. "I'd sell out anyone to save the only person I love in the world, Agent Carter. That includes you and anyone else, even the president himself. Why have you turned against your masters?" He snorted under his breath, pressing the elevator button, not looking at the woman on his right, but noticing her gaze. He didn't want to meet her gaze. Why had he left Hydra behind? That was a very long story that didn't exactly begin today. He had betrayed Hydra from day one, from when he swore to protect the one person in the world who had been by his side at all times, and that included protecting her from Hydra's shield if necessary. He would even face an entire army for her. That's why he'd never pledged his loyalty to anyone, not even when they tried to indoctrinate him within Hydra itself. They believed that, with their phrase, with the code words, they could make him a lapdog. They didn't know what he'd acted upon over the years, that the memory they'd taken from him remained in his head and would never leave. Few could resist Hydra's mind control, and he was capable of it, but they would never know. Not until the last head was cut off by its master. He missed his katana, which he'd left behind in the Quinjet that Barton himself had taken. He hoped he wouldn't lose it or put it to good use, staining it with enemy blood. "I have no masters, Carter," he hissed through gritted teeth, stepping into the elevator and pressing the -7. He leaned his body against the glass behind him, staring at the doors as they closed behind Sharon Carter, whose back was to him, dressed in her Agent 13 uniform. The full bodysuit was white, with the shield logo on the left arm. Soon, that symbol would be completely erased from the world by the skull and octopus legs that Hydra itself was known for. "That makes it harder for someone to trust you. And why do you do it?" he asked back, looking at the woman with interest. Sharon tensed for a few seconds, clenching her teeth slightly. "You're my only way out." "From Hydra?" "No," the woman cut in, causing him to raise one of his eyebrows at her slightly cold, harsh tone. He slowly watched as the woman turned around, looking directly at him. "To save the world." Normally, he would have snapped the neck of the person who said it like that. But Sharon Carter could consider herself lucky. She had earned a shred of his respect. And that was saying something. He only respected 2 people in the world, and no one had ever earned his respect in return. And that was Nick Fury and Natalia Leonovna Romanova. "We might be late." "Well, I'll die trying, Uzumaki." But that simple phrase, the elevator fell completely silent, with both agents in their own world. Level 7 cell of the Triskelion. Steve Rogers drew his legs back onto his chest, noticing how the pain was slowly easing with each passing second. The external wounds, like the cuts in his skin, had completely closed, leaving only a small bloody crust. On the other hand, the internal ones were taking much longer to heal. He could feel the bones in his ribs slowly knitting together, causing him to clench his teeth in pain, letting out a tired sigh as they finished healing. The internal bleeding had also been cured by his accelerated metabolism, making him somewhat combat ready. Because he was definitely thinking about fighting his way out of that cell and escaping the Triskelion to join up with Romanov and the others, who were surely scrambling to destroy the Helicarriers Pierce would use for his project. There was just one more thing standing in his way. Winter Squadron, as Rumlow had dubbed them. He'd been forced to fight two men just like his friend Bucky, but without that bionic arm, which was lucky for him. But even without that strange arm, they had made things too difficult for him, forcing him to force Hill to retreat and flee the scene, while he himself was overwhelmed by the two enhanced soldiers who had left him in that situation. He slammed the back of his head against the wall behind him, letting out a sigh as the wound slowly closed, making him feel better. But during the healing process, he felt pain. Rogers lifted his face from his arms, looking at his cell door, when he began to hear gunshots in the room, shouts, orders, and then silence, followed by a loud bang that caught his attention. He slowly stood up, frowning when a click sounded on his thick iron door. Someone had swiped a card reader. Steve. Captain Rogers relaxed his posture as Sharon Carter's face appeared in the crack in the door, which then opened completely, revealing a small group of officers, all wearing the tactical fatigues worn by officers. They seemed to be surprised by something. "Sharon," he murmured, taking steps toward the cell exit and hugging the woman, letting out a sigh that filled Carter's ears. Carter briefly closed his eyes at the captain's movement, relaxing his posture for a few seconds. Steve pulled away, both hands on the woman's shoulders. "What are you doing here? It's dangerous for you to be here. Pierce is using something called the Winter Protocol to outmaneuver us. You could die." "Steve. I'm flattered you care about me, but this is bigger than just one person. Thousands could die if Pierce succeeds. Hydra has launched attacks against every shield facility we have in the world," the woman declared. Rogers lowered his face and pulled away from Carter, massaging his neck. He knew about the Insight project that Pierce would use and the algorithm that Zola had invented to eliminate the obstacles of Hydra itself, which was growing even more despite the situation, while all the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. itself did not know who to trust, following the orders of people who wanted complete world domination. "I know perfectly well," the captain himself declared, moving his eyes toward Carter, seeing eyes that returned a calm, understanding gaze, above all. "But we can't do all this alone. Not when there was a platoon of winter soldiers serving Pierce himself. He has soldiers under his command and enhanced personnel. We're just a handful without a clear leader. If at least the rest of the Avengers were here, we could do more, not to mention the difficulty of getting out of the Triskelion." Footsteps stopped the conversation between the two adults, causing Rogers to look to his left, seeing how a person slowly approached, wearing a cybernetic arm on his right side, messy blonde hair and a mask covering the lower part of his face, showing bright, amused blue eyes. "You?" Rogers whispered, trying to take a step forward, but being stopped by Sharon Carter's hand, causing the Avenger to look at his friend, doubtful. "Hey, Captain," the blonde greeted, squeezing, letting the Glock's magazine hit the ground completely empty. Uzumaki tossed the pistol aside, grabbing another one he tucked into his other waistband, pulling back the slide, and chambering around. Steve's confusion grew when none of the agents aimed at the winter soldier, who just stared at him. "It's a pleasure to see you again." "What's he doing here, Sharon?" Confused, Cap looked at Agent 13, searching for an answer to his urgent question. But Sharon looked away for a few seconds, looking with her eyes at Naruto himself, who was waiting for her to answer the question asked by Rogers. "It's Fury's asset," the woman herself answered, lowering her gaze so as not to observe the blue eyes of the Cap, who let out a sigh of frustration at seeing himself caught up in the lies of the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. "Now, nothing works anymore. Fury is dead. The old man who died." Uzumaki chuckled, earning a somewhat harsh look from Rogers, which didn't worry the soldier at all. "Fury is alive, Captain Rogers. Hidden, but alive. You killed him." Naruto pulled the trigger so that the slide of the gun fell into position, properly chambering the bullet. "Believe me, Rogers. If I had wanted Nick Fury dead, I would have had to shoot him in the head," emptying the magazine completely to ensure his death, Naruto himself assured, putting the gun back in its place, watching with amused eyes as Roger's face looked completely confused, leaving his emotions on display like an open book. "Now, we must go." Naruto moved his face and looked at Sharon Carter, who merely nodded at the attention. He turned completely around and began walking, followed by the agents. When Sharon tried to walk, Roger's hand stopped her. "Do you trust him?" "No," the woman replied confidently, slightly scathingly, looking at the Uzumaki's back. But it's our only chance to meet with the only ones capable of stopping Hydra. Steve Rogers stood alone in front of what had been his cell, watching as Sharon Carter began to slowly walk away from him, following the other agents. He was too confused to start following them. He didn't want to lead his companions to their deaths. He hoped Naruto Uzumaki wouldn't betray them. Fury's secret base of operations. Natasha Romanoff set her coffee cup down on the small table in that spot, scanning the room as SHIELD agents, handpicked by Fury himself, sat in front of monitors, typing away under the supervision of Agent Hill herself, who had returned from the fight against Hydra, having been saved by Rogers, who had held her own against the 2 Winter Soldiers, who had been alongside Strike's forces. The woman had brought back Sam Wilson's jet and a katana she didn't recognize, but realizing that Barton seemed to have seen her before. She picked up the cup again, leaning back in that chair, tilting her head back and staring at the dark ceiling. She brought the rim of the cup to her lips, sipping again on the coffee she loved so much but hadn't tasted in years. She would have preferred a good cup of hot chocolate, but that would have brought back too many memories that she didn't want to relive now. Not without him by her side. Romanoff admitted she'd been angry with Fury for revealing that her best friend, her secret love, had been in Hydra's employ for years, even back when they'd first met so many years ago, when they were both just children. She couldn't understand how Nick had used an infant to infiltrate the enemy organization, leaving him completely alone, with no one to support him when Hydra closed in on him, closing its jaws on him. She believed her best friend had been absorbed by Hydra and would now be controlled. It was only natural, given that Barton himself had dismissed the idea of joining SHIELD with her when Barton proposed it to them both, declaring his loyalty to Hydra and nearly leading them to a confrontation. Why had he kept it from her? Why had he left her alone when he was supposed to be protecting her? They had never been apart since they met until Clint Barton and SHIELD entered their lives, driving them apart. For a while, she felt like everything he told her had been a lie, that he had just used her as a mere toy and manipulated her to survive. Had he really been by SHIELD's side since he was a child like her? She couldn't understand how Fury had used an infant, training him, showing him the ways to survive. Had he hidden all of this from her? They had sworn never to lie to each other, and he had done so ever since they met. He sighed heavily, looking down at the agents in front of the monitor, blinking a few times. He thought SHIELD had completely fallen into Hydra's clutches. But Fury seemed to have created a group to resist them, with agents loyal only to him and under the supervision of Maria Hill. Thinking about it, Romanoff. Barton's voice was heard, and then he showed the purple archer sitting in a chair to the left of Black Widow herself, who didn't look at him for a second, always keeping her eyes forward. "I'm sorry I lied, Nat. But it was necessary for Hydra not to know. We were at a complete disadvantage, and we didn't know who we could trust." Natasha shifted her eyes to the archer for a few seconds, then returned them to the front, watching as agents moved from one side to the other, papers in their hands, some talking to Hill for a few seconds before returning to their posts. "I'm not mad at you, Clint. It's more the fact that Fury used him, that he lied to me for years, only to find out now that he was a SHIELD asset, and that he'd never abandoned me out of blind loyalty to Hydra," she murmured, sipping another sip of her coffee, not noticing that Barton looked down a little, staring at his own hand, toying with the ring on his ring finger. "I don't want any more surprises. I need this day to be over so I can find an explanation." "I understand your pain," Barton stated, shifting his gaze to Romanoff, who was keeping her attention on the agents in front of their monitors, all of them focused on Hydra and Pierce's movements. They had to keep a constant eye on the secretary's every move. "What will you do when you see him?" Romanoff didn't answer right away, keeping her gaze on the agents, the coffee cup in her hands and her lips pressed slightly together, forming a thin line, almost erasing her lips completely. "Find explanations, Barton. We've been together too long to separate longer than we are. I want to know why someone who was with me through the worst moments of my life decided to just throw me aside, knowing how I felt and what he was doing to me." "That's understandable," Barton himself nodded, returning his gaze to his 2 hands, resting his chin on his clasped hands, letting out a tired sigh without flinching once. Then, he shifted his body and stood up, stretching. "When did you two meet?" "When we were both just kids," she declared, slowly recalling her past. "I met him when we were both 8 years old, just as I was beginning my training as a spy in a secret KGB project. He wanted to join anyway, never leaving me alone and always being by my side," she said, drinking the last of her coffee and leaving the cup with dregs on the table, pulling her legs up onto her seat and retracting them, hugging them with her own arms, showing a tired face. "Then, when Fury wanted us on his team, he tried to kill me and you, in case you don't remember, claiming he was loyal to Hydra and disappearing from the radar until now. That happened when we were 15, and it's been 10 years now. There's a lot more to that story, isn't there?" Barton inquired, glancing sideways at his companion, who nodded slowly at the archer's question. "You loved him." "As a child, yes. He was the complete opposite of me, with nothing dark in his heart. When it was time for us to execute someone, I always did it so he wouldn't suffer, vomit. But now, since our separation 10 years ago, he's completely different. It's. What were you like before joining Fury? She closed her mouth and didn't answer. Instead, she dozed again, burying her face between her legs, sighing sadly. She didn't want to think about everything they'd been through together, only for him to be gone from her side, leaving her alone with no one to comfort her. Did she still love him? Yes. She always had, and she couldn't stop loving him. He'd been her light in the darkness. They were bound by something more than a simple friendship or a passing love. They had a history, one too dark for anyone to know. And now she discovered that her partner, the one she would have liked to be the father of her children, had been working for Fury since before he joined the KGB or Hydra training. It's I've lost it, Barton. The light I had during my greatest darkness has now become my shadow, just another darkness from my past. And it was my fault. I turned it into darkness. Barton said nothing, noticing the sadness in Romanoff's words, noticing how a tear was running from her left eye, something that surprised him. To this day, he had never seen the tough Natasha Romanoff show feelings for anyone, he hadn't even seen her cry during all those years. He was surprised, but he didn't want to steer the whole conversation into her feelings, into how she felt much more than they already had. He turned his eyes towards the agents, to all those screens as he walked a couple of steps, separating himself from Romanoff and sighing between his lips, bowing his head a little, and placing both hands on the railing that separated them from those men and women who worked for Nick Fury. No need to. Fury. Both Barton and Romanoff moved their eyes towards Nick Fury, who was staring at a single screen. Looks like Rogers will be joining us soon. Natasha moved her eyes, opening them slightly at what the screen showed, while Barton raised an eyebrow and Wilson let out a surprised whistle. Triskelion, ground floor, entrance. Steve Rogers swung his shield at the strike troopers, sending them to the ground with a blow as he grabbed his prized vibranium shield, spinning around and slamming his left fist into another trooper as gunfire erupted around them. He shifted his eyes, seeing Sharon Carter and several agents, clearing the way for them to the Quinjet hangar. And they couldn't waste that opportunity. Without thinking, he started running to the hangar entrance, swinging his shield around to protect himself from the Hydra agent's fire, kicking one while punching another, sending him to the ground with his enhanced strength. He rolled on the floor, unhooking the shield with a single movement and threw it, watching as it wedged between the two parts of the elevator door. He smiled a little and stood up. Steve. Rogers turned his head, opening his eyes. He lowered his body, evading the Winter Soldier's first blow, only to receive a kick that sent him rolling to the ground. He let out a grunt as he got up, observing a red-haired woman with the Winter Soldier's signature mask covering her face. He positioned himself for combat, watching as the woman did the same, making the first move. He deflected the woman's jab by grabbing her right arm and pulling her towards him, placing his feet under the Winter Soldier's abdomen, and did a backflip, throwing her into a group of soldiers, watching as she knocked them down. He quickly got to his feet, watching as the Redeed lunged at him, slamming a left hook into his face, sending him stumbling back several steps, moving his head back towards the soldier, watching as she prepared a second blow. Steve Rogers blocked the woman's punch and swung both arms, deflecting the Redeed's right arm downwards and hitting her in the chin with his knee, making her flinch and her mask fall off from the blow, showing blood running down her chin, dripping to the ground. Rogers didn't let the woman think too much, leaning forward and throwing a punch to her stomach, throwing a second hook against her, making her take several steps back, now with her nose shattered. "I'm sorry about this," Rogers declared, dodging the blow the Winter Soldier sent his way, grabbing her wrist and pulling her towards him, grabbing the Redeed's head and slamming it into the mirror in the hallway, shattering the glass and staining it with blood. When the soldier pulled her face away, shards of glass rained down on her face, shattering and tearing at it. He let go, watching as the woman fell to the floor completely unconscious. He turned, looking back at the agents. "This way." He raised his arm, signaling Sharon and the others to follow him. It was at that moment that more strike men arrived, led by Winter Soldiers carrying rifles. There was no time to waste. There was no margin for error. An explosion made Captain America cover his face with his arm, watching as flames and glass filled the reception area, surrounding the strike members and the Winter Soldiers, creating a screen for them to reach the elevator. He let Fury's followers enter first and took the shield, using his right arm to prevent the door from closing, moving his eyes to a figure running towards them and diving, passing underneath him and took a step back, watching as the doors closed and the elevator went down to the hangar, where they could take a Quinjet. "Sorry about the fireworks," Fury's asset stood up, blood trickling down his right temple, looking into Rogers' eyes. Rogers just shrugged, turning his attention back to the door. It was the only way to stop Pierce's winter protocol. "I just hope no one innocent died," Captain Rogers himself declared, sighing. The Uzumaki didn't answer, removing his bulletproof vest with a flick, showing how it had been briefly burned by the flames he himself caused. He raised his left arm, showing a slightly burned hand. How many of those are in Pierce's service? Naruto removed the mask, hanging it from his belt. He dropped the vest and massaged his neck with his left hand, removing some of the blood that had stained it. At least 50, I think, counting the one you knocked out and those who were engulfed in my flames, the Uzumaki explained, staring at Roger's back, who didn't turn around or answer him. The other agents noticed the growing tension in the elevator between the two, and they didn't speak again. Steve Rogers thought about Fury's lies, while Naruto Uzumaki kept his own thoughts focused on a single person, someone he hadn't seen in 10 years, and with whom he had ended any friendly relationship when he attacked her 10 years ago. He huffed and rolled up his right arm, revealing the cybernetic arm implanted in his body. Uzumaki closed his eyes and kept the pain in his head down, thinking of Natalia. He knew there was a wall between them now. A wall created by lies, by the pain he had caused her by leaving, and the consequences of siding with Hydra, of everything he had done. Hundreds of deaths rested in his mind, on his shoulders, sinking him towards the darkness, hiding him in the shadows. Do you think we can get out of here? Sharon looked at the Uzumaki, waiting for a response from the active, but he didn't reply, remaining silent. Just as Agent 13 was about to speak again, Naruto proceeded to remove his shirt, revealing a sleeveless undershirt. Of course. Are you completely sure? Naruto moved his eyes to the woman, refocusing on Roger's back. Oh, pretty sure, Fury's asset declared, pulling a pistol from the back of his pants, holding it in his left hand, weighing it. He'd lost the previous one he'd taken back on level -7 when they went to rescue Captain Rogers himself, who hadn't rejoined the conversation, focused entirely on the elevator door. Why so much confidence? When the elevator doors opened, both Rogers and the agents loyal to Fury showed slight astonishment, their eyes wide open, briefly covering their nostrils with the backs of their hands, seeing the enormous amounts of blood pooling around that place, even staining the sides of a Quinjet. This. Naruto was the first to exit the elevator, walking among the lifeless, blood-stained, and severed bodies. He strolled among the corpses as if they didn't exist, not even seeming to notice them, moving toward the only Quinjet that seemed to be functional. Let's go, he ordered, turning over his shoulder to face Captain America and the others, then refocusing ahead and resuming his march, passing over the body of a security operative. With a click, the Quinjet's door began to open, falling to the ground, revealing a massive ramp down which a tall, burly man with short black hair and wearing a black trench coat with a breastplate that appeared to bear a skull descended. Frank Castle. The man shrugged, turning his back on the Uzumaki and getting into the Quinjet. He turned his eyes to Rogers and the others, waving his arm for them to follow him. He began to climb in, scanning the crowd inside the Quinjet. At the controls was a silver-haired woman wearing a white silver body armor. You're finally here, Uzumaki, he shook his head, his eyes resting on the asset, who didn't seem sorry for his delay, shrugging and covering the lower part of his face with his mask again, going to an empty spot while the Avenger arrived, followed by Agent Carter and a handful of men loyal to Fury, all of them showing the same astonishment as when they saw the corpses scattered around the hangar, even staining the vehicles that the Hydra agents would hope to use. I'm Silver Sable. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Captain America. The pleasure's mine, Rogers declared, his voice sounding somewhat hollow from the gloom he was feeling as he noticed armed white uniformed soldiers positioning their rifles. What's all this? Silver is the leader of Silver Sable International, a high-cost security firm filled with mercenaries and paid soldiers, Naruto replied, pulling back the slide of his pistol and passing it to Castle, who took it and handed another to the blonde, who loaded the weapon and looked at Cap. Let's just say it's our army. The Silver Army. I only love you. Natasha Romanoff, alongside Clint Barton, Samuel Wilson, Maria Hill, and Nick Fury, watched as a small fleet of Quinjets filled the entire clearing, creating a forest of metal as dark as night, with a shield symbol on the side or top of the vehicle, like a huge target for everyone to see. They would be a target for any enemy who flew over that place. But after all, they had no time for a break when the world itself was being controlled by people who saw only with greed and hatred. The war was being waged while they remained hidden, as if they had been beaten and crushed, something that was not entirely true. Hydra had completely defeated them, forcing them to retreat before the onslaught given by the poor prey, the management made by Pierce, who had turned them into the bad guys and positioned his loyalists as the saviors. Although they carried the USB that Fury had obtained with all the reports on Hydra, complemented by those she obtained from the SHIELD ship when they rescued the agents trapped on it. They moved their eyes to what appeared to be the last Quinjet to land, which began to open the ramp, allowing several people to disembark. Among the notables was Steve Rogers, who was carrying the shield on his back, looking slightly worse for wear, his jacket covered in soot and slightly burned. Beside him was Agent Carter, wearing a white full bodysuit with the shield logo on her left arm, also white but slightly darker to stand out. Behind Carter was a man with short black hair, a serious face, wearing a long trench coat covering his black t-shirt with a skull drawn across his chest. He appeared to be wearing a belt with 2 holsters, each held by 2 loaded pistols. Next to this man was a silver-haired woman wearing a silver full bodysuit. The woman wore a smile on her face, a rifle resting on her shoulder as if it weighed nothing. And then he came down. He covered the lower part of his face with a mask, revealing calm blue eyes that observed everything around him, his left hand poised to grasp a pistol resting in its holster on his leg. His other arm, his right, was entirely gray, metallic, completely cybernetic, without any adornment. He dressed simply, in a black short-sleeved t-shirt and black military-style tactical pants, with equally black boots. Fury. Rogers was the first to speak, walking quickly followed by Carter, followed by Wilson and Barton who approached them, followed by Fury himself, accompanied by Hill. "It's true that you're alive." The former director flashed an amused smile, wearing that oversized trench coat that seemed to rival the one worn by one of Rogers' colleagues. The man shifted his eyes from side to side, his hands always brushing the grips of his pistols. "It's a pleasure to see you, Captain," the eye patch man declared, his teeth briefly showing, one side of his lips lifting in a small smile. Fury shifted his eye to one of the others present. "It's good to see you too, Naruto." The asset raised his arm in greeting, removing his mask with his cybernetic hand, flashing a brief smile at the older man, before undoing it and moving his eyes to the only person who hadn't decided to move. He sighed, focusing on Fury as he approached the man, passing between his companions. In front of Nick, the Uzumaki put his left hand into one of his belt pockets, taking out a small chip to the surprise of Fury himself, who looked with interest at the blonde in front of him. "I hope this helps, Director. With the chip, if we manage to get them into the center of the helicarriers, we could gain control over them and have them self-destruct," the Uzumaki murmured, taking a step back and briefly looking at Barton, nodding at him, who imitated the gesture. "Thank you for your effort, Naruto," Fury thanked him genuinely, passing the chip to Hill herself, who took it with a nod and walked inside the base of operations without saying a word. "It's my job," the Winter Soldier himself growled, scratching the back of his neck and closing his mouth for a few seconds. He snorted under his breath and looked over to where his Natalia had been, but she had disappeared. "If you'll excuse me, I have something urgent to do." Without further ado, Naruto Uzumaki walked past Fury and didn't look back, pushing the others' voices into the background, feeling Steve Rogers and Sharon Carter's gaze on his back, boring into him. He even thought he felt Clint's as well. "Do you trust him, Fury?" Captain America himself asked, being the target of Nick's gaze, who raised one of his eyebrows at the slightly annoyed tone of Rogers himself, who showed a slightly congested face, with a clenched jaw and eyes darkened by rage. It was normal when Rogers himself had fought the Uzumaki to a draw and witnessed what that man had done using his abilities. "I'd leave my life in your hands, Captain Rogers," Fury replied, watching Steve's eyes widen slightly, swallowing thickly, taking a couple of steps back, overwhelmed by the director's own gaze, who shifted his attention to Frank Castle and Silver Sable. "And you are?" Frank Castle, the man in the trench coat, introduced himself, showing slight nervousness, his eyes darting from side to side, not quite trusting those around him. "Let's just say I owe the Uzumaki a huge favor, and this is my way of repaying him." "I understand. And you?" Silver moved his shorn hair to the side, blinking a couple of times at the man, showing a small smile to Fury himself, who didn't take his eyes off the silver one. "Silver Sable," he answered calmly, his smile widening when he saw the surprise in the man's eyes, noticing the same in the archer's and the winged man's eyes. "Are you?" "I see you've discovered my men," Sable declared, looking back as the Quinjets began to open their ramps, through which the mercenaries and employees of Silver Sable International, the largest security company in the world, rivaling even S.H.I.E.L.D., began to descend. "My reasons for helping Naruto are more personal and don't concern Fury. I hope he has a good sense and doesn't want to interfere in our lives." "But Naruto." He took a deep breath, staring at the back of the woman he loved, for whom he'd given everything, even lost his own soul, lost in the same darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, he could remember one of the many deaths he caused, albeit for a greater good that he'd engraved in his mind. It was all for her own good, so that she wouldn't have to deal with what she did, so that she wouldn't be Black Widow again and stain her hands with the blood of innocence. He wanted to see her dance, to dance ballet the way she liked. He'd seen her dance when they were children, and she never did it wrong. She seemed made for it, and she liked it. He saw it in her green eyes every time she twirled, showing her teeth in a huge smile that could be seen for miles. And he wanted to protect that smile above all else, so that she wouldn't be burdened with the deaths, the blood, the dark missions that kept the world in a fragile peace. He couldn't allow her to occupy that position again, and it pained him every time he saw her with eyes darkened by death. He had let Natalia know, Natasha save him when he was a child, protect him and care for him on every mission they sent them on. He knew he wasn't worthy of it, that he hadn't been able to carry out every order they'd given him, and that's why Nada had to save him, taking on what he hadn't been as a child. Through his own mistakes, he had allowed that little girl's life to be worse than it should have been. He had caused a birth of Black Widow to become complete, for Natasha to become a trained, heartless assassin who only smiled at him on small occasions that grew smaller and smaller with each mission they went on. If Barton and Fury hadn't shown up and given them that hand, he knew his Nat would have allowed herself to sink completely into the shadows, losing all her remaining humanity and becoming what Bucky was. To prevent that from happening, she decided to take on the full weight of their love by shouldering their future deaths, all the work she should have done herself. She had no regrets. She had taken lives over the 10 years of her mission, remaining a Hydra asset while remaining completely loyal to Fury out of convenience. All of this had led him to separate from his love, from the woman who completed his very existence, and the only one who was in his heart now and forever, even though she didn't want to see it now. She shifted her gaze back for a few seconds, returning her focus to Romanoff. Head down. Shoulders slumped. Body leaning on the table, her hands resting on it, clattering against the wood in time with a small, exasperated sighs escaping her lips. She looked dejected, completely tired of whatever was happening and defeated, giving the impression of being a shadow of her true self. He'd been separated from her for 10 years, becoming someone who wouldn't be well regarded by society. But that didn't mean he'd abandon the woman he loved. Never. He was always attentive, mindful of what was happening to her. He saw her fighting in New York, surviving Banner and his Hulk form, her fight with the aliens. Every single thing she'd done while at S.H.I.E.L.D. since they'd parted ways had been etched in his mind, and he couldn't shake that thought. It would be impossible, to be honest. He held his breath for a few seconds, scratching the back of his neck with his flesh and blood hand, making a decision about the dilemma that was running through his mind, while his eyes never left the figure of Natasha Romanoff, the only woman in his entire life. Even the memories of his mother had completely faded without a trace, leaving only the face of his Reed in his mind, with those green eyes like two emeralds that shone dangerously when appropriate. He always knew how to identify the death glare Romanoff gave. But it didn't save him from beatings and broken bones. He would bet $1 million that she would do the same now. A death glare and then broken bones, maybe his entire upper body and barely being able to walk. Natasha's dangerous side was what he loved most. He walked slowly, noticing how the floor was completely smooth and made of concrete. While he'd been staring at the woman, he'd completely forgotten they were in an abandoned dam in upstate New York, preparing an army to overthrow Hydra's leader. By now, Pierce would be looking for him to join him in the fight against Cap, who would now be talking to Fury about the ins and outs of lying to him. He dropped the gun on the table with a sharp movement without taking his eyes off the refrigerator, walking toward the appliance and grabbing a beer from it without looking back. Could you give me one too? I think I'll need it. He didn't reply. Using the edge of the counter and the palm of his left hand, he uncapped the bottle and passed it to the woman, who took it with trembling fingers and took a long drink while he uncapped the second one, stroking his thumb along the edge of the same counter. Fury doesn't usually clean much. He's dusty, the asset boasted, raising his eyes when he noticed the Russian spy's glare. Next to his hand was the bottle he'd passed to him, now completely empty without even a drop of beer. He gulped, taking a small sip from his own and clearing his throat a little, looking away in embarrassment. How are you, Nat? He saw her clench her hands, hiding her eyes in her fiery red hair, then 2 minutes later raise her face, revealing blazing green eyes, revealing a green fire that would have intimidated anyone. Even though he was a trained killer, only she frightened him more than the Hulk himself with those green eyes. Rarely had they been so furious and so eager for his own blood. How's this? How am I? How do you think I am, Uzumaki? I thought you were dead, on Hydra's side, someone who had fallen into darkness loving death, and I learned from Fury that you've been his asset for 10 years, ever since we parted, ever since I thought you'd wanted to kill me there. Romanoff stopped her words, clenching her fists as she bit her lips, letting tears trickle down her cheeks, dripping onto the table itself. The spy hid it by separating, taking a few steps with her hand on her head, pushing red strands away from her face. Her skin had turned slightly red, showing that she was containing an enormous growing fury that Naruto didn't deny he deserved. In fact, he wanted him to unleash it all, to hold nothing back. He deserved Natasha's wrath and he wasn't about to run away. He wanted her to unleash her anger without further ado, to hit him if necessary. I hated you for a while, Naruto. I hated myself too, he declared, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching the woman look at him disdainfully, not believing his words. You don't know what I. How do you expect me to know? You abandoned me. No, Natasha moved around the room, hitting Naruto's chest with her right index finger, who showed nothing on his face as he was stabbed by the phalanx. Of course. You did. He emphasized each word, flashing fiery eyes upon him, hoping to earn the boy's fear. You left me. You betrayed me, Uzumaki. You almost killed me on that bridge. He looked down, setting the bottle halfway down on the counter. It was something I had to do, he declared, looking the woman in the eye without flinching once, engaging in a staring match that he seemed to be losing, reluctant to continue looking at Romanov, who was looking at him with those completely disappointed, angry, confused green eyes. I did it for you. For me? I never asked for your help, Uzumaki. She roared, stomping her foot against the concrete. They seemed to be attracting glances from the agents who were moving back and forth, shooting small glances their way. He moved his hands and took both of the agent's shoulders, forcing her to move to the far side of the kitchen, making Natasha's back pressed against the wall, while he placed a hand on her head, slightly lowering his eyes to her green ones. I know you can take care of yourself, that you're capable of killing a man with a toothpick. I know you're stronger than me, despite this prosthesis and the serum coursing through my blood now. I've known this since you murdered those men when you were 13, when I was supposed to kill them. Since you carried my corpses, he declared, lowering his voice an octave, sliding his hand along the wall and ducking his face so as not to look the woman in the eyes, pressing his lips together. He raised his head when a hand slowly caressed his cheek with warm fingers. Did you think you owed me something, Naruto? I killed those people so they wouldn't kill you, so they wouldn't turn you into something you weren't meant to be. I had your back and protected you because I loved you and hated the idea of them turning you into something like me. But it was my fault, Nat. He snarled, cupping the woman's face in his hands, bringing his own inches closer to the Russian woman's, their noses almost touching. I forced you to bear the brunt of my death. That plunged you into the mud, a mud I should have fallen into sooner. But out of my own weakness, I allowed you to bear the brunt of everything. That's why I took on the role you were supposed to be assigned at S.H.I.E.L.D. and infiltrated Hydra. That's why I nearly killed you and Barton. I took my role completely seriously and protected you from being Black Widow again. I don't want you to stain your hands anymore, Nat. Naruto, she murmured, taking the blonde's face in her hands, forcing him to look at her with those blue eyes like two boorish eyes on a somewhat pale face, as if he were sick or hadn't had enough sun. She looked into his eyes and saw them completely crystal clear, full of the feeling she felt. Why didn't you tell me? He smiled sideways, sadly, as a small tear ran down his left cheek and she wiped it away with her thumb, returning the sad smile. Would you have let me protect you? That's my role, idiot, she asserted, lightly hitting the blonde's left shoulder, who couldn't help but let a small laugh escape his lips. I thought I'd lost you forever. Well, that makes two of us, Naruto declared, giving a small nod to the woman in front of him. I thought I'd never have you in front of me again and be able to see those eyes I love so much. Do you love my eyes? He gave a curt nod, reluctant to continue pouring out his heart to the widow. He felt a jumble of emotions that prevented him from speaking clearly. His head was numb and he was beginning to struggle to continue speaking. Everything, really, he clarified, placing his cybernetic hand on Black Widow's waist while placing the other on the Retide's cheek, sliding his thumb along her lower lip. I've loved you since we were children. Since I saw you dance under the snowflakes with the moon as your witness. Natasha Romanoff opened her green eyes completely, without noticing how her lower lip began to tremble, and she followed the impulse, caressing the face of the blonde in front of her, recording his features with a massage of her fingertips, tangling her fingers in the beard he had left on his chin, hiding it. Well, do you see it? Uzumaki gave an amused nod, watching as the Russian's cheeks showed lipstick and how she hid her face in his chest, clinging to him tightly, gripping the sleeveless shirt he was wearing. He giggled, moving his left arm to grab the spy's waist, as well as his bionic arm, interlacing their fingers while resting his chin on the woman's head, noticing how his shirt was beginning to get wet. Nat. You're getting my shirt wet, he pointed out with amusement, noticing how the redeeded spy snorted and rubbed her face through his shirt, despite him warning her about her tears, making the woman slightly spiteful in a way that was truly amusing to him. He hugged her tighter, sighing. I love you, Natalia. No one uses that name, she reproached him, tearing her face away from her best friend's chest, raising her green eyes to meet his blue ones. But I love you too, silly me. I think I'm the fool, he replied, lowering his face and claiming his beloved's lips, soon receiving Romanoff's response, who tangled her arms behind his neck, pressing her chest against the boy's, who pushed the woman against the wall, forcing her to open her leg slightly, brushing her intimacy with his knee. Natasha pulled away a few minutes later, panting slightly, her right hand brushing his lips. A small blush appeared on her cheeks, her eyes were completely bright, and her chest was rising and falling slightly, as if she had been holding her breath for so long and was now resuming it. He stepped forward, pressing himself against her, kissing the woman's lips again, moving his left hand to cup the Retide's face and deepen the kiss, forcing the woman to lean back and raise her face, moving his lips over hers, stealing all that peach flavor they seemed to have, like years ago. HMP, HMP. They both separated, showing flushed faces, with a shy, embarrassed look. Arden, the active grunted, shaking his head and letting out a sigh as he pulled away from Natasha, throwing his head completely back as he walked towards his bottle on the other side of the room. What do you need, Clint? Natasha stood up completely, readjusting the tight bodysuit she was wearing, shooting a warning look at the archer, who raised both arms apologetically, as if not wanting him to be executed. One beer. Just one beer. The Avenger's archer grabbed a small bottle that could have hit him in the head, sending a reproachful look to the blonde, who looked at him sharply, annoyed by the agent's intrusion. We'd better go somewhere more private, the widow requested, taking the asset's hand and pulling him behind her, starting to walk down a hallway filled with sable agents and mercenaries who gave her a terse, nodding greeting, stuffed into their white uniforms, their helmets completely covering their faces. Naruto looked at Romanov's room when the woman threw him inside, seeing a room with black sheets and unadorned walls, completely gray like the concrete the dam was made of. He turned around and felt Natasha's lips on his as well as the woman's body, being pushed back, retreating, taking steps towards the bed pushed by the body of the woman in his arms, ending up sitting on the edge of the same bed and feeling how the Retide crawled until she was on top of him, on his lap, with her private part rubbing against his with the movement of her hips. He let out a small sigh, moving his hands to the woman's buttocks, pushing her towards him, squeezing. He laughed softly against her lips when she moaned at the pressure. Take off your clothes, she snarled, grabbing the edges of Naruto's sleeveless shirt and yanking it up, forcing his arms up, letting the garment slide down his torso and end up on the floor, abandoned. Quick. In seconds, the two of them were naked, intertwined on the bed, the sheets thrown to one side. Naruto rolled over, landing underneath Romanov's body. Romanov straddled his lover, rubbing her hussy against the boy's privates and pressing her knees against the blonde's waist, rocking the man slightly. Natasha pushed down, using her right hand to guide the Uzumaki's member into her cavity and fell onto him, pressing her lips together, letting out a small sigh and beginning to bob up and down, looking directly into the boy's eyes. Naruto slid his hands down, taking the woman's waist and squeezing a little, applying slight force, earning a hiss from the spy. You're cold. He let out a light laugh as he turned around, now on top and forcing Romanov's legs to bend. He pushed slightly, earning a moan from the woman, and kissed one of her breasts, lightly grazing it with his teeth. It's my cybernetic hand, he declared, somewhat sadly, giving another push while getting a second moan between the laughter of the agent, who moved her legs, tangling them around the blonde's waist, pressing him against him, and forcing the Uzumaki to place his face between both breasts, which he took advantage of to kiss them, hold them between his teeth, and slide his tongue over the woman's pink nipples. Romanov moved her hands, tangling her fingers in her lover's rebellious hair, noticing how he began to move more strongly, thrusting and forcing her to grab onto the sheets, throwing her head back and slightly opening her lips, sighing. He claimed them, moving his face and bringing his lips to hers, inserting his tongue into the woman's mouth, giving another thrust, noticing how Romanov trembled and how she returned her tongue, beginning with it a dance of tongues, obtaining a moan from both of them. They both separated their faces, with him taking hers in his hands as she looked up at him, her lips parted, her eyes wide with arousal in his hip thrusts. I just love you. Fracture. Slowly, without the consent of the room's inhabitants, the sun's rays began to enter through the cracks in the curtain, earning curses from a male voice from under the sheets. Knowing she couldn't get rid of the sun itself, she began to stir, pulling down the sheets, revealing a gleaming face with lighter blue eyes and much more disheveled hair. She felt somewhat better than she had many years ago when she had started working for Hydra, and the smile that was on her lips, set in stone, wouldn't be easily erased. Not even he could diminish it. He moved his eyes to the figure lying beside him, completely naked, her back slightly facing him, her hair scattered across the pillow. He noticed the sheet shifting slightly, demonstrating that she was sleeping peacefully and without incident. Decided on a thought, he moved his right arm, beginning to run his cold cybernetic thumb down the woman's back, eliciting an adorable moan from the Retide, who began to stir in her position in the bed, turning toward him and opening her green eyes. They were brighter, clearer, showing that last night's anger had completely faded, leaving only a glow of satisfaction that he shared. He got a small smile from the woman's lips before she claimed his lips, forcing him to lie down on the mattress, allowing the woman to lie on top of him, moving her lips over his, opening them slightly, and allowing her tongue to pass through, beginning a dance between them. He moved his hands, lightly caressing the woman's buttocks, eliciting a sweet moan from her. She pulled away and threw out her left hand, pinning her cybernetic hand to the mattress and preventing him from lifting it, using it to caress her. He slid his hand in and intertwined his fingers with hers, squeezing hers with his vibranium hand, showing her a genuine smile he'd never shown anyone in all the time he'd been alone. Not even Yelena had elicited a real smile from him, one that reached his eyes and was completely genuine, clouded with authentic feelings. "Good morning," he said sleepily, moving his left hand to run it over his face, leaning his head back and allowing his partner to stretch out completely over him, their bodies tangled together under the removed sheet, showing something of their bodies to whoever dared to enter that room. Natasha raised her right arm, caressing Naruto's face with trembling fingers, as if afraid he would vanish at her touch. He himself was afraid of touching his beloved and having her disappear completely, in a puff of smoke, never to be seen again. It was a fear rooted deep within his soul, and he could never shake it off, even if he wanted to. "Hi," the spy showed a small smile as she traced the blonde's face with her fingers. She ran her fingers over the Uzumaki's lips, moving to his nose, his eyelids, his chin. She engraved in her mind that face that appeared every time she closed her eyes. She had kept it in mind during the 10 years they had been separated. Although that face was sharper, with less baby fat and somewhat more mature, with that trimmed beard that suited him so well. She smiled at the memory of a Naruto with a rounded face, with that wide smile that never faded. She loved that smile. But the new Naruto, he was different, maybe not too much. More serious, overprotective of her. She loved that part as soon as she saw it. "Did you sleep well?" Naruto nodded, a smile plastered across his face, longing to tangle his fingers in that shock of red hair, to kiss the woman's soft skin again with his lips and elicit those moans that had seemed so beautiful and sweet to him. He just smiled in amusement, remembering how Natasha had tried to resist the urge to look like a kitten who had been petted so much she craved them, writhing in his arms, just as he had done in hers, and she didn't regret it. "Better than ever," he declared, kissing the woman's lips again and pulling away a few seconds later, giving a soft, amused smile at the pout Natasha gave him in return, surely demanding with her eyes that he continue kissing her, that he give her again those caresses that she had liked so much. He was tempted, perhaps too tempted, to do so. But they weren't teenagers without jobs or responsibilities. They had a war to fight and they had to do it as soon as possible. Pierce would be gathering his troops for an open field battle and preparing the helicopters they would use to kill thousands of people. He would probably be on the list. "I'm glad to hear it," Romanoff declared, rolling over in bed to grab her phone, tilting her head to the side and clicking it. She couldn't help but hit the pillow when she saw it captured on her lover's camera. "Couldn't you take more normal photos?" he growled, getting another snap from the phone as another photo was taken, making him sigh to the amusement of the Russian, who put the device aside and stood up, letting the sheet slip down her body, leaving it in view of the Uzumaki himself, who scanned the woman's curves with his orbs. "Do you like me?" "Maybe too much," he replied, turning and standing, taking the shirt in his hands and slipping it over his torso, moving on to the black cargo pants and boots he'd been wearing, noticing the faint stains of dried blood from previous living people. He sighed and stood, slipping the belt around his waist and tightening it. "You'll be happy. To have the control over you necessary to make you squirm," she said, moving her head towards her lover's back, biting her lower lip briefly. "Of course. It couldn't be any other way, little Uzumaki." He simply snorted at the woman's words, making his neck crack with a slight movement and closing his eyes for a few seconds, sighing between his lips to notice how his bones seemed to be back in place. It almost seemed like all the past pain had vanished with the night when he saw Natasha Romanoff's body beside him, partially naked, covered only by the sheets of their double bed. He had to thank Natasha for choosing that room so they could be together. He didn't know what could have happened in a single bed. She would probably have been devastated by their night of passion and the movements they had made. It seemed incredible to him that the bed was still in perfect condition. "You're evil, Romanoff. Just because you're mine, I'm afraid. Operations balance." She swiveled her enormous back chair around, interlacing the gloved fingers of both hands to create a chin rest, while with her dark eyes, she observed those present at the meeting. Clint Barton, who was leaning at the back of the room, boredly looking at the tip of one of his arrows. Silver Saber, who was amusedly watching the blonde next to Romanoff. Frank Castle, who was sitting in one of the chairs cleaning his rifle. Steve Rogers, who was showing impatience with the little discussion they were having about how to act. Maria Hill at his side, impassive. And finally Natasha Romanoff and Naruto Uzumaki, with the former showing a less impassive face, with a strange gleam in her eyes and the latter completely relaxed, right in front of the spy and sending her brief glances that he himself knew were not looks of companions. "With everyone here, it's time to begin our meeting for a counterattack against Hydra," Yuri said, relaxing completely in his seat, sighing through his fingers. "How will we obtain the helicarriers that Hydra will use to bring their project to fruition?" Rogers himself asked, clearly in doubt, showing interest in avoiding all possible deaths and finishing off his sworn enemies. Using the chip I gave Fury, Naruto replied, moving his eyes to Rogers himself, who returned a completely flat look. The friendship between the two wasn't too good, really. With a replica of this, placing it at the center of the helicarrier itself, in its system, we could cut off its satellite connection and control them, sending them to self-destruct. But it would have to be done as soon as possible. Once they were in the sky, connected, it would be the complete end of our plans. How would we accomplish that? We have S.H.I.E.L.D. after us. Oh, little Archagent, Silver spoke, sending a sweet smile to the purple-suited Avenger, causing the blonde to tense in his position. Why do you think I'm here? No matter how many men Fury has, he'd never accomplish anything against Hydra without mine. Trained mercenaries. Ex-Marines, soldiers, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, KGB agents, there are many experts in my ranks, Mr. Barton. An open war against Hydra would not suit them now. Their weapons are inferior, not to be rude. And they don't have funds unlimited. Barton twirled the arrow he'd been playing with, briefly looking away and feeling the color rise to his face. The woman was 100 times more complicated than Romanov herself, something that seemed to please Naruto, who held back his brief laugh with the back of his hand, while Natasha herself smacked his side, earning a groan from the soldier. So how do we deal with Pierce, Hydra, and the Winter Soldiers? Sam Wilson himself, who had recently entered the room, revealed that he had recovered his more acceptable physical form, asked exasperatedly. They're going to launch the helicarriers in 3 hours. According to our spies placed in the Triskelion, they've mobilized Strike and Pierce's special unit, generating alarms throughout the state of New York. The secretary has ordered the police and the armed forces out, leaving the city unprotected by the supposed shield. Good work, Wilson, Fury himself declared, drawing all the attention to himself as he rose from his seat, revealing a darker eye, as if he were grappling with a truly dark and troubling thought. In fact, Naruto had caught that look on 2 more occasions. Occasions on which he had taken sides to tip the tide of the battle in Fury's favor, seeing his blood-stained hands again. Now, we must begin a counterattack against Hydra. All of the operational bases have fallen to the enemy, and the Triskelion will be Hydra's own spearhead. If we eliminate Pierce's helicarriers and recapture the base, Hydra will lose a strong strategic point in their plans. The streets of New York will be bathed in blood, Castle himself declared, moving his eyes to Fury, moving a clip into the pistol and pulling back the slide, letting the room hear the bullet moving, entering the chamber. Is there enough time to achieve victory? We really can't waste time on unnecessary things, not now. We should split into groups for the operation, Hell declared, moving the tablet in his hands and pressing the screen itself. Rogers, Wilson, and Uzumaki should be in charge of the helicarriers. They're well suited for the task and skilled in close combat. The rest could take care of the Hydra agents and insert the USB to show Hydra's plans to the world. Naruto gulped, moving his eyes to the woman beside him, seeing her impassive face, with eyes slightly colder than those of the morning, causing him to frown slightly. Nat. Are you sure about this? You'll be exposed and have to disappear from the radar for a while. I have the Avengers. They still need us, she replied, soft and uninterested in what had happened to her, making him grit his teeth and close his eyes, breathing calmly to relax. 10 years to prevent something like this for Natasha, and now she was jumping headfirst into the dumpster, throwing away her work and effort. He cupped his face and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, refusing to fully look at Fury. If they showed everything on the flash drive, supplemented with the data Romanov obtained from the ship, no doubt many of them would be hunted down by the state if they didn't enter the private sector. And many would, but he and Natasha weren't cut out for it. He shifted his attention to his cybernetic arm and closed it, feeling a surge of anger in his chest, directed primarily at Pierce himself, the one who had caused all of this. He'd sworn to himself never to let anyone harm his beloved. But he couldn't stop them from what they were about to do. Not if Fury supported that crazy idea from the most dangerous woman in the world. The Avengers would be a good asset now, Silver declared, his thoughts dissolved as he looked at the silver-haired woman. Couldn't we bring the rest? It would be reckless to bring Thor and Banner just to deal with Pierce, someone we could completely disband ourselves. He didn't know why, but those words left his throat, and it was too late to show regret for the poisonous tone he'd used when mentioning Banner and the Norse god. Were they really necessary? After all, that was his mistake. He trusted Fury to take out Hydra, and what he did was destroy S.H.I.E.L.D. and possibly send himself to prison. When he moved his eyes, he noticed Natasha's slightly annoyed gaze on him, that flashing green for having sent obscured words to her companions. Rogers, too, looked at him menacingly, but he got an amused smile from Silver and a hollow one from Castle. That man hadn't laughed since his family, not often. You're too confident, Fury himself commented, forcing him to look into his one visible eye, seeing a color too dark, like a black hole. Really, Stark, Banner, and Thor could be a good bet. What's wrong with that? The Winter Protocol. I have no doubt Thor and Hulk would deal with it, destroying everything in their path without regard for damage, he declared, fervently venomous toward the latter. That massive muscle in the Battle of New York never cared about civilians. Neither did Thor, really. He was too behind Lady Loki to think about anything else. Then Stark's ego led him to confrontation, and Cap didn't even think beyond his nose. Clint and Natasha were fighters, not planners. I don't want New York to be like the Chitauri invasion. Oh, did you watch it? Of course, Fury. I saw your mistake in Shields. Now I understand everything that came after that, for 2 years with your behavior and your lack of communication, the director declared, leaning back and sending him a hard look, getting a completely flat face. You were never in favor of the Avengers, was that right? Now he noticed all the eyes on him. If he'd been a teenager, he would have felt nervous, slightly embarrassed, and a huge blush spread across his face. But he was an adult, a man who had lost an arm only to gain more strength and then become one of those Winter Soldiers Pierce himself desired, obtaining some of the defective serum. You read my mind very well, Nick, he declared mockingly, rising from his seat and stretching completely, not caring too much about the consequences of that revelation on his relationship with Romanoff. After all, he was a fugitive or would be after using the information on the USB. She had the Avengers. He had absolutely nothing. When they faced Hydra, everything was on the table and he would have to leave New York with hundreds of deaths on his head. He was still Hydra and wasn't listed by S.H.I.E.L.D. as one of its assets. If everything went well, he only prayed to be able to escape as soon as possible, even if he wouldn't be able to resume his relationship with Natasha the way he would have liked. And everything would probably have gone to shit with his hatred of Hulk and the other Avengers, except for Barton. You know perfectly well that I didn't agree with your plan about the Avengers and trying to do it over the council. Now, S.H.I.E.L.D. is absolutely nothing and has been displaced by Hydra, he murmured between his lips, turning his back on those present in the room and walking towards the exit itself, stopping in the frame of it. I was never on the side of the Avengers and if you bring them into the fight I will simply leave as soon as possible. But that statement from his side, he concluded his participation in the meeting, leaving the room with slow, heavy steps, as if he were thinking about something. With his right hand, he cupped the back of his neck, allowing his body to rest on the table once he was in the dining room. There, he had displayed a venom he had held deep within him toward the Avengers. But he couldn't apologize. He hated them. And worst of all, Natasha Romanoff was there, on his side, being his family. He had completely screwed up, and as much as she loved him, she wouldn't forgive him. Maybe even better. Ever since he had taken the information from Hydra, he decided to leave once Pierce fell. There was no place for him in that city when they had done everything possible to give Natasha a family. Now, he couldn't ask her to accompany him as he had initially planned. Not when they might need her. You put your foot in it, Barton's voice declared behind him, causing him to snap out of his own mind, looking at the archer who gave him a small smile. Natasha loves the Avengers. They're her family. I saw it in his eyes, he declared, letting out a sigh. Had he really expected everything to be easy when he returned? She had one life, and he had another, two different. They loved each other, both had acknowledged it, but they had reached a point they didn't know each other were in. Romanoff probably loved the old Naruto, the one who was a smiling, always optimistic boy, cheerful despite the blood. But he was completely gone. Nothing remained of that cheerful boy her beloved loved. There was only a completely empty shell filled with hatred and a mile of dead people behind him. No matter how hard he tried, his hands could never be cleansed of all the spilled blood. I wasn't good back there, I'm afraid. Not too much, Barton said, somewhat understandingly, walking over to the blonde and patting him on the back, earning a depressed look from him. She loves you. But right now, she has other priorities. I know, he grunted, letting some of his annoyance seep into his voice. He shook his head to the side, pressing his lips into a thin line that nearly obliterated his mouth. I'm just so tired of everything. Not even Fury had noticed. But slowly, Naruto Uzumaki was fracturing completely. So much pressure had taken its toll on him. Severed head. He slid his body next to Silver Sables into the Quinjet, staying as far away as possible from Romanoff, who had taken the image of one of the council members to take Pierce and dump all the information out into the system. He would be sent to a helicarrier to place the chip into his system just like Falcon and Captain America, thereby destroying Project Insight, which the secretary planned to use to destroy potential Hydra enemies, which would lead to the deaths of perhaps hundreds of children, something he didn't want on his conscience. He adjusted the tactical body armor over his torso, feeling the extra weight of magazines and grenades in its pockets, knowing he would be forced to use the assault rifle resting at his side to stop Hydra. Hundreds of agents would be on the helicarrier he was going to, and he couldn't simply fight with words. He could use his vibranium armor as super strength, though, something that would put him ahead of Hydra's generals, but he would be matched by the Winter Soldiers stationed on the helicarrier for surveillance. He repositioned the mask over his face, displaying a calm, completely serene gaze, while inside he felt a growing anger directed at Pierce. He knew Natasha had no choice, that she was forced to be exposed. But that didn't please him, and he wanted to stomp on Pierce's head with his boot. He only hoped Fury could handle him. If not, he would destroy the secretary himself. He moved his cybernetic arm, noticing a slight tension in it. It seemed to sense his own internal tension, the nerves before a massive battle like the one he was facing now. He snorted, staring ahead at the clouds the Quinjet was circling above and through, completely camouflaged. A whole fleet was following them, ready to disable the Helicarrier's weapons. "We're flying over the target," Silver Sable's calm voice brought him out of his own thoughts. He nodded and stood up from his position, watching as the ramp slowly began to open, letting air in, whipping his messy golden hair around. He narrowed his eyes as he watched the enormous vehicle begin to launch itself into the air. Understood. Natasha would currently be in the Triskelions' boardroom, getting the full story from Pierce himself while waiting for Fury to arrive to open the communications channel and allow the USB information to be filtered through the Triskelions' defenses, reaching the internet where anyone could access the information uploaded by Black Widow. It just hurt a little to think about Natasha. She'd messed up by messing with his new family, and since their passionate night, they hadn't spoken again after that revelation on his part, something that seemed to really bother her, and he didn't bother much to correct it. Without thinking twice, he jumped from the Quinjet's ramp, receiving a message on the unexpected communicator. "Remember that I love you." He rolled across the deck of the Helicarrier, taking cover from Hydra fire, sliding his hand over his own rifle as he moved his head to the side and fired, taking out 2 soldiers and beginning to move with his senses alert, looking from side to side and firing every few seconds. "I love you too." He could hear a small chuckle on the other end of the communicator, sparking a smile covered by the mask Bucky loved to wear. It seemed all the Winter Soldiers had developed a love of covering the lower half of their faces, creating a slight aura of mystery around them. He moved to the side and dodged the bullets that would have killed him. He heard them piercing the wood of the box, trying to hit him. He rummaged with his left hand for something inside one of his vest pockets, and a few seconds later, something rolled onto the floor. 3 seconds later, he heard an explosion and groans of pain from the enemy. He nodded more to himself and moved further into the Helicarrier, leaving the deck littered with blood and corpses. They had all been his comrades in strike, but he'd never grown to love them much. He could sell them for just a few cents. Or maybe even for much less. He wished he could get his hands on Rumlow before this was all over. It would be nice to be able to execute the bastard who had wanted to damage the mentality of innocent children. Even though Hydra was better than S.H.I.E.L.D. itself in terms of intelligence, it was still too arrogant. Just look at Pierce himself and you'd know that. He changed the rifle's magazine as he left the last bullets in the bodies of several Hydra agents, taking cover behind a corner of the wall as he felt more agents arriving, their weapons ready to be used. He huffed a little when he found himself out of ammo, letting out a click and dropping the useless rifle to the ground when he saw the barrel of one of the enemy's gun, moving towards it and kicking his comrade to prevent him from firing it, at the same time forcing the first one to the ground under his own weight when he kicked his knee and then his head, slamming it against the wall. He deflected the second one's gun a second time using one leg and grabbed the other's neck, twisting him. Fury has made contact with Pierce. Silver's voice struck his left eardrum. He recovered from his surprise at the female voice and grabbed a rifle from one of the soldiers, taking several magazines from his vest and inserting one into the rifle itself, pulling the safety. Without giving it much thought, he began running toward the interior of the Helicarrier itself, aiming straight ahead and pulling the trigger without thinking too much. It was better to shoot first and ask questions later. He swiped the Hydra security pass through the reader, watching as the door to the Helicarrier's headquarters opened, revealing a walkway in front of him that allowed him to reach the exact spot where he needed to place the chip. Once that was done, when the chip was placed on the other 2 Helicarriers, they would be able to control them. He placed the stolen rifle behind him and began running down the walkway, letting his eyes wander down to the enormous glass wall beneath his feet. He could see small clusters of smoke and fire, indicative of explosions. It seemed an aerial battle had begun between Silver Sable's men and the Hydra forces, who couldn't afford to lose now. He halted his steps when a pair of figures fell between him and the place where the chip was to be placed. He shifted his gaze back, observing that another handful were blocking his escape the way he'd come. He scanned the area, examining the soldiers pressing in. Their emotionless faces and masks were all the clues he needed to identify them as priority targets. "Winter Soldiers," Naruto hissed, closing his left hand into a fist while sliding his right hand down, forming a second fist. "Perfect." Without thinking too much, he lashed out with a right hook at the first man who lunged, sending him tumbling backward. He took a step to the right as the man behind him tried to stab him, grabbing the man's wrist in the process and yanking him down sharply. He also stepped over the man and kicked a third man in the face, watching him recoil. Now positioned to the right of the man he was holding, he snatched the Glock from its holster, aimed it at the man in front of him, and fired before he could reach him, leaving the entire magazine in the man. Then he threw the weapon off the walkway, sending it flying into the glass window directly below them with a metallic thud. He kicked the face of the man he had been holding as he felt someone grab him by the waist and try to throw him over the railing of the walkway. Quickly, he moved his cybernetic arm to brace himself and use leverage, placing himself on the other side of the walkway, but with his feet touching it, with the railing between him and the man, who looked at him in disbelief. Before he could recover, he swung his left arm and grabbed the man's face, slamming it against the railing as if it were nothing, followed by a kick to the jaw that sent the man stumbling and falling down the other side of the walkway, crashing into the glass. He swung his leg over it, standing back on the catwalk, looking down at the remaining soldiers. Pierce had either wasted the serum, or they hadn't managed to replicate it like they had in him or Bucky, because those men had lost all superhuman strength. All they had left was the apathetic, emotionless faces they were giving him. Indicative of them being mere puppets of Pierce and Hydra. Otherwise, they were mere soldiers who could be broken with one blow. And even if they still relied on the superhuman strength from the serum, which they should have, he had more experience, more resources, and a reason to come back alive. He didn't want to leave things strained with Natasha or end up shattering himself like a Chinese vase. Maybe it was time to fully talk to Natasha and Fury about their time in Hydra and move on before their account truly ended without regressing to white. He refocused his thoughts on the men around him, sliding his leg to the side to let his attacker's knife pass, unleashing a right hook that completely shattered the woman's jaw, causing her to spit blood. Quickly, he grabbed the knife he'd been holding and stabbed the brunette's jugular vein, while grabbing her by the shoulder and spinning her to the left, leaving his back to the platform he needed to reach to place the chip. He kicked her against his companions and released the handle of the knife, letting the woman's body fall backward. He made a fist as his eyes scanned the others, moving from face to face, examining their postures. He slid his gaze down, noting each one of them had a pistol holstered. He raised his eyes, seeing the hesitation in his enemies, the confusion in their minds. He drew his arm back towards him and delivered a direct blow with his cybernetic arm against the catwalk, surprising the winter soldiers with his movement. What he himself had expected had happened. The gangplank shook from the impact and a few seconds later, it shattered, falling onto the glass wall and forcing his enemies to retreat in surprise. "I'm sorry," he declared as he stood up, showing the arm Pierce had implanted in him after losing his own in his confrontation with an extremis user, before the irritated eyes of the soldiers. He turned his back on them, walking to the center and removing the chip from his belt and replacing it with a plate from the same operations center, while he heard the weapons beginning to load. How the bullets seemed to be placed in the chambers. He moved his head, resting his blue eyes on the enemies on the surviving section of the walkway. He saw rifles in the hands of another handful of those soldiers, pointed directly at his back. He shut down the system with a jerk and ran, evading the gunfire, jumping over the railing and falling onto the glass, slamming his cybernetic arm into it, watching as cracks crossed the rest of the glass, and, seconds later, the glass itself gave way, letting him fall down. Naruto had been careless when he made that move. He knew it, and hundreds of more viable ideas for surviving the winter soldiers on that helicarrier were running through his mind. But he opted for the fastest and, of course, the riskiest. He was falling toward the water with nothing that seemed to be able to stop him, which would leave him a mush of bone and flesh. He showed surprise when his body hit something hard, cold, clearly metal, stopping his fall. He blinked a few times and noticed how the patch of sky he had grabbed now turned into a completely black Quinjet. He looked away, staring at the pilot, or rather, the pilot. Natasha sent him a calm smile, letting her teeth show between her sweet, soft lips, causing him to let out a small laugh at the sight of Black Widow at the controls. "I wasn't expecting you," he yelled, sliding down to the top of the vehicle and dropping into the Quinjet, looking at the lifeless bodies of strike men strewn about. He readjusted his vest and looked over to Romanoff. The woman had stood up, switching to autopilot. "Thanks, I guess." Then, to his surprise, he felt Natasha's lips on his as she stood in front of him, pulling him towards her with her arms, forcing the blonde to lower his body slightly. Seconds later they separated, still joined by a thin bridge of saliva between them. "You're an idiot, but my idiot." In Natasha's words, he noticed some suppressed anger and a threat, but above all affection, something almost impossible to put into the attitude of a spy like her, with corpses on her shoulders that no one would want on themselves. But anger and threats were waiting for him. He let his anger flow into the meeting. "I'm sorry," he said, his expression dull. "I got carried away when." "Put that aside, Naruto," Natasha herself requested, placing her hand on the blonde's cheek, drawing him into a second kiss that he himself didn't refuse, capturing his partner's peach lips. Again, seconds later, they separated. Now, help Rogers if possible. Wilson tries to reach Cap, but the Hydra soldiers don't let him pass. Sounds like fun. Are there any weapons? Steve Rogers. Captain America deflected the Winter Soldier's fist, feeling his former partner push him back onto the catwalk, using his cybernetic arm to force him back, away from the center of the Helicarrier's own system. He pressed his lips together and slowed his retreat with his heels, using his own arms to force Bucky to stop him. He had put aside trying to convince him of who he was and to leave Pierce's side and had faced him. He forced his body to duck, causing Bucky to step over him a little, and took advantage of that, delivering a shoulder blow to the man, making him back down, but not lower his guard. Steve stepped forward, deflecting his old friend's right fist and landing a blow himself, being stopped by Bucky's own vibranium arm. He sweated slightly when Bucky himself forced him back using that arm of his. He snarled, rising to his feet, and launched a knee at his old friend, hitting him square in the abdomen, but receiving no complaint. His eyes were darkened, completely devoid of any real reasoning. He threw his body to the side and pulled Bucky against him, delivering a left punch to the face of the man who had been like his brother, catching him squarely in the jaw and shattering his lower lip. Blood began to trickle down his chin, and he didn't seem to mind. Bucky returned the blow twice as hard, causing Cap to flinch, covering his face. The arm he used to block the Winter Soldier's own blow seemed to tremble, feeling slightly as if it weren't allowing him to do so, as if it belonged to someone else. Thinking about it, he couldn't stop the second blow, being sent to the ground by Bucky and feeling blood now trickling down his lower lip. He ran his tongue over it, tasting the metallic flavor as he stood up. He had dropped his helmet and his dark blonde hair was slightly disheveled from the fight. "Bucky," he snarled, his eyes moving toward his abandoned shield, about to fall from the catwalk. If he grabbed it, he could throw it at him. But there was a good chance he'd catch it with his arm. "You don't have to do this." "Shut up." James roared, lunging at him. Steve moved and punched his former teammate in the abdomen, propelling him back with his legs. He rolled back with the momentum the blow had provided and grabbed the shield with his right hand, fearless as he glared at the Winter Soldier. Bucky adjusted his position, moving toward Rogers again, firing his cybernetic arm at Cap. Cap was forced to cover himself with his shield, being sent backward by the force of the blow, slightly denting his own shield, to the surprise of the Avenger. Steve deflected the second blow using the edge of his shield and launched himself like a rugby player at Bucky, hitting the latter's stomach with his body, hugging him and sending him backward, lifting him slightly off the ground and causing him to fall to the ground with him on top. Steve felt his shield ripped away again and Bucky thrashed beneath him, forcing him to roll and face the walkway, his old friend trying to squeeze his neck. He gasped a little, but fought, headbutting his former teammate and repeating the movement with a second blow, now feeling Bucky finally release his neck. Sighing, he tried to get up but was held back by the soldier, who swung his right arm and slammed into his ribs, making him gasp, feel a couple of them crack, and lose all air, falling face first to the ground, spitting blood that leaked through the walkway itself, dripping onto the glass. He felt Bucky rise beside him, take a second pistol, and point it at his temple, racking the slide of his own weapon. Rogers heard a bullet end up in the chamber. That, of course, would be his bullet. A shield flew, hitting Bucky's right arm, causing him to loosen his grip on the pistol, letting it fall to the glass, and a body hit him sending him flying over the railing, both falling to the glass before the incredulous eyes of Rogers, who saw how the asset moved against Bucky, deflecting the blow from him and rolling on the ground, separated from his former teammate. Now, Naruto was not wearing the mask and revealing a sharp face, with a two-day beard. "Rogers. Put the chip in." The Uzumaki shouted, slamming his cybernetic fist into Bucky's own, generating a loud metallic sound as the glass creaked under its weight. Slowly, Steve Rogers began to crawl down the walkway. Naruto Uzumaki. He dodged the Winter Soldier's second blow, positioning himself to charge at him, sending him tumbling backward and shifting his position, leaving behind a piece of glass slightly cracked from his own struggles and the extra weight. He sidestepped a downward elbow strike, putting himself a couple of steps away from Bucky Barnes, who was looking at him with disdain and emotionless eyes, typical of a Winter Soldier on Pierce's side. He could sense Hydra indoctrination on Barnes, something they'd done to him as well. Too bad it didn't work on his mind. He fired a punch, being stopped by Barnes' arm, who returned the blow back, and he stopped it using his bionic forearm, noticing how that didn't bother Barnes himself, who stepped forward and pressured him with a second, third and fourth blow, making him retreat slightly due to the force and insistence of his adversary. Taking advantage of the onslaught, Naruto threw a second punch at the same time Barnes threw a sixth, managing to connect his fist against the man's ribs and earning a groan from him, something that surprised him. Had his encounter with Rogers weakened the indoctrination? He was unable to explore that line of thought due to Barnes' renewed attack, which forced him to take cover for a few seconds and deliver a third blow, this one directly against the Winter Soldier's stomach, causing him to double over slightly. He slid his hands around and grabbed Bucky's right arm as he twisted, creating a vice grip on the Winter Soldier himself and propelling his body with his legs, sending him sprawling backward onto the ground. He pulled toward him as Barnes did the same. He used all the strength he could muster in this way, wrapping his arm around Barnes and pulling him toward his torso. He gasped in surprise as Bucky himself began to rise, still in his arm, lifting him up, using his cybernetic arm to hold him from behind, holding him high, looking reluctantly at the soldier. Seconds later, he felt him lower quickly and his back hit the glass hard, causing cracks in it. But he refused to let go, squeezing his limbs on his enemy's arm, watching as he lifted him back up, lifting him in the process, standing tall again, looking down, and lowered himself, hitting the glass below him again, feeling it shatter completely and air rush in, hitting his face and back. It seemed like Bucky wanted to send him to the bottom of the river, throwing him off the helicarrier. But he didn't let go of his arm, forcing the Winter Soldier to lean further into the hole created in the glass. Uzumaki gritted his teeth, feeling Bucky's cybernetic arm trying to remove him from his flesh and blood one. But he didn't want to let go. If he did, he would fall into the river and even if he lived, he would probably be completely broken. He closed his eyes and tightened his grip on the arm he had been holding, forcing Barnes back, causing him to collide with the sharp edge, feeling the glass slowly cut into his back, leaving a completely red line of blood. He moved his foot, kicking Barnes' face and let go, allowing the man to roll on the ground as he stood next to the edge, feeling the air slowly rush in, hitting him in the face. He used his left arm as leverage, slowly beginning to stand up, shifting his attention to Barnes himself, startled to see him running toward him and feeling him charge at him, sending him tumbling back, forcing himself to grab the edge of the glass as he fell through the hole, feeling blood trickle down his left hand, which he had used to grip the sharp edge to keep from falling. He gritted his teeth, moving his opposite arm to catch himself as well, raising his face to look at Bucky Barnes standing above him, looking down at him with those darkened, impassive eyes. Slowly, the Winter Soldier moved his left arm toward him, his palm open. When he was inches away, the helicarrier was jolted by an explosion, forcing Bucky to stumble back, while Naruto was forced to grip the edge more tightly, feeling the helicarrier burst into flames again from an explosion, being jolted a second time. The gloved hand appeared in front of him. "Take my hand." He didn't think twice, accepting the hand and being lifted, placed in a safe zone, now without feeling his muscles slowly tiring. He bit his lower lip, feeling the stinging in his left hand. He turned it over, seeing shards of glass embedded in his palm, with blood slowly dripping from it. He closed his hand into a fist and turned his attention to the person who had rescued him from a disastrous fall. Steve Rogers. Captain America looked tired, with traces of blood running from the right corner of his lips, somewhat dry. "Thanks, Rogers," he muttered through gritted teeth, dropping to one knee, his attention focused on Bucky Barnes himself, who was watching them with those darkened eyes. The Winter Soldier seemed calm, some blood trickling down his temple, dripping onto the floor, staining the glass beneath his feet. "Any ideas?" "The objective is achieved," Rogers murmured, bringing his right hand to the side of the damaged abdomen. "But I don't want to leave Bucky here." "Which means we could die saving your friend," the blonde replied, now standing and massaging his neck with his cybernetic hand. The left one was still burning, and blood continued to drip from it, staining the glass beneath his feet. "There's no better way to die." To his own surprise, Rogers gave him a small smile, revealing slightly bleeding teeth, but it didn't seem to bother Cap. He shook his head once, focusing on Barnes. For his part, Bucky Barnes had launched himself at them, moving his cybernetic arm forward, as if he were going to charge them. Rogers placed himself in front of him, using his body to collide with the Winter Soldier's, but was sent backward, showing signs of pain by the grimaces on his face. Naruto watched this, seeing how Rogers let out a groan when Barnes separated and tried to hit him, being evaded by the first one, creating a gap that he took advantage of to launch himself against the enemy, grabbing Bucky's waist with his arms, clinging to him, and pushing him as if he were a rugby player, making him retreat a few meters, but no more. Barnes raised both arms and joined both hands to launch a hammer blow against the Uzumaki's back, who spat saliva when the blow hit him squarely. But he did not let go. As Barnes prepared a second blow, Rogers leaped over Naruto and punched his former teammate in the face, watching blood run down his face and stunning him. The blonde took advantage of this moment to lift him up and slam him hard into the ground, cracking the glass. Another blast sent him tumbling through the glass, where a beam fell and caught Barnes, halting his movements. He sighed and began to stand, using his cybernetic arm for support at all times, his gaze sliding over to Rogers and Barnes. The former was straining to lift the beam, while the latter stood below, using his strength to make the former's work easier. Reluctantly, he walked over to the two and joint cap, using his own strength to help him and send the beam to the other side, freeing Barnes himself and allowing him to move a few feet away, showing that he had at least gotten some broken ribs. "Bucky," Cap murmured, causing Barnes to take a couple of steps back, his hand going up to his head, clearly in pain from something, which made Naruto himself frown as he watched how the Winter Soldier seemed to fight against Hydra's own indoctrination, using all his control to do so, something that was truly surprising him. He hadn't seen anyone be able to break free from Hydra's control, no matter how hard they tried. Although he himself had been a special case, something they shouldn't know. Steve. It seemed that the voice and presence of Steve Rogers himself was helping Bucky Barnes recover his memories of his past, slowly returning to how he had been before Hydra took over him. But another explosion made them see that it would be difficult. Nick Fury. He saw Alexander Pierce's own surprised, irritated face when they unlocked the protocol and began leaking information to the internet, leaving it visible to everyone. He found the sweat running down the secretary's temple completely amusing. Although he did reproach himself for having arrived a little late. He scanned the room, taking in the inert bodies of almost the entire council. "So, Naruto, huh?" "Of course," he declared, still pointing his gun at the secretary himself, watching as the man seemed to want to leave. "Did you never expect it, Pierce? Naruto is, after all, my godson." Pierce opened his mouth slightly, then snapped shut, feeling deceived. He never expected the Uzumaki to be from S.H.I.E.L.D., much less Fury's godson. It was something that never entered his mind. How to do it? The boy always completed missions, no matter how bloody. "You got me there," he assured, letting his tie slip. "One of Hydra's best, being on your side. I never expected it. How could someone like him be on your side? He always loved killing." "He never liked her," Fury replied, glancing at Pierce himself, giving him a dangerous look. "He just did it for Romanoff, that's all. What love does. You played me." "Not too well, to my regret," Fury himself stated, taking a second look at the inert bodies. "But it doesn't matter. S.H.I.E.L.D. will show itself again with the Hydra breach. Many of your assets will now be imprisoned." Pierce gritted his teeth. "You won't be able to defeat us all, Fury. Not without the true power of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it's something I completely destroyed," the secretary boasted, flashing a smug smile. "No one will come out to stop us." "Are you sure?" "Pierce, you're not too smart. As long as Naruto's alive, there'll be someone out to hunt you down." "I'm alone." Fury allowed a smile to spread across his lips. "Alone?" Naruto was a special agent skilled in combat, infiltration, and espionage. He was capable of using any weapon and was now like a second Captain America, with superhuman strength and a cybernetic arm. Hydra had given their godson more weapons, and he wasn't entirely alone on this mission. While he wouldn't be on the Avengers side yet, he did have someone else on board. "Believe me, you'd be surprised at what he's capable of with the right motivation. And you've given him that." "Oh, really? You tried to kill Natasha Romanoff. And that's something that will lead to Hydra's downfall." The secretary gritted his teeth, sliding back. "He won't be able to stop us, Fury. No one will." Fury shrugged, moving his arm forward and pointing the pistol at Pierce himself. "At least one of their heads will fall today," the director declared, taking a step forward, showing a darkened eye. "I'm sorry it had to end this way, Pierce." "I can't say the same." The sound of a gunshot echoed throughout the building. "It's not a goodbye." He opened his eyes slowly, staring above him at a ceiling darkened by the lack of light. Dizzy, he squeezed his eyes shut once and blinked several more times, rolling off the bed and sitting on the edge, staring at the devices connected to it. He let out a grunt as memories hit him a few seconds later. He had been underwater when the helicarrier had drifted to the bottom, ripped apart by the brothers' gunfire, and engulfed in flames and hot iron. The piece had pierced his side, and he was impaled, unable to move freely. He was slowly lowered into the water, barely able to breathe, forced to lift his head and throw it back to breathe. But it didn't last long. Within minutes, the water reached his nose and he couldn't find any air to ingest. After a few minutes, he began to drown, and then he was completely unconscious, his mind completely blacked out. He moved the cables connected to his body and stood up, feeling the mattress on his bed return to its normal position. He scanned the room, finding nothing unusual except a pair of black pants and a t-shirt. On the floor were a pair of combat boots, probably the ones he'd worn, and they didn't look too battered. They were somewhat worn, and he could see faint marks on them, as if they were creased. Could it be from the water? He ruffled his hair with his hand and took his pants, starting to put them on, moving on to his t-shirt as he got rid of the hospital gown, leaving it on the cold, white floor without much care. He took his boots and put them on his feet, closing their straps and getting up from the chair, wincing slightly when his side tugged slightly. He still had the bandages covering the wound where the iron had pierced him. How had he managed to get out of the downed helicarrier? His thoughts turned to Captain Rogers and Barnes himself, being the only ones who could have pulled him from the wreckage of the helicarrier and left him in that hospital, a place he didn't like at all. He hated hospitals, especially when there were police officers at the door like guard dogs. He grimaced briefly and looked out the window. The only way out the door was in his physical state, and that meant he'd have to get rid of both military personnel. Oh, yes, the US military seemed to have taken over since the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the current presence of Hydra itself. And he'd ended up as a prisoner to them, probably dangerous. He gave a low growl like an angry dog and walked over to the same door, grabbing the handle and pulling it towards him, attracting the attention of his two dogs. He regretted this, but he wasn't going to end up in the hands of the army just because Fury was dead. He took the hand of the soldier on the left and kicked the left knee of the one on the right, forcing him to fall to his knee and allowing him to move, slamming the palm of his cybernetic hand into the neck of the one on the left, cutting off all airflow, and moved, throwing a punch at the one on the right. Both fell to the ground, unconscious from their movements. He waved his hand as if it were dusty or dirty and began walking toward the exit signs, following each sign, always wary of any soldiers stationed at the hospital in case he escaped. But the medical staff wasn't meant to keep him away from the line. They might raise the alarm if they knew who he was, and he really couldn't let that happen. Not with him inside the hospital, unless he had carte blanche to execute everyone there. He stood in the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor, and watched as the doors closed in front of him, before his wide eyes. He felt a few strands of his hair briefly caress his forehead, bringing back memories of Natasha's caresses, something he truly needed again, but couldn't have at the moment. Not when Hydra was still fully active, with several of its heads trying to bite the world itself to get it in their clutches. He had to finish what he had started 10 years ago, when he came under the command of the Nazi organization on Fury's orders. They had cut off an important head of Hydra itself when Pierce ended up dead, so Strike was completely eliminated. S.H.I.E.L.D. was in crisis and being recognized as terrorists, something that would complicate any work he did behind the scenes using the organization's name. Luckily for him, he had contacts who could cover his tracks. If he used Silver's men, he'd surely get good equipment and the military wouldn't find him easily, giving him the leeway to eliminate Hydra for what it had been. Shinobi, the perfect assassin. He had to get his katana back, and with his immense strength and arm, he'd gained a considerable upgrade. He wasn't too happy about the fact that he was, technically, a human weapon. But it was the best possible outcome for the upcoming conflicts with Hydra itself. It was something he obtained to use for one purpose only. To protect Natasha. He wasn't an Avenger or a hero like the others. He'd always been a spy, an assassin, and a shadow fighter, oblivious to the harm he was doing and always following the orders of others, a vile tool. With Hydra's hands off him, he had only one path left after the destruction of S.H.I.E.L.D. itself. Hunt Hydra down until there was nothing left of them. It was the best he could do when he was the only one who could stop them. He only regretted leaving Natasha aside again. But he couldn't live happily without first eliminating Hydra and all its leaders. Nick Fury's tomb. 5 p.m. Steve Rogers and Samuel Wilson watched the grave of the former director of S.H.I.E.L.D. without showing much on their faces, knowing that Bucky had managed to flee the place after saving him and the Uzumaki, who was taken into custody by the United States Army for his actions as a Hydra asset. Actions that became visible to everyone when Natasha Romanoff placed the USB in the Triskelion headquarters, scattering the agency's information across the network, in plain sight. It was not a way that Rogers himself was too happy about. They had dug deep for S.H.I.E.L.D. and now Hydra would be completely free, without an enemy to openly confront them, and being able to climb to the highest points in the world. Something that nobody really wanted. Both ex-soldiers turned their faces to look at their partner. Natasha Romanoff. Naruto's allies had vanished when the army showed up, leaving them with a whole mess. But anyway, they didn't need any more of them. They never called them and they couldn't force them to stay, when the Uzumaki himself was the one who brought them with him. Even Barton left with his family without leaving much of a trace, just a few dead people with arrows in their bodies that Clint himself hadn't removed in his haste to leave. But after all, Barton was an Avenger and he wouldn't be in too much danger. Especially since he left the agency before Hydra could show itself. Where will you go? The question suddenly left his lips, sliding his eyes towards Fury's grave again. I'm not sure. I'll have to hide, Natasha herself answered the captain's question, his face showing nothing. All of Black Widow's secrets had been exposed and the woman would be viewed critically by everyone. She had been S.H.I.E.L.D.'s best spy and she showed no fear in completing a mission that required the woman to use her own body and then execute her target. What will you do? I still have to deal with the court and then I'll see. Maybe a vacation, Rogers himself explained, giving a brief smile at the words, hoping to earn Romanoff a laugh, which happened a few seconds after he answered the question. Him, Captain America, taking a vacation. It sounded truly ridiculous. But he really needed a break from everything. Without his work for S.H.I.E.L.D., the free time he'd have would be overwhelming, becoming tedious and boring, something he couldn't really cope with easily. He wasn't from this era and was still adjusting, so finding something to distract himself with other than exercise would be too difficult for him. You'd benefit from these, Rogers. From behind a tree, Nick Fury appeared wearing clothes resembling those of a tramp, with a long dark green coat and a hat on his head, covering his bald head, and sunglasses covering his damaged eye. Where will you go? Most likely to Europe. I have to deal with the problems caused by Hydra, and I need to take care of them. I have a team for that, though, the man declared, showing nothing. Fury looked at his own grave and let out a short laugh at seeing his name on a headstone that marked the side of a completely empty grave, with nothing of importance on it. It's abnormal to see one's own grave, and slightly amusing. I hope to surprise Hydra with it. Will you deal with them? Not too much. It's not really my role, but I have someone happy to get rid of the surplus heads, Nick himself muttered, sliding his eye toward Romanoff behind his glasses. And they need some help now. Do you want me to come? Natasha asked hesitantly. She'd wanted to stay with Naruto if possible, but if Fury needed her against Hydra. No. But I hope you let me have your boyfriend for work. Fury took a step to the right and the three of them watched as the Uzumaki slowly walked toward them, his hands in his pockets, seemingly carrying a huge bag on his back. He seemed to be limping slightly, making a grimace almost unrecognizable to them, but it was there on his face. Rogers quickly remembered that the blonde had been pierced by a piece of hot iron and the wound probably wasn't complete. Should you walk? Should you ask that, Steve? He counterattacked, sliding to Romanoff's side and placing a kiss on the woman's cheek, earning a crooked smile from her, completely happy with the gesture, something surprising for Rogers. So, you're coming back and leaving me? She inquired, moving her eyes to the boy, who showed a sad, regretful look, causing her to snort. Why? I only have two paths, Nat. I either stay and end up in the clutches of the army, or I escape and hunt Hydra down freely. It's not too hard to know which path I'll take, he mumbled, staring into his lover's green eyes. He snorted and hugged her, resting his chin on her head, causing her to wrap her arms around him and pull him close, burying her face in his chest because he was taller, now approaching 6'9". I'll be back. What assures me? She declared, clinging to her childhood friend, the one who had spent so much time with her and seemed to want to keep her away from as much blood as possible. Aside from a bionic arm, my superhuman strength, and my deadly abilities. He asked, his lips forming a small, mocking smile. Oh, nothing then. He felt Romanoff lightly hit him on the shoulder and force him to bend down, taking his lips for a few seconds. Idiot. You idiot. And the hotels. Falcon growled out that question, puzzled and uncomfortable by how easily the female assassin and spy seemed to cozy up to Fury's other assassin and spy. He felt his bile rising and the urge to vomit increasing. They're too mundane, the Uzumaki replied, chuckling softly at Wilson's own eye roll. He wouldn't admit it outright, but he was starting to like Falcon despite being Cap's partner now. He liked Rogers too, though. But that didn't mean he loved the Avengers. I prefer a penthouse with a king-size bed and a jacuzzi. When it came to love, he loved anything expensive, things he couldn't afford but could have if he wanted. He breathed lightly, kissing Romanoff again, and pulled away from the woman, looking at Fury. He could feel the man's inscrutable gaze on him, never blinking, something anyone else would have found uncomfortable, but not him. Not when that gaze had fallen on him since he was a child. But it was never a bad look. Nick Fury was truly a serious man, always with the most serious look he could muster, and keeping anyone who looked at him straight at bay. He rarely softened that look he always gave. Always serious and frightening. That's how Nick Fury treated others, sending them that completely serious look that made them swallow, indicating that they should listen to him. And he wasn't completely immune. Where to? Canada. I have a base there, and I need you to reorganize S.H.I.E.L.D. for an upcoming fight, Fury himself declared, his gaze softening for a few seconds, showing pride. Get what you need, but leave in a few minutes. There's no time for more. He simply sighed, knowing that his next assignment would be too complicated and burden his shoulders more than he could have hoped for. He grimaced slightly as he thought of the snow and cold of Canada and how tedious it would be to reorganize an entire organization, searching for agents and assets for the organization. He was a fugitive from justice in league with a terrorist organization, again. I hope I don't stay too long. I don't like the cold, he tried to make a small joke that didn't come out, closing his mouth in an attempt to remain calm. He slid his eyes toward Natasha and ran a hand down the back of her neck, showing her a nervous smile. It's not goodbye, Nat. For her part, Natasha Romanoff pouted slightly, her lower lip sticking out and returning to normal in a few seconds, nodding at her ex-boyfriend. They hadn't clarified that part yet. I hope so. Naruto gave a brief smile, pulling away from Natasha Romanoff and noticing her gaze on his back. Now he began a path that Fury had set before him, too complicated, with the barriers inherent in a path like his own. He was a traitor, a murderer, a spy, a fugitive. The list was too long to fit into his mind. And while he knew he wouldn't be leading the new shield, the work he would have to do would be too laborious for everyone. Even more so when Natasha Romanoff wouldn't be by his side. It seemed like being together was still too far from their goal. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.